So let's just start by reading the 17 verses here that we'll get into, and we'll do what we usually do, just go through and make some comments on some things that are interesting. So then Moses answered, but behold, again, he's still arguing with God. Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, then they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But he said, oh my Lord, please send someone else. I love that line. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. Now that is Exodus 4, 1 through 17. Again, there's some interesting things lurking around in here. This is actually Moses' third objection to God's call. The previous two were in Exodus 3 and verse 11. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children? I'm a nobody. And then Exodus 3:13. If I come to the people of Israel and say, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I say? And he's making excuses. And now God again delivers the divine name, which had something to do with presence. God was promising to be with them, have the power to do something new here. And we get into chapter 4, and here he is again. Moses has not broken stride. Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice. They will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Again, he's treading water here, and he's making excuses. And God responds by giving Moses 3 signs to perform to validate Yahweh is with him. In verses 2 through 5, we get the rod and the snakes. Verses 6 and 7, we get the skin-diseased arm and its healing. And then, of course, following that, we get the water to blood. Asarna, here in his commentary, has something interesting to say that kind of kicks us off here. He says, Moses is instructed how to dissipate popular skepticism should it materialize. Deuteronomy 13, 2 through 6 discusses the role of the sign in the legitimation of a prophet in Israel. Here, the signs, which will be executed in Egypt, possess a distinctly Egyptian coloration. This is not surprising, for magic was a pervasive ingredient of everyday life in Egypt, deeply embedded in the culture. The signs taught to Moses are intended, first and foremost, to validate his claim to be the divinely chosen instrument for the redemption of Israel. On a secondary level, they also function to establish the superiority of Moses over the Egyptian magicians, and by extension, to affirm the superior might of Israel's God over those whom the Egyptians worshipped as gods. Moses, however, is not a magician. He possesses no superhuman powers and no esoteric knowledge. He is unable to initiate or perform anything except by precise instructions from God. He pronounces no spells, he observes no rituals, and employs no occult techniques. And often he does not know in advance the consequences of the actions he is told to perform. That's the end of Sarna. The last paragraph I think is really interesting because when you read the stories, it's true. Moses never does any ritual. He never utters an incantation, no abracadabra, kind of stuff. He never casts a spell. And he has none of the techniques that Egyptian magicians and Egyptians generally would have expected. He just says, look, I listened to my God. This is what my God said. Now let's just all watch. Because again, Sarna is correct. Again, as you read the story, there are a number of situations where Moses would not really quite have known what to expect, what the fallout would be. And he sort of finds out with everybody else. And that would have spoken something to an Egyptian, because the Egyptians are expecting, you're a magician, right? You do what magicians. No, actually, I'm not a magician. I'm just a servant of the Most High God. So you need to let us go. Again, there are differences there that are important. So let's talk about the first set, the serpents and the staff. The Lord says to him, what's in your hand? He said, a staff, throw it on the ground. He throws it on the ground, it becomes a serpent. And again, we know the rest of it. Moses gets scared, and God says, hey, take it by the tail. It becomes a staff in his hand. Now, the English translation here, and if you compare the translation here to Exodus 7, 9, and 10, when Moses and Aaron actually do this, right now it's sort of God's just telling them what to do, but when you get into Exodus 7, they actually do this. The English translation sort of obscures an interesting item that some would call a problem. Okay, I'm going to read you the way the ESV has in Exodus 7, 9 through 10, just to make the point that this isn't really very detectable in English. When Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, and he did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. You say, well, what's the difference? I'm going to read you a selection from John Currid's book. That's Currid. Currid is trained as an Egyptologist at the University of Chicago. He teaches, I can't remember where, he teaches at one of the Reformed seminaries, I think in the Midwest. Don't quote me there, but it is one of the Reformed seminaries. But he has a book called Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. It's a 1997 title. And he writes this. I'm going to give you some sections of pages 86 through 92. So Currid writes, when Aaron was ordered by Moses to throw down his staff before Pharaoh, okay, and he's commenting specifically on Exodus 7, 9 through 10 here in this section. When Aaron was ordered to do this, it was transformed into a tanin, is the Hebrew word, tanin. One would have expected it to change into a nachash, because the first sign given to Moses in Exodus 4, 2 to 3, that he was to perform in Egypt was the turning of the staff into a nachash. Why is a different Hebrew term used in the two accounts? Let me just stop there. So back in Exodus 4, which is where we are, the Hebrew term for what the staff becomes, this snake, is nachash. But in Exodus 7, it's tanin, which elsewhere gets translated something like dragon. Okay, so Currid points this out, which you can't really see in English. He says, well, why? What's the deal with the two different words? He continues now. Many scholars argue that the alteration of terminology is due to the change in scene. They argue that tanin is a crocodile, because that word can mean dragon. They argue that tanin is a crocodile rather than a serpent, and thus more accurately reflects the Egyptian environment. Umberto Cassuto, a famous Jewish commentator, comments, quote, instead of the serpent most appropriate to the desert, in which form the sign was transmitted to Moses, comes here the dragon or crocodile most appropriate to the Egyptian milieu, unquote. Currid says, supporting that position is the fact that the biblical authors often use the word tanin of large reptiles that were more formidable than the simple nachash, and he cites a few passages. Other scholars argue that the variation in terms is just a matter of poetic license. Now, Currid, here's where he's at. He says, it is doubtful that the Exodus writer meant anything more than that the rods of Aaron and the magicians turned into large snakes. So he says it's not a crocodile, it's snakes. In the first place, tanin and nachash appear to be used interchangeably in the early chapters of Exodus. Thus, shortly after the serpent contest, God commands Moses, quote, go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water and station yourself to meet him on the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a nachash, into a serpent. And I'll just stop there. In other words, the tanin word is not used there right at the Nile, which you would think if it's a crocodile, that's the word they would use. But he's referring back to the incident in chapter 7 where tanin was used. But here, later on in verse 15, Exodus 7:15, same chapter, a few verses later, what was in front of Pharaoh, what Pharaoh and his magicians are confronted with was not a tanin, it was a nachash. So the terms get interchanged. Back to Currid. He says, clearly the writer is referring here to the immediately preceding story where the term tanin is employed. The Septuagint is of little help in this matter. Although it translates tanin into the Greek drakon, dragon, large reptile, it also applies drakon to numerous instances of nachash, Job 26:13, Isaiah 27:1, Amos 9:3. If anything, the Septuagint supports the idea of the two Hebrew words often being used synonymously. That's the end of Currid. Now, I just introduced that because I thought it was interesting, and you may, again, it's kind of thing that you're going to find on a website, contradictions in the Bible. Well, could we actually spend a little bit of time, looking to see if the terms are interchanged elsewhere and it really doesn't matter? Might be a good idea. So I wanted to introduce it here because of the novelty of it, so that you would know, people have noticed this and scholars have written about it, but the two terms in Exodus do just really appear to be interchangeable. In the mind of the translator of the Septuagint, the same thing is true. So we're probably just dealing with snakes here and not crocodiles. Verse 5, again, I want to draw your attention just to a word here. We have a repetition of what we saw in the previous week's episode in chapter 3 about God appearing, using that appeared language. We get it again in verse 5. Okay, God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has appeared to you. Again, same language that we talked about last time with the burning bush, and it's just reinforced here. Verse 6, then again the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak, and then we get him taking his hand out, and the ESV has, his hand was leprous like snow. And we covered this in our series on Leviticus. This term used in Hebrew is not actually leprosy. Okay, if you could go back to the episodes in Leviticus where we talked about this. The term used there and the description, more importantly, that is given in the book of Exodus is not consistent with what we know as leprosy today. So Sarna writes here, the Hebrew tzara'at, usually mistranslated leprosy, has none of the major symptoms of that malady, and the descriptions of tzara'at given in Leviticus 13 and 14 are incompatible with Hansen's disease, which is what we know today as leprosy. Sarna continues, the comparison to snow is not in respect of its whiteness, but of its flakiness. Apart from the startling phenomenon of the sudden appearance and the disappearance of the encrustation, this particular sign has an ominous aspect to it in that it is seen in the Bible as a divine punishment for human misbehavior. That's the end of the Sarna quote. So I just wanted to park on that a little bit and harken back again to our earlier episodes of Leviticus, just when it comes to that particular issue. Verses 8 and 9, if they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So this sign, the Nile turning into blood, turns out to be used for the first plague, as the actual story unfolds. It seems significant that at the continued resistance to, the signs that Moses is giving, Moses runs out of signs. He's got his staff there, with the changing it into a serpent. He can stick his hand in his cloak. But if Pharaoh doesn't believe those two, he's kind of out of ammunition as far as objects or parts of himself that can demonstrate anything. So at this point, essentially, with the third sign here, the water turning into blood, God has to take over. And I think that might be the point. Pharaoh's resistance to a sign where clearly Moses isn't doing he's not manipulating an object. He's not doing sleight of hand magic. Hand in the cloak, out of the cloak, back in again. Oh, look at that. Again, he's not doing any of that stuff after the second sign. The third sign is literally an act of God. And again, this isn't new to me. It's lots of commentators have pointed this out. It seems like Pharaoh's resistance sort of brings God forward center stage and says, okay, here we go. We're going to watch. I'm going to turn the water of the Nile, which was super significant because it's the lifeblood of Egypt, pun intended. I'm going to turn it to blood. It's going to pollute the land. This is an act of God. And so this actually launches the series of what will become known as the 10 plagues. It's a transition point. Pharaoh's resistance to what Moses is doing turns out to be like the last straw. And then God says, okay, I'm going to take over from here. And the confrontation, when God enters the picture, as it were, when it's an undeniable act of God, the confrontation therefore shifts to not Moses versus Pharaoh or Moses versus Pharaoh's magicians. Now it's God versus Pharaoh, who is the living Horus in Egyptian thinking. Pharaoh was considered the incarnation of a deity. In Egyptian theology, the Pharaoh was thought to be the living incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra. And as soon as the Pharaoh dies, his son, the next in line, becomes the new Horus. This was the thinking. The first name of Pharaoh's fivefold titulary. In Egypt, the Pharaoh had 5 names, and they represented different things, different aspects of either his rule or his nature or something. They had a 5-fold name, 5-fold titulary. And the first of those was his Horus name. Now, Hoffmeyer has a Bible review article on Son of God language in the Old Testament, how that compares, how that maps over to Egyptian thinking. And Hoffmeyer teaches at Wheaton. He's an Egyptologist by training. He points out in his article, quote, during the Old Kingdom, which is 2700 to 2200 BC, the epithet, one of the epithets attributed to Pharaoh was the Necher Aa, the great God. This epithet was applied to the king, only to be replaced by the less exalted Necher Nefer, the good God, in subsequent periods. Additionally, the Pharaoh could be called the image, Tut, it's TWT in Egyptian, the Tut, the image of a deity. For example, Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun, literally means the living image of Amun. It's the end of Hoffmeyer. So the evidence is very clear that the Egyptians believed that the Pharaoh was the incarnation of Horus, of a deity, and they would refer to the Pharaoh as the great God. So when God says, "Okay, I'll take over from here," and starts pounding Pharaoh and pounding the nation, that speaks volumes. And again, Pharaoh's heart is going to harden. He's not surrendering the title, anytime soon. He knows what's at stake in terms of his own reputation. Pharaoh is supposed to be the regulator of the divine order, and the divine order says that the Nile floods at the same time every year and gives the land life-giving soil on either side of the Nile, the Black Land. That's Egypt called itself the Black Land, the Kemet. The Black Land where things grow. This is miles, of arable land out there in the middle of the desert. The gods keep Egypt alive. This is why Egypt is great, because of the Nile. And God says, "Pardon me, I'm going to turn that to blood for a while." We'll see how that goes. So again, it's a shift in the confrontation and how it would have been read and parsed by Egyptians in light of their own theology. And we go down to verse 10. Again, get another objection of Moses. Again, before the showdown actually happens. His fourth objection. Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I'm not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant," which I take as a generic reference to his servants. Or, again, you could say there's a little bit of space here between this conversation and the burning bush. Could be, but it could be generic as well. He's like, "I can't talk well. I'm slow of speech and of tongue." And it is true that you can look at those Hebrew terms there, and it could be that Moses was a stutterer. I mean, that's certainly possible. It's not terribly important, because even if he's not, he's making another excuse. I can't do it. Just can't do it. And of course, God says, "Well, who makes a man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Isn't it I? Get off your butt and go. I'll be with your mouth. I'll teach you what you should speak." But again, Moses isn't having any of it. So this is the fourth objection, and God has been patient, to say the least, up to this point. He has answered Moses' objections with, "I'll give you signs. You do this. I'll step in. With the water turned to blood. Once you get into Egypt, I'll help you with what you say. I mean, I'm present." Going back to our discussion of the name, and Moses just is resistant. So by the time you get to verse 14. 13 and 14, God is angry. But Moses said, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." Now he doesn't even bother making an excuse. He says, "I don't want to go." It's pretty simple. Pretty simple. You've handled my objections and my excuses. Let's just get down to it. I don't want to go. I'm either scared or I got some other, I don't want to go. Please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. He still doesn't just fry Moses on the spot, which you almost see like that would be the outcome. And he says, "Look, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. He doesn't have your problem. He doesn't stutter. Okay. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart." So God, again, has already anticipated this. God has already tapped Aaron on the shoulder. "Get out to the desert. Moses is out there. You need to go see him. You shall speak to him." God says, "You shall speak to Aaron and put the words in his mouth. You tell Aaron what to say. I'll tell you what to say. You tell Aaron what to say. I'll be with you both. Like I am giving you the words, you're going to give him the words. You'll be to him like I am to you." That's why God says you will be as Elohim, to him. You're going to play my role. The role I'm playing in relationship to you, you're going to play in relationship to Aaron. This is how we'll work it. He's on his way. Now, this is going to become significant later on when we get to it in the next episode, the bridegroom of blood, because Moses apparently just takes off. He doesn't even wait for Aaron. They never have the conversation. The guy gets real angry. He's about to kill Moses. That's not the only reason as well that God is really, really angry with him. We'll see that next time. But this is part of it. He doesn't even wait. I mean, he really doesn't want to go. It's pretty evident. Now, what I want to focus on here, though, for this episode is it is at this point that we have to go back and revisit something that we talked about in our earlier Hebrews series. This is when you get Aaron enter the picture. And once Aaron is in the picture, this is the beginning point of Aaron's role as intercessor for Moses, to compensate for Moses' weakness And honestly, I think there's a bit of a punishment in here as well. Aaron is going to be part of the picture now, and he's going to have an intercessory role in the place of Moses between, for Pharaoh and also between the people in some instances, and specifically things like the Day of Atonement, ritual. Where only Aaron, only the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. Moses didn't get to do that. It's at this point where that starts. Aaron becomes part of the picture, and it is a concession to Moses' unbelief, his resistance. We talked about this in our series in the book of Hebrews, because back then we spent a lot of time talking about Melchizedek. You shall be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. This language about Jesus. And we asked the question back in our Hebrews episodes, well, what in the world's going on here? I thought Israel had a high priesthood. It was Aaron. Why does the writer of Hebrews go back to Melchizedek? Of course, who was the time of Abraham, predates Aaron. And we spent a lot of time talking about Melchizedek and his priesthood. And part of our discussion was the notion, again, in scholarship. Again, this isn't unique to Mike. Mike's not making this up. You'll see this discussion in a number of places, where the whole presence, the whole piece in Israelite thinking, in Israel as a nation, in the worship of Israel, the whole element of the Aaronic priesthood arose out of this conversation. In other words, it was not God's original intention. It was a concession to Moses. It was God being kind. God could have very well said, okay, we're done here, fried, or just go home. You're done. I'll go get somebody else. He doesn't do that. He gives Moses an out. Okay, there's a concession here. He's merciful. But this is where the Aaronic priesthood starts. It was not part of God's original plan. And we talked again about how that fits in with kingship and Melchizedek, who's the king of Salem, Salem, Jerusalem, how that became the model for the Messiah. You can go back to episode 167 and listen to that. I'm just going to sort of pick out a few summary statements here again from that material. But this is it's an issue for biblical theology. It helps to understand the Aaronic priesthood as being a concession. It helps to parse what's going on with Melchizedek and just generally what the template was supposed to be, and why in the perfect servant, the one who doesn't make excuses, the Messiah, Jesus, why both of these things, the kingship, the leadership, the rulership, the political leadership of the nation, is blended with the priestly relationship. Why it's blended into one person. That was the typical pattern. That was the intended pattern. Because up until this point, again, this is just a general comment, and I'll get into a few more specifics here. But up until this point, God is working through single individuals, not pairs. Okay, he's not doing Batman and Robin. There is no Robin. He's not working with his people as a group through pairs, through teams or duos. There's single leadership. This is the point of transition. And this is a departure from the heretofore normal template of doing things. So the original kingship of Jerusalem, think about it a little more broadly here. I'll draw some material in from our earlier episode 167 when we were talking about Melchizedek. The original kingship of Jerusalem didn't go back to David. It goes back to Melchizedek. Again, Melchizedek was the model. He was the king of Salem. Jerusalem, get it? Okay, there's this connection here. He was the prototype. The original kingship of Jerusalem also entailed a priestly role. Melchizedek was also a priest of the Most High God. The priestly role would not be inherited by the sons of Aaron when it came to the Messiah. Okay, it would be inherited by the descendants of Abraham. It has chronological priority over the Aaronic priesthood. Again, the whole Melchizedek thing has chronological priority. So the Aaronic priesthood, when that comes into view, it splits the role. It gives Israel two leaders instead of one. The political leader was Moses. The priestly leader was Aaron. The argument that Aaron's priesthood, again, was supposed to be like the original design just doesn't work. There's a good argument, again, and I think Exodus 4 makes it pretty clear. There's a good argument to be made that Aaron's priesthood was a concession to the lack of faith on Moses' part. It was plan B. And plan A would have been to have Moses be both the political leader and the priestly leader, to intercede before the people with respect to God. But that isn't how it emerges. The role splits because of this. Now you can say, well, Moses, he still interceded for the people, with God, and think about the wilderness wanderings and all. Yeah, he does that. He does that stuff. But when they get in the land, and then the land is going to be the place where they build a temple, God's going to come and be their God. They will be his people. When they get in the land, that ain't the case. It's split in two. It's two separate offices instead of one. So it's at this point in Exodus 4 that Aaron's status is elevated to essentially co-leader. And that'll be his status. It'll lead to him becoming the high priest. Again, this is just how it works. Now think about what happens after this scene in the Exodus story. Moses apparently, again, if we look at Exodus 4, 24 through 27, he apparently leaves for Egypt without Aaron. Now, in this incident, the bridegroom of blood incident with Zipporah, where God is going to kill Moses, which we'll talk about next time. Moses apparently left for Egypt without Aaron. I mean, God had told him, look, your brother Aaron's on the way. You talk to him. Here's how it's going to be. Moses, he's out of Dodge. Well, again, that might indicate Moses is just a screw up. It probably indicates just plain old disobedience. He leaves Aaron behind after all of this wrangling with God and after God's anger and his compassionate concession. And just, all of that right after he says, can you send somebody else? God gets angry and says, look, here's what we'll do. We'll bring Aaron in the picture. After hearing that, Moses just takes off without him, without ever telling Aaron that he was part of God's plan. Now, again, we'll cover that scene, the bridegroom of blood scene, next time. But after you get past that, Aaron, if you think about what Aaron does, Aaron repeats the signs that God originally told Moses to perform. So not only can Moses does priestly things, he meets with God and he intercedes with God. Don't blot them out, God. Yeah, right. But Aaron actually also does Moses things as well. I mean, they're co-leaders now, when the original plan was to have one. So Aaron repeats signs that God originally told Moses to perform. An example is Exodus 4, 29 through 30. We read this. We're still in chapter 4 here, but we're past the bridegroom of blood thing. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs. Aaron did the signs in the sight of the people. And of course, the outcome is positive. The elders believe, just like God said they would, despite Moses' unbelief. Aaron acts in the place of Moses at other times. Exodus 4 and 5 and 6, you see this going on. In Exodus 6:12, for instance, Moses, again, does not believe the people will listen to him. If he speaks God's words with them, I'll just read the verse. But Moses said to the Lord, behold, the people of Israel have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me? For I am of uncircumcised. He's complaining, look, I can't talk. I told you, God, I can't talk. You're not going to listen. So Aaron is brought on the scene in verse 13 in Exodus 6 to get the job done. And he does. In the rest of Exodus 6, we get you're reading along in Exodus 6, Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh, and they're duking it out, and all this kind of stuff. And then right in the middle of that, you get what? You get a genealogy. And we'll hit this when we get to chapter 6, but we get the genealogy of Moses and Aaron. And then the text adds what feels like an explanation for why the genealogies are even there. Okay, here's verse 26 with the comment on the genealogy. So you got Moses and Aaron. Aaron's the co-leader. He's doing what Moses won't do. And then you get a genealogy right in the middle of that, just thrown in there. And then you hit verse 26 right after the genealogy. This is what it says. These are the Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, bring out the people of Israel from the land of Egypt by their hosts. It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt, this Moses and this Aaron. Notice the plural language. These are the Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said to both of them, he spoke to both of them, bring out the people of Israel from the land. It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt, this Moses and this Aaron. On the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, the Lord said to Moses, I am the Lord, tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you. But Moses said to the Lord, behold, I'm of uncircumcised lips. How will Pharaoh listen to me? Yeah, the writer actually brings verse 12 back at the end of the genealogy and explains why it's there. It's because on the day that the Lord spoke to Moses in Egypt and said, you tell Pharaoh, I'm the Lord. Moses said, look, I can't talk well. Again, an editorial hand here has actually put verse 12 right back here, right after the genealogy to tell you why it's there, to tell you why there were co-leaders. And if you look at the situation, Moses saying, I can't talk, that is what prompted, that's part of the transition to Aaron, to include Aaron way back at the burning bush in chapter 4. So the writer or the editor is telling you, this is why we got two. This is why we have two and not one. So basically saying, this is why, there you go. Aaron's here because Moses chickened out, or he was just a rebel. He just was disobedient. He was faithless. And again, you take that against the context of the wider flow of biblical history. The leadership, again, up to this point had been one individual, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You can almost count Joseph, but we'll just stick with, the major patriarchs here. So you got at least three. You can throw Joseph in there if you want. Then you hit Moses. They're single leaders, single mediators. There's no duo. There's no duet. There's no team. Okay, here with Moses, it splits. Aaron's priesthood is a result of Moses' unbelief from the very beginning. It's a concession. Incidentally, this makes the golden calf incident all the more tragic. Again, we'll get to that in the future too, because it's Aaron's fault. Aaron screws up there. Moses gets better, but by then, again, the Aaronic priesthood is in place. So, this whole situation, this whole episode, these first 17 verses, and again, pick it up toward the end of chapter 4 as well. And we'll save the bridegroom of blood for next week. It's kind of important. And again, I think it's important because of the role it will play, the role it does play, and the role it will play later. Like if you get in the New Testament with Melchizedek and all that stuff, it creates a context for why Jesus, again, refuses the two leadership roles back into one. Now, there are kings like David. Again, you can go back and listen to episode 167. David does some priestly things. There are hints of this. Again, and it's important that it's David. It's important that it's Solomon, because these are the archetypal figures, especially David. And it's his line. It's his dynastic line. This is the line from which or through which God will produce the ultimate son of David, the Messiah. And when we get that in the New Testament, the two things are brought back together. We get back to God's original ideal of one person who is both the political, military, deliverer and the mediator between God and men. So this helps us understand why why there was two in so many other contexts, why it goes to one, because it was originally one, and this is a concession. So I think that's important. The other thing I think, again, that we can get out of this is the tolerance of God. I mean, even though he gets so angry, with Moses, and he's going to get angry with Moses on other occasions too. He doesn't allow Moses' obstinacy to thwart what he wants Moses to do. Now, that's not the case with everybody. Sometimes God just does say goodbye, so long, that kind of thing, and he moves to another. He does that with the kings, of Israel, the monarchy, the whole bit. He doesn't do it here, which again I think is significant. But it's really interesting, and we'll end with this. What's really interesting is when you actually read through the story, you get Aaron not only speaking for Moses, but actually doing things that Moses was supposed to do. And you get this weird, let's throw in a genealogy here so that our later readers know who we're talking about. It was these two guys. These two guys are who you think they are. It was the same Moses and Aaron that did, and the reason why we had two is because Moses just quit. He chickened out. He didn't want to do it. And so God had to bring Aaron back into the picture. I think there are wider implications here as well for, people who are sort of hung up on maybe priestly stuff as being, somehow we need to connect, priestly stuff to Jesus so that we do Jesus or worship Jesus, right? Or that we're disciples like Jesus. We got to throw in this Levitical stuff. Actually, that wasn't the ideal. It really wasn't. So we should really check ourselves and not make it the ideal right now. And that's contrary to, again, the patterning here. that goes from 1 to 2 back to 1. It's contrary to that. And really, ultimately, it's just completely unnecessary. So again, I think chapter 4 has some good things to teach us, but we want to stop here and devote a full episode to the bridegroom of blood, because that's just kind of weird. It'll be fun. Well, we're in Exodus 4, 18 through 31, and the whole thing isn't about the bridegroom of blood incident. That's really only 3 verses in this section, verses 24 through 26. And we've already, based on the last episode, we drifted over into this second half of chapter 4, so we've already touched on a few things in this section of verses 18 through 31, but our focus is going to be those specific verses, 24, 25, 26, today. But just, again, so that we're familiar with where we're at, I'm going to read the whole thing, the whole section. So starting in verse 18, we read, Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, and this is right after the burning bush story, or at least ostensibly. So Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. Verse 24, this is, again, these next few verses are going to be our focus. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. Back to verse 27. Then the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. That's the end of the section and the end of the chapter. Now you can already tell that this is kind of a chronological mess. You get the burning bush incident, and on the tail end of that, when Moses is basically saying, please find someone else to do this, and God gets angry at him, like we talked about last time. We've had a series of objections, and then Moses, if God gives him answers to all the objections, then Moses just flatly says, I don't want to go. God gets angry, and then God makes a concession to Moses, and we talked about the concession last time. This is where we get the Aaronic priesthood sort of launched. God brings Aaron into the picture as a concession to Moses, and God actually says, back in verse 14, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he's coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Well, between that statement of, hey, Aaron's on his way, he's coming out to meet you, we get Moses going back to Jethro, to ask him about going. Why didn't he wait for Aaron? We talked about this last time. And then you get God speaking again to Moses in Midian at apparently Jethro's place, because it follows his return to Jethro, where Jethro lives. And then you got all that going on. Then Moses takes off, and then we get the bridegroom of blood incident where God wants to kill Moses, apparently. And then after that, then we're back to Aaron. Then God says in verse 27, Lord said to Aaron, go to the wilderness and meet Moses. Well, I thought he already told Aaron to do that. And then they actually meet up, and then they wind up and eat. So chronologically, this is just a mess. And that's part of the problem. And, even if we took out verses 24 through 26, did we just, cut them out? We did a Thomas Jefferson or something. You still have a chronological problem because, hey, I thought back in verse 14, God had already tapped Aaron on the shoulder. Here in verse 27, he's doing it again. Well, what in the world's going on here? So we've got a chronological problem, to say the least. We've got the intrusion of this really bizarre episode, the bridegroom of blood. And so the issue is, what in the world, do we do with this stuff? Now, I would suggest, again, there are, broadly speaking, 2 ways to read verses 18 through 31. And I alluded to the first of these in the last episode. Honestly, you got to use your imagination here and sort of admit that you have to infer things, or things might be implied rather than stated. Okay, but let's just jump into it, because either way, there's a lot to deal with here. So there's 2 ways to sort of read this section. First one is you could say, well, it's implied in the previous section, the burning bush incident, the tail end of that Aaron is literally on his way, having been tapped or prompted by God to meet his brother Moses. That little phrase, he is coming out to meet you, again in verse 14. But we never read, of course, that they actually meet. Again, when we talked about this the last episode. Instead, we get the distinct impression from verses 18 and following that Moses just left. After God makes the concession, hey, we'll bring Aaron into the picture here to help you out. Moses just takes off, regardless of the fact that God said, hey, he's on his way. He's coming out to meet you. Well, apparently they never meet. Moses leaves. He goes back to Jethro's place. Now, we know that Jethro's place where he lived was not at the mountain of God because of Exodus 3:1, which we spent, 4 weeks on? Okay, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb at the mountain of God. So Jethro doesn't live at the mountain. It's not like the movie The Ten Commandments where, the mountain's a few hundred yards away or something. Okay, that's not the impression you get. So Moses goes back to Jethro's place. But then in verse 27, we see that Aaron meets Moses at the mountain of God. Apparently, again, we're just suggesting one way to look at this. Apparently, Moses went back to Sinai after returning to Jethro. But that raises 2 questions. Was it okay for Moses to leave Sinai at the end of the burning bush episode and go back to Jethro and then return to Sinai? We aren't told. We aren't told if God was good with that or not. But we could presume that it was okay because Aaron, for all we know, is back in Egypt. I mean, he's still back in Egypt. It would take a while for Aaron to get to Sinai. The second question it raises is, did God anticipate Moses' rebellion and call Aaron earlier? So Aaron is basically right around the corner, ready to meet Moses, and Moses takes off. We aren't told that either. And again, I'll just throw in a third question here. Did Moses return to Sinai with his tail between his legs in fear? Like he leaves when he's not supposed to. Then he talks to Jethro, and God taps him on that. God meets him again. God speaks to him again. Okay. And then Moses, okay, I got to go back to Sinai. I'm in trouble. Does he go back fearfully? Is that how we're supposed to read this? If so, was the threat of verses 24 through 26 when God's ready to kill him, is that directly related to Moses leaving, or is it related to something else? So we've got a number of questions here before we even get to the bizarre 3 verses that we're going to focus on, because we have a non-chronological thing going on in Exodus 4 that's really related again to the burning bush episode. Stuff that happens earlier, earlier in chapter 3 and chapter 4, but mostly chapter 4, because that's where you get the conversation between God and Moses, where Moses just basically says, I don't want to go, and then God makes a concession with Aaron. But there's another way to read this, okay? Here's the second way to sort of approach it. The other way to read this is that verses 24 through 26 are simply an intrusion. They're a literary intrusion. They have nothing to do with the chronology. It's placed there because the author isn't concerned with the chronology of things, but with telegraphing some other point. Okay, that's possible. We're going to encounter other places in Exodus that are clearly not chronological, even though they, we tend to think that as we're reading through a book, everything that's happening is chronological. But there are going to be some places where it's absolutely clear. For instance, we're going to hit one place where they put Aaron's rod before the testimony, and the testimony is a term that's related to the Ark of the Covenant. But that's in a chapter before the Ark of the Covenant is even created. It's not even made yet. So it's very obviously not chronological. So we're going to hit stuff like that in Exodus. So this is a possibility that verses 24 to 26 are just sort of dropped in there for some other reason other than the chronology. And in so doing, it kind of messes up the chronology for us. But let's be honest, even without those verses, there's stuff that messes up the chronology. Now, if this is the case, that verses 24 through 26 are just sort of dropped in there, that would mean that the meeting of verses 27 through 31 could actually follow verse 17. In other words, God sent Aaron to meet Moses at Sinai, suggesting Moses stayed there a while before going back to Jethro's place. We can imagine that happening. We can imagine verses 27 through 31 happening at Sinai before Moses goes back to Jethro in verse 18. If the sections of the chapter are loosed from being a strict chronology, then we can move them around. We can play with them a little bit. And that might be a way to approach this. But that creates a problem too. If this is the case, when does Moses actually meet Jethro to ask for permission, verse 18, to go to Egypt as the Lord commanded? And why would God have to speak to Moses again in Midian, reiterating the conversation about going to Egypt that had taken place at Sinai? In other words, if we move the meeting with Aaron, verses 27 to 31, up to happen right after the burning bush, then that should have been a settled matter. And then maybe that looks good preceding verse 18, but when you get into verse 18, the conversation that happens there, that messes with our mind too. That just doesn't seem to work either. Again, we just got a lot of problems here. There's a lot that, again, you have to sort of imagine and infer. And I'm going to do that as we proceed. I'm going to basically say how I would approach this. But on the surface, this is not a simple section. You might think it's a simple section. You might think the only thing that really needs any thought here are verses 24 through 26, the bridegroom of blood weirdness. But that's not the case. There's a lot of things going on here that just don't on the surface make sense. When you start looking at it, and if you made a play of this, if you were going to reenact it, how in the world would you do it? You'd run into all sorts of problems. So, what do we do with this? Now, I'll throw one more in. When you get to verse 20, that has Moses taking his sons, plural, and Zipporah when he starts on the trip to Egypt. But Exodus 18, verse 2 notes that at some point Moses had sent Zipporah back home to Midian. I'll just read you Exodus 18, too. Now, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home. Again, when did he send her home? Does that have any relationship to verse 24, which is the beginning of the bridegroom of blood incident? Would that suggest that the bridegroom of blood incident occurs on the way to Egypt? And then on the way, Zipporah and at least one son are in the scene. But then, maybe they get sent back later. Do they ever actually get to Egypt? Again, we don't know. How in the world, are we going to explain all that, then throw in the meeting with Aaron? Again, I'm trying to convey the sense that there's a lot that's confusing here. The chronology of events is really convoluted and problematic. It's hard to know if the parts of chapter 4 intend to give us any chronology or not. Again, it's another, critical scholars look at this kind of stuff and say, well, look, the reason this is a mess is because you have different sources. You have different source accounts that were stitched together by an editor. The whole JEDP thing, it's editing on steroids, okay? So again, it's hard to know, how these parts of chapter 4 relate to each other. It's also impossible to know why Zipporah was sent back and precisely when. The text isn't really clear on any of those details. We have to imagine events or the purpose of the placement of verses 24 through 26 and go from there. Now, here's what I would propose. And I'm admitting up front that it springs from my imagination. I'm trying to take the data and just sort of, again, be like a movie director or something. If this was a play, we're going to reenact this. How would we account for all of the elements in something of a coherent fashion if we were visually seeing what's going on here? I tend to think Moses takes off from Sinai, right after the burning bush incident. And again, I mentioned that in the last episode. Whether God was happy with that or not, we can't necessarily know. Okay, I could see it going either way. I tend to think Moses takes off from Sinai. He could have waited, but he doesn't. He goes to Jethro's place, which is not Sinai. And he starts to have second thoughts, which would be entirely consistent with Moses' character. Okay, and so that's why God speaks to him again. God actually speaks to him again. Verse 19, the Lord said to Moses in Midian, they're in Midian, he's in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses might have been having second thought, like, man, if I go back to Egypt, they're going to kill me. See, that wasn't mentioned earlier. So he may be having second thoughts, and the God has to come with him and look, don't worry about it, I'll handle it. Those guys are dead, get off your butt and go to Egypt, all right? So God speaks to him again while he's in Midian. And then Moses decides to tell Jethro he has to go to Egypt. And he does. Then he starts on the journey with Zipporah and the boys. The boys' names, of course, are Gershom and Eleazar. Their names are given later in Exodus 18, verses 2 through 4. On the way to Egypt, now here's a key element. And again, it's just springing from my imagination. I think this could have happened. On the way to Egypt, he passes by or near Sinai. Now, this is possible if Sinai is to the west of Midian, where Exodus 3:1 says it is. In other words, Moses has to journey around the north tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. He's got to go a little bit north and west, or maybe directly west, because we don't know where Jethro lived in Midian. We don't know what part of Midian. But anyway, Sinai, if it's west of Midian, would be on the way to going back to Egypt. So on the way to Egypt, Moses passes by, he stops at Sinai. Maybe he says, hey, we're going to Egypt, but first I have to meet Aaron at Sinai. And this is when the meeting, the episode of verses 27 through 31 occurs. God having called Aaron, tapped Aaron, weeks, months, we don't know, ago, because Aaron's in Egypt, he's got to make the trip too, the other direction. So it's at this point that Moses and Aaron meet, and they have the conversation they have in verses 27 through 31, and then together they head to Egypt. Now, God may not be happy. We could say that maybe, God thinks Moses should have stayed and waited for Aaron to, despite telling him Aaron was the solution, Moses loses heart, or the thought of the guys in Egypt trying to kill him surface in his mind. He has second thoughts. God has to speak to him again. All that's still up in the air, but at least we have a way to make sense of where Moses is and where he goes, his movements. He finally gets to Aaron at Sinai, at the mountain of God. As you look at verse 27, the Lord said to Aaron, go to the wilderness and meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God. So they finally connect at Sinai, and then they go to Egypt. So that's how I would sort of reconstruct in my mind what's going on here, to create a chronology out of this mess. To have it make sense, you have to infer some things. And I think that's legitimate. I mean, you got to do that in a lot of places, especially in narrative in the Old Testament. There's nothing that I just said that can't work with the text. I can't say that all that is spelled out in the text, because it's not. If it was, we wouldn't even be having the discussion. But nothing I just gave you there violates any point of the text. And so this is what we're trying to do, just trying to make sense out of it. So now a question, related question. Does the bridegroom of blood episode happen before or after they meet Aaron at Sinai? And if this is something of an intrusion, and we're not told at all, I mean, it has some connection to the itinerary, because verse 24 says, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought him to put him to death, okay? So this incident happens either before they meet up with Aaron or after. What is the way? Is it the way to Sinai that I've imagined, or the way to Egypt? Again, we're not told. So where does the bridegroom of blood episode happen? I would say it happens before they meet Aaron at Sinai. And I'm just going to say that my reasons for thinking that will become evident as we proceed here. I'm just going to telegraph it up front, so it's lurking in the back of your mind here. I think that the bridegroom of blood episode happens before they meet up with Aaron at Sinai. And then from Sinai, they go to Egypt. The only thing that might throw this off is verse 27's wording. The Lord said to Moses. Now, Moses should have already known what the Lord said about going to meet Aaron. He should have already known that. I mean, God has mentioned it before, but maybe the point is that, hey, Moses, God speaking to Moses, hey, we're good now. Okay, I'm not angry. I'm not going to kill you. Zipporah has taken care of the problem that was prompting me to think about killing you. So keep going to Sinai, hook up with Aaron, and then get to Egypt. Again, I still have to infer that. In other words, God says, we're good now and the plan is still on. Now, having said all that, I really don't think that the bridegroom of blood incident, verses 24 through 26, is actually about Moses' continued second guessing or faint-heartedness. I think it's about another problem with Moses. And I think that for a simple reason. Whatever the problem is, it's taken care of by a circumcision. That would really have nothing to do with Moses leaving Sinai or needing a pep talk from God. A circumcision doesn't fix those things. There's something going on in verses 24 through 26 that is an altogether different problem involving Moses. And that problem is taken care of by Zipporah's quick action in circumcising, performing the circumcision. Now let's look at verses 24 through 26 for the rest of our episode. Zero in on the bridegroom of blood stuff. I'm going to read the verses again. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin. Okay? Cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. Now I have, back in 2011, so this is 7 years ago, I had blogged about this. I had mentioned that in the last time. What I'm going to give you here, again, I think is just worded better than what was back on the blog. So I've actually swapped some of this discussion in. I more or less wanted to write this out for the sake of the blog, because there were some things in there that I thought were just not clear, not sufficiently clear. So I've tried to dress that up a little bit. So I'm telling you that here on the podcast. But what we're going to hear now, again, is essentially, you could have read it before already, on the blog. But I think the wording is better here. I just took a little more time to, for the sake of clarity, to try to dress things up. The issues are, again, as we look at verses 24 through 26, what are the things we need to think about? Well, there's what in the world is up with placing the foreskin at Moses' feet. It's kind of odd that God would want to kill Moses, especially on the heels of calling him and then making a concession for him with the Aaronic priesthood, and then reminding him that you need to go to Egypt while he's in Midian. Again, it would have to be something that's pretty significant, for Moses as the person God wants to lead his people, for God to just get this angry and consider killing him. The other issue is that, as we're going to see, there are certain ambiguities in these 3 verses in the text, specifically what certain verbs refer to and who the actors are precisely in the scene. Because I can tell you right now, the ESV has made, and every translation does this isn't a slap on the ESV. The ESV translator has inserted names and nouns in places in verses 24 through 26 where in the Hebrew text there are only pronouns, he and his and him. Okay, the translator has done that to try to make the content of these verses comprehensible. But we need to talk about that because knowing that certain things are ambiguous in the Hebrew text, like what does the pronoun refer to when it says his or him? Is it Moses' son or Moses? Again, which they're both masculine. So which one does the masculine pronoun refer to? You have to make an educated or an interpretive guess. You have to land somewhere in interpretation, and the translation, of course, is going to land somewhere to try to steer us through. But sometimes the choices that translators make are good. Sometimes they're not so good. Sometimes they help. Sometimes they muddy the waters even more. But we need to think about all of these things. So let's try to approach the stuff we need to think about. Really, I guess 2 trajectories here. So first, who is it that the Lord wanted to kill? Now you would think, and we've sort of presumed here in the sake of our discussion, you'd think that that's Moses. And most readers would assume it is Moses since he's mentioned in the preceding verses. But verse 24 actually doesn't name him. We see here, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. We don't get the Lord met Moses. We get the Lord met him. And you say, well, why is that an issue? Well, Moses is traveling with 2 boys, his 2 sons. Could it be that Moses or God wanted to put one of them to death? Would that make more sense? Because he just called Moses. Why does he want to kill him off now? I mean, you actually have this discussion going on. And since it's one of the boys' foreskins that is removed through circumcision, in other words, since the solution of the episode is the circumcision of one of the boys, maybe it's one of the boys that God wants to kill because he's uncircumcised. Okay? So, who exactly are we talking about? Who's under threat? The other, again, trajectory is, what does it mean for Zipporah to touch Moses' feet with the foreskin? There are 2 other factors, again, that are going to be part of this discussion as we try to take things in order. Again, Zipporah knows what to do. She's familiar with circumcision, obviously. She knows that it should be done, and she knows how to do it. She knows how it's done. So that is going to become a factor in interpretation as well. So we've got ambiguities in there. We've got some things we can assume about Zipporah, who is a Midianite woman. Again, and think of the Kenites. The Kenites should be familiar with the worship of Yahweh. And part of the worship of Yahweh, whether they're the quote-unquote, forgotten or lesser line, the non-elect line from Abraham, they still know about circumcision. Okay, so there's something going on there. Zipporah knows it's important. She knows what to do. She knows how to solve the problem. She knows what the problem is, and she takes care of business. And the way she takes care of business is circumcising her son. So we've got that much. Is the son the one under the threat? What about this touching the feet thing? Again, that's what we've, as we proceed, those are the questions we need to answer. So let's take things in order. With whom was God angry and why? Now, I would say it seems best to conclude that God is angry with Moses and not his son Gershom. Since Moses is the major character in the wider context, and Gershom is known only from Exodus 2:22 at this point, he has nothing to do with the story. And so despite the fact that it's the circumcision of the child that fixes the problem, or is it? Okay, or is it? Is God's anger pacified just by circumcising the boy, or is more needed? Yeah, we'll get back to that point. But if there's more needed, then it's not. We can't necessarily conclude that just because the boy is circumcised that he's the problem. So I think that Moses is the one under threat here. That just makes more sense. Scholars have noted that Moses is the center of Yahweh's attention everywhere else in the story, even in the digressions about Aaron. It's still really about Moses and how to deal with his resistance, his unbelief, his uncertainty. Really, I think you could call it rebellion in some sense as well. So that much seems clear. I mean, it's a better option. But of course, the question of why God is angry with him is still on the table. So I would say the answer to that question has to be inferred from 2 considerations. One, the Israelites born in Egypt had been circumcised. Okay, although this might still be a problem. They were circumcised, according to what God had passed on or told Abraham to do. We know from Joshua 5, verses 2 through 9. I'm just going to read you that section because it's going to become relevant here. We read again, this is Joshua. This is about, they're getting ready to go into the promised land. So it's much later. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. How can you be circumcised a second time? That's interesting, isn't it? So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeat ha-Aralot. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. Okay, so you've got kids, grown up, and apparently you could say, well, okay, they weren't circumcised yet. Why the second time? Verse 5, though all the people who came out of Egypt, okay, so verse 4 is about the kids that were born during the wilderness wanderings and all that, they need to be circumcised, okay, the boys, the men. But verse 5 harkens back to the previous generation. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. So verse 5, the first part of it says, the people who came out, had come out of Egypt, they had been circumcised. So they're doing circumcision in Egypt, okay, or, before this point. It's the ones afterwards that have not. But then what in the world is the second time thing going on? It's just really odd. Verse 7, so it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised all the way. So verse 8, they circumcised the whole nation. When that was finished, they remained in their places in the camp till they were healed. Then, of course, the conquest is going to start. So, what's up with this? How does it inform the issue with Moses? Why is God angry at him? And again, this has to be inferred from two considerations. The Israelites born in Egypt had been circumcised, apparently according to the covenant with Abraham. That's why they were doing it. And two, we have to consider the circumstances of Moses' birth and childhood again. Now, let's just jump in. With respect to the first of these items, it may be that the Israelites in Egypt practiced Egyptian circumcision. Okay, Israelites are in Egypt. What we just read in Joshua says they were circumcising down in Egypt. Maybe this Joshua doing the circumcision a second time, maybe this refers to the fact that, or to the possibility that, the circumcision they were doing in Egypt was not correct. Egyptian circumcision, which by the way refers to a method, not anything religious, like circumcision wasn't being done in honor to some foreign god, okay? Egyptian circumcision refers to a method. And it's possible Moses and other Israelite men were not properly circumcised. The second time in Joshua 5:2 might be an indication of this. That, yep, they were, but we got to do it again because it wasn't done right. Having fled from Egypt, God may have expected Moses to correct this before returning to Egypt. Because Moses is the representative now of Israel. He is the leader of Israel, whether he wants to be or not, he is. Aaron's going to again take up the slack, obviously. But Moses is the key figure here, and God might be angry with him because he has been circumcised incorrectly and never took care of the problem. Now, that's an argument from silence, but any other explanation is as well. So this is what we're dealing with here. Let me just rabbit trail a little bit about the circumcision thing in Egypt. Archaeologists and Egyptologists know that circumcision was practiced in Egypt by the Egyptians. However, Egyptian circumcision did not remove the foreskin. That's how it's possible you could be circumcised again, right? If it wasn't done properly. Egyptian circumcision did not remove the foreskin. Rather, the foreskin was just split. It was left there, but it was split. For this reason, any Israelite born in Egypt who happened to be circumcised in this way had not been circumcised in a manner acceptable to God's covenant. Now, those who take this trajectory as an explanation for God's anger would suggest that Egyptian circumcision is what's hinted at in Joshua 5:2, again about the second time, but also Joshua 5:9, which reads, and the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach from Egypt from you. Now, the reproach from Egypt might be their bondage and slavery because they're going to go into the land now and have their own land. I get that. But there are some who say that the issue with circumcising them the second time is correcting this Egyptian method. And maybe that is the reproach of Egypt. We're fixing that problem now by having everybody, both the men who came out of Egypt that are still around, and then the second generation that was born on the way in the wilderness wanderings. They're both circumcised properly now, both groups. So maybe that's what the reproach of Egypt refers to. Again, it's possible. So again, given this set of circumstances, the ceremony in Joshua 5 would be a second circumcision for some and a second circumcision for the males born in the wilderness wanderings. Again, Joshua 5:2 is really what this view hangs on, this reference to the second time. So that's one way to look at this. Since other Israelite males were circumcised prior to the conquest, again, prior to Joshua 5:2-9 at Gilgal, and some a second time, it is reasonable to assume, again, since they had to do this, since they had to fix this, first generation and second generation, it's reasonable to assume that Moses had never been circumcised or that he was circumcised according to Egyptian custom. The narrative of Moses' birth and childhood never states that his parents, like his Israelite parents, had him circumcised. Had the boy been marked by Hebrew circumcision, maybe his life would have been in danger in Pharaoh's household. Who knows? We can only speculate whether Pharaoh's daughter had him circumcised in the Egyptian manner after he entered her household. In either scenario, whether Pharaoh's daughter had this done according to the Egyptian custom, or whether his Israelite parents just didn't do it, again, thinking that, well, when the baby's discovered, if they see it's an Israelite male, they might kill him because that's what Pharaoh ordered. Okay, either scenario means that Moses did not bear the covenant sign, and that is why God is angry. Now, in his Exodus commentary, this is in the Word Biblical Commentary series, Durham notes this material. This is his discussion over all this. So it's not just Mike here, okay? Durham is going to he's going to cite an article by Jack Sasson. It's Sasson. So here we go. The quote is this. Sasson has pointed out convincingly that Egyptian circumcision was not only performed on adults, but was, by comparison with Hebrew circumcision, merely a partial circumcision. Indeed, he contends that circumcision may well have come to Egypt from North Syria, where it was practiced early in the 3rd millennium BC. For whatever reasons, the compiler, who set verses 24 through 26 in their present context, had apparently reached a conclusion confirmed by these facts. Perhaps he combined the abnormal circumstances by which the infant Moses had been hidden away at birth with some knowledge of the Egyptian practice and even a belief that the circumcision of infant boys was a late development in Israel's life. Quite possibly, he too was searching for some reason for Yahweh's serious encounter. Whatever the case, he clearly believed that Moses was uncircumcised and that Yahweh determined to stop him en route to Egypt for that reason. That's the end of the Durham quote. So again, this isn't Mike just sort of speculating. This is an explanation for why God is angry that other scholars have come up with, and again, just trying to overview the basis for it. Another angle, again with this, let's just go back to Moses' childhood here. Another angle is that it's possible Moses' mother would not have had him circumcised again because of the edict. I want to say a little bit more about that. Again, the rationale in that case would have been that maybe an Egyptian who discovers the boy will see him uncircumcised and have mercy on him or something like that. But see, there's a problem with that. Pharaoh's daughter knew immediately that the baby was a Hebrew. So the question is, how did she know? Now, it doesn't have to be because he was circumcised. It could be something as simple as, well, why would anybody else put their kid in a basket and set him afloat in the Nile? It's got to be a Hebrew kid. The movie, it has him with a Hebrew blanket or something. Just Ten Commandments movie doesn't get into all this stuff. So it doesn't have to, the fact that Pharaoh's daughter recognizes this as a Hebrew boy doesn't mean that the Hebrew boy was circumcised. He may not have been. Even if he was, again, there's no sense in avoiding the circumcision, you would think, because, she's trusting God or whatever. I think the chances are really good. I think that, if the Israelite parents of Moses had him circumcised, then there's no need for, the secondary Egyptian circumcision, which again did not remove the foreskin. So I think the best bet here is, again, it's all a guess. This is all speculation. I think the best bet is that Moses arrived in Pharaoh's household uncircumcised. Pharaoh's daughter had him circumcised according to the Egyptian custom, which was a partial circumcision. And that was never corrected when Moses fled Egypt and went into Midian. And he's not thinking about Yahweh at all. He's thinking about, I got to get out of Egypt and basically stay alive and have a nice home here. But God calls him at the burning bush incident. And again, we're not told. They don't have a conversation about circumcision. But apparently, God is thinking, do the math, Moses. You're in Midian. They worship Yahweh here. I'm Yahweh. I'm calling you to go to Egypt. You might want to bear the sign of the covenant people if you're leading the covenant people. But apparently that doesn't occur to Moses, or he says, I don't. Well, that's going to hurt. That's entirely consistent with Moses' character here. That's going to hurt. And I don't want to go anyway. So he goes back to Midian. He doesn't talk to Jethro right away. God has to remind him, you're supposed to go to Egypt. Okay, and God even, look, everybody who wanted you dead is dead now. Let's get the show on the road here. And Moses does. He moves. They go on their way and they stop at Sinai. They meet. They're going to do all that. But when he leaves Midian, and this is my view, when he leaves Midian, he's on the way to Sinai. This is before they've met Aaron. God gets angry because he has not taken care of the covenant sign of proper circumcision. Okay, this is how I would reconstruct things here. I think this is probably the best sort of scenario that we can garner and put together. Again, using some inference, using our imagination a little bit to infer some things about why God would have been angry and how the itinerary works. Now, the reason why I think this event happens before they meet Aaron is because Aaron is a priest. He's a Levite. He would know what to do. I mean, if it became clear that God's going to kill Moses unless we do the circumcision thing or whatever, he would know what to do. And so Zipporah would not have to perform the circumcision of her boy. Aaron would have done that. Again, this is all guesswork. It's an argument from silence. But I think, again, you can put the things together by making those inferences. So again, this is my view of how things are going on, what the scenario is. Now, you could ask, well, why didn't she just circumcise her husband Moses and then they, wait a few weeks or whatever? Moses is probably a crybaby about that. Like, he's a crybaby about everything. So, it might take a week or two or whatever, or maybe Moses would use it as an excuse to delay the trip even further. And I think that's the key. I think the reason why it was sufficient for Zipporah to circumcise the child and then touch Moses' feet, and we'll get to what feet are, with the foreskin of her son, sort of a circumcision by proxy. I think that's probably what's going on, that it's a symbolic gesture or something like that to have God's anger against Moses pacified. So let's just jump into the rest of it. So I think that is what's actually going on. And I think because she does it, they're not in Aaron's presence yet. Again, I'm fully admitting that I'm just using inferences here. And again, trying to piece together things from the data that aren't specifically said, but everybody has to do that. So we're at the point of asking the question, who was circumcised and what did it mean? Now, regardless of the fact that we don't know how to precisely take all this stuff because it's never spelled out, you got a couple options here. Either Moses was properly circumcised and he neglected to have his son circumcised, in which case God could be, in theory, mad at either one of them. But if that's the case, when they circumcise the kid, why doesn't it end there? Why doesn't it stop there? Why do you have to touch Moses' quote-unquote feet to make things good with God? So again, I think the real problem is Moses. Again, that his inadequate circumcision. And it's not just the boy. And I think that they don't circumcise Moses there because that's going to delay the trip even longer. And God wants him in Egypt. I mean, the one thing you do that does come through clearly if you read chapter 4 is God wants him in Egypt, like now. We're not going to put this off anymore. I've told Aaron to meet you. Let's go. Go. Okay, get out of here. So I think that, again, is part of the rationale. Now, the Midianites, again, as you think back to the Kenite episode, as worshipers of Yahweh, they're going to know about circumcision. They're going to know about Abraham. They're going to know about the covenant. They know about the necessary tool, the flint, knife there to do the rite. Again, they know what's going on here. So this is how I would handle the rest of our little weird, sidebar here, verses 24 through 26. Again, concerning whether Moses or his son Gershom was circumcised, clarity can be gained in Zipporah's act of touching the foreskin to the feet of Moses. And I think Moses is the issue. Let's talk about the feet before moving on. The Hebrew word for feet, regal, can refer to feet, legs, or genitals, according to Old Testament usage. This was a euphemism. It was a word that was used, again, as sort of a nice way, to refer to the genital area. Every language, every culture, has this sort of thing. Euphemistic language for private parts or sexual acts or something like that. Okay, this is what we're dealing with. For example, in Deuteronomy 28:57, we read, her afterbirth, this is again part of law, her afterbirth that comes out from between her feet and her children whom she bears, so on and so forth. Well, the afterbirth doesn't really come out between your feet. I mean, the legs are apart. And, I was there at the birth of my kid, and the afterbirth, the feet were there too. Look, the whole point is that the afterbirth comes out of the genital area of a woman. Go to Ezekiel 16:25. I think it's even clearer. This is the somewhat pornographic passage that we covered back in our series on Ezekiel, where the language is really graphic. Sexual language is really graphic there. And we have this verse I'm going to just go out to this one and pick up a little bit, maybe the verse before. I'll start in verse 23. So Judah is being compared to a whore, okay, a prostitute. prostituting herself with other nations, other gods, committing spiritual adultery, all this kind of stuff. Adultery and sexual whoredom were used as metaphors for spiritual unfaithfulness. So we read in verse 23, after all your wickedness, woe, woe to you, declares the Lord God. You built yourself a vaulted chamber, built yourself a bedroom there, you set up a bed, and made yourself a lofty place in every square. You're looking for clients at every street corner. At the head of every street, you built your lofty place and made your beauty an abomination, offering yourself to any passerby and multiplying your whoredom, your whoring. Now, ESV's offering yourself is literally in the Hebrew, spreading your regel, spreading your feet. It's exposing your genitals, spreading your legs. Okay, I mean that we get the idea. You're not, the woman in Ezekiel 16 who does this doesn't want some man to come by and touch her feet, like her real feet with toes. Okay, that's not what's going on there. This is euphemistic language again for the sexual, genital area. You get the same thing with Ruth 3 and 4. Again, Naomi tells Ruth, when Boaz lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go in and cover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. This is when Ruth wants to, and she gets the message across pretty well. She uncovers his genital area. I mean, they're wearing these long skirt things. She just flips it open. They don't have underwear, folks, in the Bible days. Okay, that'll probably become a meme now. They don't have underwear, so she exposes him. Why does she expose him? Why does Ruth do this to Boaz? It's a marriage proposal. I want you to marry me. I want to have your children. You need to redeem me. We're related. It's the law of the kinsman redeemer. She wants him to take her in, and become his wife. And then we get the whole thing about, well, there's somebody that's in line ahead of me, and got to take care of that kinsman thing according to the laws of Deuteronomy. Blah 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 blah. I mean, there's nothing sexual as far as intercourse that happens in the Ruth scene because that would have been a violation of the kinsman law. And Boaz doesn't do that. They go through the legal procedure before he can marry her. But she makes her intent, her wish, very obvious. She exposes him and then lays down. And it's like, okay, message understood. Because they have the conversation about what to do next. But again, the whole point is here, the reference to the feet is the genital area. Now, Durham, again, notes this. This isn't just Mike going to crazy town here. This is common, Old Testament scholarship. This is nothing new. You'd find this in serious commentaries written by various people. Again, Durham thinks this makes good, again, contextual sense as far as Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26, when, put it this way, the act of touching the foreskin of Moses' son, okay, Zipporah performs the circumcision, takes the foreskin and touches Moses' feet. The act of touching the foreskin to the feet, i.e. Moses' own genital area, the touching part is not part of normal circumcision. You don't read that as part of a procedure for circumcision, so there's some special circumstance. And of course, the circumstance is that Moses' own circumcision is not adequate. He has to be approved. He has to be sort of looped into the covenant relationship by proxy. He has to have this taken care of, like now, and then get to Egypt, like now. So it consequently only makes sense if Zipporah has circumcised her son, Gershom, and then symbolically transferred the circumcision to Moses by taking the foreskin and touching Moses' genitals with it. Under the circumstances, Moses would have been incapacitated had they done this to him, had they circumcised him. And they were already on the way to Egypt. So apparently, if you read again through verse 26, God was satisfied by the ritual act, and Zipporah had saved her husband's life. I mean, that's what's going on here. In regard to the phrase bridegroom of blood, the phrase is obviously associated with the marital relationship. Okay, the word bridegroom there. So why use the term, and what's the bridegroom of blood? I mean, what's the significance of the phrase? Moses' status as a bridegroom must, of course, have some importance here. And Durham, I'll just read from Durham here. Durham says, Zipporah, the only person available to perform the rite, and again, I agree with that because I don't think they've met Aaron yet, seizes the mandatory flint cutting tool and circumcises not Moses, who would have been temporarily incapacitated by the surgery, at a crucial time when he could no longer delay his journey. So she circumcises her son. For the child, who was not to make the journey to Egypt in any case, the effects of the circumcision would be less problematic. To transfer the effect of the rite, Zipporah touched the severed foreskin of her son to the genitals of Moses, intoning as she did so the ancient formula, recalling circumcision as a premarital rite. For a bridegroom of blood you are to me. This ancient phrase, as Mitchell has demonstrated, it was a phrase of marital relationship. Now, in other words, let me try to decipher some of that. Circumcision was a premarital ritual, obviously performed on a male infant, well before the boy's going to get married. As the sign of the covenant, circumcision identified men as Israelite for the sake of Israelite women, because they were only supposed to marry fellow Israelites. So when you got your man, or it's your honeymoon night, okay, the fact that he's circumcised is important because then you're marrying within the covenant bounds. This is why circumcision is, one of its meanings is, again, has to do with marriage, that the marriage is legit, okay, it's within, again, the Israelite community. So it ensured that the married couple were both Israelites and there was no forbidden intermarriage taking place. We have to assume that Zipporah had learned and embraced the idea that the God of the mountain she knew by virtue of her proximity to it, admitting it anyway. They had heard of Yahweh and they knew where the mountain was. It's not next door, but they know where it is. That this was the God of the Israelites, okay, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he was the true God. So Zipporah apparently knows that, believes it. This is particularly coherent if the Kenite connection involves the worship of Yahweh, which again we talked about at length. Zipporah's marriage to Moses linked her to the Israelite people. Okay, she's marrying Moses now, and their covenant relationship to Yahweh. Under normal circumstances, her husband would have been a circumcised Israelite man, but that apparently isn't what's going on here between the two of them. This ritual of circumcision by proxy made Moses her bridegroom of blood. It legitimized him as an Israelite man that she could marry and be secure in marrying within a covenant relationship with Yahweh. And so part of the ritual act of touching the foreskin of Gershom to Moses' genital area atoned for this oversight. And again, Zipporah saves Moses. And here's the kicker. We'll end with this. A little bit of a kicker here. Zipporah saves his life. How? By performing a priestly act. That's interesting in and of itself because she's a woman, right? A woman plays the role of a priest in this scene, and God accepts that. And the circumstances are unusual, but there it is. And this is why I think the incident occurred again before Moses linked up with Aaron. Had Aaron been there, he's a Levite, he likely would have done this, and there you go. And without getting into the whole, women in ministry issue, which if you're unfamiliar with me or my podcast or the blog, I don't know how many years ago, it was probably 5-6 years ago as well. I went through a blog series with my friend, John Hobbins, who is we met in the doctoral program at Wisconsin. John is a Methodist pastor, and his wife is also a pastor at the same church. So John proposed to me one day, hey, let's you and I blog back and forth about, the women in ministry issue. And I said to him, and we put it in the blog series, I said, okay, your mission here is to make me care. And the reason I said that is because I can argue both sides of this really well. And that alone tells me that, again, if you can argue both sides really well, and ultimately you get down to things like the non-use of accents in capital uncial script in Greek manuscripts. I'm not kidding. It gets that granular, to decide, this whole issue. So to me, this is something that, look, you'd have to be omniscient to know for sure where to land on this. And so to me, this is a conscience issue, which is why I said, just make me care. Whatever decision you make it before the Lord, and whatever it is, do a good job. Or not. I mean, this is how I would approach it with my own daughter. If I had a daughter, say, I feel called to the ministry, it's exactly what I would tell her. I don't know that this is the right decision, but I'm not going to get in your way. It's between you and the Lord, and in the providence of God, if this is what the Lord wants you to do, good, and do a good job. Don't screw up. That kind of thing. So beyond that, it's such a difficult issue. It's so granular. Anybody who tells you that there's nothing to see here and argue about, it's just wrong. They're just wrong. What things that you think are clear, like 1 Timothy 3, husband and one wife thing, trust me. You take that over the same description to deacons, and guess what? You got a female deacon in 1 Corinthians. Now what do you do with that? Well, that must have been the deacon's wife. Oh, really? Where does it say that? Well, it doesn't, but that's what I think because I need to think that because this is the view I want to defend. Exactly. So this is where this debate goes. It goes to, again, picking the things that you want to accentuate to defend your view. And I think the best thing to do here is just be honest and say, look, I can argue both sides of this really well. It's amazingly granular at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, we have to guess. And so I'm not going to disfellowship you on the basis of my guessing, even if I think the guessing is good. I'm just not going to do that. Like I like to say, I will let some other ministry fight Christians. I'm not going to do that. Let's circle it back here. I think it's interesting, though. You can't use Exodus 4:24 through 26 to say egalitarianism, that is, women can be ordained. Okay, egalitarianism is biblical. Look at what Zipporah did. Okay, that's an overuse of the data. The circumstances are really unusual. But on the other side, the complementarian side, which says women cannot be ordained, okay, they should not be in ministry, that side routinely neglects things like this. Okay, where God himself is good with a woman performing a priestly function. It's just there in the text. Now, it doesn't mean that their view is overturned either. You have to be able to say this is a proof of one thing to overturn the other. It becomes a little piece, a little cog, a little, just one of many items in this whole discussion, the women in ministry discussion. So you can go look at the website. Hobbins is spelled Hobbins. You'll find it if you put drmsh.com and Hobbins and women in ministry or something like that, and you're going to find our little back and forth. It was fun. I think it was entertaining and useful for some people. But to me, there's built-in ambiguity to the whole issue. It's very difficult. So I think extreme forms of complementarianism ought to at least take note of what's going on here in Exodus 4:24 through 26. Zipporah does what she does. It's a priestly role, and God is good with it. But that's about all you can say. You can't really build a view on that or overturn somebody else's view. We have to be honest with the limitations of the data, and just be good with that. So again, I'll let some other ministry beat up Christians on either side, from either side or against either. I'll let them do that. But I'm just not going to do that. There's just more interesting and better things to do with my time, and I think there's better things for you to do with your time than, again, try to take something that's ambiguous and pretend at the end of the day that it's not, because it is. Be warmed and filled. Pick the view that you prefer, but be honest with the other side and say, I'm here because I prefer this for this, that, and the other reason, but you are still a brother. I'm not going to look at you as any lesser because you don't take this particular issue the way I do. Okay, this is the way I approach prophecy. I mean, just any number of things. These things are what they are. I think we should study them. We should try to think well about them. But more important than that, is we should treat each other like not only fellow imagers, but brethren, brothers and sisters in the Lord, even when we come to disagree over things. So again, that was just a little bit of a sidebar. But I think, again, the passage is interesting just as a contributing point to that bigger theological discussion. So we're at the end of Exodus 4 here, and that means next time we will jump into chapter 5.
All right,
let's jump into to Exodus 5 and 6. We're going to go through both chapters, and we're going to make some observations here and there in the chapters, landing on subject matter that we've tracked on before, like I mentioned a few moments ago. And then there's going to be one particular new item that is, I think, kind of in the sweet spot here of interest, for this audience, how the content here relates specifically to Egyptology and ancient Egypt. But let's just jump in. We can start here in chapter 5, first verse. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord?" And again, Lord is in all small caps there. So it's who is Yahweh, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh. And moreover, I will not let Israel go. If you look at what Pharaoh says here, who's Yahweh, that I should obey his voice? This is precisely what someone who thinks himself a deity would say. So right off the bat, the whole confrontation, is really portrayed not just between a king and some guys showing up out of the desert, and it's not going to be a debate or some sort of power struggle that's sort of only operative on the human plane. You have a person, Pharaoh, who considers himself Horus incarnate, and so does everybody else that's listening, being challenged by a couple of hicks, all right, from Midian or from right there in Egypt, among a servant, indentured servant population, challenging Pharaoh's authority and really his status as deity, the one who controls and maintains order in Egypt. Pharaoh, we talked about this earlier in other episodes, as the incarnate Horus was the one who maintains the divinely dictated ma'at, which is an Egyptian word for order, cosmic order, the way things are supposed to be. Pharaoh is the central figure in maintaining that as the incarnate Horus. And so now we're confronted by this other deity, Yahweh, and the incarnate Horus says, well, who's that? So it takes on a whole different flavor right from the get-go. And again, ancient readers, and of course the writer, would have known this. They're going to see through this because they know what the Egyptians think of Pharaoh, they know what Pharaoh thinks of himself, and so on and so forth. So this is exactly, again, what somebody who thinks himself a deity would say. And everything just sort of takes off from there. But the next verse says, then they said, Moses and Aaron, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Now, this is going to take us on a bit of a rabbit trail again, but a rabbit trail that we've been on many times, and that is the whole Sinai location thing again. So there's another problem here in this verse for both the traditional Sinai location, that's Jebel Musa, in the V down there in the south, in the V between the forks of the Red Sea, and it's also a problem for the Jebel El-Lawz location in Midian. And I might add, it's also a problem for Sinai in Edom and Seir, Paran, and Timan area, that I've spent a lot of time talking about. And we've been through a number of passages, that link Sinai and Yahweh's march from the south to this area. Exodus 5:3 is a problem for all of them. And I've mentioned before that, ultimately the real answer to what the location of Sinai is nobody really knows. And there are problems, with all the options. There just are. Now, you say, well, what's the problem here? Let me read it again. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. 3 days. So the question is, from where the Hebrews are living in Egypt, the Eastern Delta, how far can you get in 3 days? Well, I'll let you ponder that. And I'm going to take you back to Exodus 3, because this isn't a throwaway line, let us go 3 days. It shows up in other passages. It's to be taken seriously. So if you go back to Exodus 3, 14 through 18, again, this is the revelation of the divine name, we read this. God said to Moses, this is after Moses says, well, who should I say sent me? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey, and they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt, which is what is happening in chapter 5. You will go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now, please, let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. That's exactly what they say here. Exodus 5:3, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please, let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. We see it again in Exodus chapter 8. Okay, this is a little bit later in the drama. Exodus 8, 25 through 27. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron. This is after he's getting hit with some plagues here. He calls Moses and Aaron and said, go, get out of here. Sacrifice to your God within the land. But Moses said, it would not be right to do so, for the offerings we shall sacrifice to the Lord our God are an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice offerings abominable to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? Verse 27. We must go 3 days journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he tells us. So here's the issue. Either God, who gave them this direction in the first place at the burning bush, either God meant for them to go 3 days into the wilderness and do this sacrificing, or he didn't, because they did not mishear him. They repeat what God said. The verb of sacrifice used in all of these passages I just read is the same. Now, guess where we see the Israelites offering sacrifice? Again, the very same verb, to the Lord as a newly redeemed people. Guess where we see that? That's correct, at Mount Sinai. Exodus 24:5. He, Moses, sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. Moses took half the blood, put it in basins, half the blood he threw against the altar. This is the Sinai covenant ceremony. This is what they actually do. Now, here's the question. If they're doing this at Sinai, and we take the words that we've read once from God's mouth himself at the burning bush, if we take those words seriously, then the location of Sinai must be 3 days' journey from where they leave in Egypt. You cannot get to Jebel Musa, the traditional Sinai site, in 3 days. You can't get to Jebel El-Lawz, which is on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba, in 3 days. You just can't do it. It can't work. Now, you might be able to get to Kadesh Barnea in 3 days. And I mentioned Kadesh Barnea because after the the episodes, we did on the Sinai location. I posted something on my website, just with a little more detail to explain to people why I don't hold the traditional view and why I abandon the Jebel Allah's view. And there's an incident in Exodus 17 that links Kadesh Barnea with, the splitting of the rock and Rephidim and then the location of Sinai. And that's right adjacent to Seir and Timan and Paran. So there's something going on. These events are going on in this area south of Canaan, north of the Gulf of Aqaba, and also north of the Negev. So this is where the Sinai stuff is happening. It's not happening at the traditional site. It's not happening over at the Jebel Allah's site. And Kadesh Barnea, there are different names, that are used of the same location, and there are different names that are used, to connecting this with Horeb and Sinai. You can go up to the website and read the stuff, all the detail. So if we're looking at the Kadesh Barnea area, which would be the closest part of this region where all this stuff is happening to Egypt, you might be able, if you really, really hustle, you might be able to get there in 3 days. But it's kind of doubtful. So there's even a problem with this. Plus, you have other textual problems as it relates to what's going on. We have a statement in Deuteronomy 1:2 that it's 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Now, we know from our previous episodes that there are certain passages that take the name Horeb and associate it with Mount Sinai. But there are other verses that take Horeb, and it's not a specific mountain, it's an area, a mountainous area. So how do we take Deuteronomy 1:2 there? And how does it relate to this 3 days thing that we just read 3 times? Again, the first of which comes right from the mouth of God at the burning bush. 3 days' journey. How do we relate that to this 11-day thing, in Deuteronomy 1:2? You also have Deuteronomy 1:19. Then we set out from Horeb. Again, is it a mountain, specific mountain, or a mountainous area? Then we set out from Horeb and went through all that great and terrifying wilderness that you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, as the Lord our God commanded us. And we came to Kadesh Barnea. So this has to be a regional thing because it's disconnected, but still in relation to Kadesh Barnea. How do we take that? And worst of all, how do we take Numbers 33? In Numbers 33, you have this long itinerary of the journey from Egypt, to Sinai and into the wilderness, okay? Numbers 33 has multiple stations between the term Sinai and Horeb and Kadesh. Now that seemingly requires ignoring passages that link Sinai and Kadesh, but you can't just do that and have a coherent, inerrant view of the itinerary. Now the problems here that I'm describing may be lessened by creating the more legitimate distinction between Horeb and Sinai. Again, sometimes it's a mountain, sometimes it's not. Again, it could be just a generic reference to a desert wilderness. You might, that's going to help. It's going to contribute, to how you untangle, and then put back together all of this stuff. You've got these 3-day, verses. You've got the 11-day verse in Deuteronomy. You've got, where is Horeb and Sinai? Are they the same or are they different? What about all these stages in Numbers 33? Now, when we get to the actual root of the Exodus, you're going to see that Numbers 33 presents a few additional problems. My point with all this is that it is not possible to be certain about the location of Mount Sinai. It just isn't. I'm telling you the truth. This is what we do here. I'm telling you like it is. And if you're taking the 3 days thing seriously, and I would suggest we do that because that's what God tells them at the burning bush, you cannot get to Jebel Musa in 3 days. You cannot get to Jebel Allah's in 3 days. Now, there is a location we have not even talked about that is adjacent to the Kadesh Barnea area, and it's a little bit west of that, and it's more west of Edom and Seir and Paran and all that stuff. So again, how does all this go together? And that other location is Har Karkom. And there are some scholars who park on Har Karkom as being Mount Sinai for this very reason, the 3-day journey thing, plus the Kadesh and the march from the south stuff, that gets factored in. But all of those views, even that alternative view, and some other view that isn't Jebel Musa or Jebel Allah's, all of that, any alternative view has to figure out what to do with these chronological statements and these number of days statements. And I'm just telling you the truth. Nobody knows precisely where this was. About the best you can do is say, look, there are certain options. And again, for me, it's the traditional site and Jebel Allah's. Even though I used to hold the Jebel Allah's view when I started running into this stuff, I had to abandon it. And again, the march from the south is a big deal for me, and the 3-day journey. I didn't even mention that on the earlier podcast, but here it is because this is it comes up here in the confrontation, which is the context of the Exodus 3 statement. This is a big deal. You just can't get to those locations in 3 days. They didn't have cars, okay? You can't do it. And in our earlier episodes about Sinai, about the 11-day thing, I postulate, because I do think it makes more sense than what Graham Davies is saying about this is 11 consecutive days in one direction. I just don't buy that. There's nothing in the text that requires that. And he's trying to do math about how long, how much territory can be discovered by adult males and soldiers and stuff like that, or just normal adult males in a day. Look, you're not dealing with adult males here. Half of your population is women and children, and then livestock. So this is why even the 3 days to Har Karkom, that's a huge undertaking. Even that's a stretch, because the travel is going to be slow, because of who's taking the trip. These are not just adult males, and not everybody can ride a camel. Okay, most of the people are going to be walking. These are significant issues, and nobody has really produced a coherent, satisfactory explanation for how to take all these things, put them together, and come out at a coherent location that works, especially with the 3 days verse, but works with some of these other indicators. Nobody knows. The Jebel Musa site is nothing more than church tradition. That's what it is. Constantine's mom, this is the site. Okay, that's the site. Again, it might be workable in many respects, but you're not getting there in 3 days. And according to Exodus 24, that is where Israel offers sacrifice to the Lord as the Lord told them to do. So either the 3 days thing is wrong or the Exodus 24 thing is wrong. Take your pick. This is what you're up against when it comes to this kind of data. You don't get to articulate a view. And again, I accuse the scholarly community of this with the traditional data. It's one of those things that rarely gets examined. If I was at an academic meeting, I'd say, tell me how you get to Jebel Musa in 3 days. Now, what they're going to tell you if you're at SBL or ASOR, it's just wrong. The 3 days is wrong. It's just, we can't take that at face value. Well, thanks. That really solves the problem. That's the kind of thing that scholars get to do. They just get to say to the stuff that's in their way, it's not accurate. I don't think that we just get to do that willy-nilly. Right? That's really suspicious to me. That's cheating. And so any view held by anyone has got to take these things seriously and work them out. And good luck. Here we are again. We're back to the whole Sinai thing. This is not easy. And again, my view is nobody's right here. Nobody really, really knows. And again, I haven't come across a really good explanation. And to be honest with you, I'm not going to noodle it to do it because I'm just not that interested in it. I don't really want to spend my life, or 10 years of my life, whatever it would take, kind of like the authorship of the book of Hebrews. Like at the end of the day, okay, I'll assume there's a solution out there, but in that 5 or 10 years it would take me to figure this out, I could have produced a whole lot of stuff that's really useful. This is not as useful. It is not as good of a use of my limited time because someday I'm going to die. And I don't want to have devoted my life to this question or questions like the authorship of the book of Hebrews. I keep poking fun at that. That's kind of like an inside academic joke, for the scholar who sort of drove himself insane. What was he trying to figure out who wrote Hebrews? They're just better things to do. They just are. But I want you again to be disabused of the notion that this has been solved. It hasn't. Let's go on in chapter 5 here before we spend too much of this time on this subject. You get from verse 4 to 23 the rest of the confrontation, with Pharaoh, and this is the bricks and straw episode, where Pharaoh says, "Hey, you must have a lot of time here. Your people have a lot of time on your hands. You're wasting my time. You're wasting their time with these meetings." He says in verse 5, "The people of the land are now many. You make them rest from their burdens, by all this brickety-brack." So he commands, the taskmasters of the people and their foremen, "You shall no longer give people straw to make bricks. As in the past, let them go and gather straw themselves." We're familiar with this scene and what happens. This increases the burden of the Israelites, and they complain to Moses and Aaron about what they're doing. This is a very straightforward account here. And I only want to mention John Currid, who's a trained Egyptologist, and he's an Old Testament guy as well. I mentioned his book, Egypt in the Old Testament, before. He's also written a commentary on the first 18 volumes. He may have both volumes done now, but on this a study commentary on Exodus. And just a little note here that he throws in here. He says, "A famous brick-making scene is pictured on the walls of the Rech Mirah chapel in Thebes, dating to the middle of the 15th century BC. So this is the 1400s BC. It illustrates the process of brick-making in Egypt, and what is demonstrated there fits well with the biblical description of Exodus 5, and it does. We'll have pictures of those tomb wall paintings on the episode site for this episode, and you can see again they're making bricks in the picture, and they're cutting straw in the picture. I mean, this is a very coherent, historically on target description of how bricks were made. And again, we all know this story, so we're going to move on from this because it's very straightforward. But you should just know that this is one of those good touch points in the Exodus narrative that this is how they did it, and the evidence, the not photographic obviously, but the pictorial evidence from Egypt aligns very nicely here. When we get into Exodus 6, again after this episode with the bricks and the straw, and then we have, the confrontation gets ramped up a little bit. Exodus 6, the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh." Okay, so Pharaoh makes the task harder. The people complain. Moses is like, at the end of chapter 5, "Lord, why have you done this to the people? Why did you ever send me? Blah, I was right. They're not going to listen." This whole thing. But the Lord says to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." In other words, Pharaoh's going to be glad to get rid of you by the time I'm done with Pharaoh. He will be thrilled to see you go. God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Okay, as God Almighty. "But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them." Again, this is we're going to come back, to Exodus 6:3. And we've already mentioned Exodus 3 or 6:3 before when it comes to the whole, the Kenite hypothesis and all that sort of thing. This verse does not need to be translated specifically the way most translations have it, because critics, they typically like to refer to this verse again to say that they didn't know who Yahweh was. Not only did they not know, who Yahweh was, but we've got a situation where they're not worshiping Yahweh. This is all entirely new. So on and so forth. Critics, again, will sort of pounce on this. This is a big sort of go-to passage to justify all of JEDP and that sort of thing. But what we really need to realize here is that this verse, I'm going to read it to you again. "I am the Lord." Okay, that's the end of verse 2. "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them." And that makes it sound like the patriarchs had never heard of the name Yahweh because of the way this verse is translated. Now, you could go up and Google this, but I'm just going to read a little section to you. I blogged a long time ago. I had an online review of the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary, the first volume there of the Torah. And I left a few notes there about Exodus. And this is one of the things I sort of nitpicked with the resource. I like the series. I mean, don't get me wrong, the series is really good. But the editor, who's Bruce Wells, who's a good guy, But I wrote here, Wells fails to note that there is a substantive disagreement on the accepted translation. Now, I'll stop there and say it's not a well-known disagreement, but it is substantive. It's for real. Even though you won't have scholars who use the verse to promote JEDP, or scholars who use the verse to promote the notion that Yahweh's name and his worship was entirely foreign to the patriarchs. Those people who are already in that camp, they'll never introduce you to what I'm about to say in relation to Francis Anderson, who was a very well-known, both in critical circles and in Christian circles. I think he's still alive. This is the Anderson of the Anderson Forbes database. Frank is in his 90s. He lives in Australia if he's still with us. But a very, very widely published, widely respected Hebrew scholar. He wrote a book called The Sentence in Biblical Hebrew. Doesn't that sound exciting? On syntactical grounds, Anderson argues for a translation that is basically opposite in its meaning to the accepted view or the most common translation, like what I just read to you out of the ESV. Here's how Anderson argues in this book. And this is an obscure book. It's not a book for anybody who doesn't know Hebrew and Hebrew syntax well. Again, this is an academic scholarly publication, but Anderson argues for a translation that's basically opposite. Here's how he translates this verse. At the end of verse 2, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, and my name is Yahweh. Did I not make myself known to them? It's 180 degrees away from the way Exodus 6:3 is usually translated. And again, for technical reasons, if you're into Hebrew, I would recommend get Anderson's book. You will very seldom, unfortunately, you will very seldom read any interaction with Anderson's book on this verse. I would venture to guess that it's either ignored by critical scholars, they don't care, or they just don't know about it. And the reason I wonder about it is there's a very lengthy JBL, Journal of Biblical Literature article by Randall Garr, who's an expert in Semitic philology and Semitic grammar on Exodus 6:3, and he never footnotes or even mentions Anderson's book, not once. Now, to me, that's either a huge oversight or it's a thing that just gets in the way, and so we're not going to include it. I don't know what's the explanation there, but he doesn't mention it once. So you, my audience, should know that this is not a given. The translation of this verse is not a given, and so if this is ever whipped out at you for whatever reason, I mean, you all know that I don't buy the JEDP view, but I also don't buy the everything's Moses view. I think editing is very obvious in the Torah. I think multiple hands are very obvious in the Torah. So I'm not either one of those, and I'm just telling you that this verse is not the load of ammunition that the dyed-in-the-wool JEDPers make it to be. It just isn't. So let's move on from that and focus on what I really want to get into here for the rest of our time. And that is the motif that's going to be, it's come up here, the strong hand, the strong arm, okay, that kind of phrasing. So those and similar phrases are what I want to focus on here. You go down into Exodus 6, in verse 6, say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. How many times does he have to say this? Isn't it interesting? I am Yahweh. It's an assertion of authority. Moses spoke thus to the people of Israel, but they didn't listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and harsh slavery. So God is going to send him back to Pharaoh. Go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the people go out of this land. But Moses said, Lord, behold, the people of Israel haven't listened to me. How's Pharaoh going to listen to me? For I am of uncircumcised lips. So here we go again. Moses making excuses about being able to deliver the message. Verse 13, but the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. Here we go again. We've mentioned this before. Aaron keeps coming back into the picture. He is the concession to Moses. And he gave them a charge about the people of Israel and about Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. And the rest of the scene unfolds. Now, what I want to focus on here are the phrases strong hand and outstretched arm. I'm going to reference James Hoffmeyer here. Now, I've already mentioned Hoffmeyer's book on Israel and Egypt. I mentioned, I can't remember what the specific article was on, something about, I can't remember. It was Pitham and Ramses or something like that. This is a different article, and it's specifically on this topic. So what you're going to hear from this point on is drawn from Hoffmeyer's article entitled The Arm of God versus the Arm of Pharaoh in the Exodus Narratives. It's from the journal Biblica, volume 67, number 3, 1986, pages 378 through 387. Now, Hoffmeyer, again, has his PhD from Toronto in Egyptology. He knows the Egyptian material very well. He teaches at Wheaton now, where he has for a number of years. He was at TEDS before that. But he writes this. The Exodus traditions assert that Israel attained her liberation from Egypt by God's agency, symbolized by his victorious conquering arm. There are several expressions used to describe the victorious arm, but two stand out as being the most frequently occurring, being strong hand. It's in Exodus 3:19, Exodus 13, verses 3, 14, and 16, Exodus 32:11. And then there's a series of references in Deuteronomy, again, looking back at the events here. And then outstretched arm occurs in Exodus 6:6. We just read that. Deuteronomy 9:29, Deuteronomy 26:8, again, looking back at these things. Hoffmeyer says, now both expressions are used in parallel with each other in Deuteronomy 4:34 and Deuteronomy 5:15 and Deuteronomy 7:19. So we know that they are synonymous expressions. That's not a point of speculation, that's for sure. Hoffmeyer adds, hand and arm both mean hand or arm, like it can mean that literally, but metaphorically they mean power and strength. It is well recognized that the language of the Exodus narrative is connected with the motif of Yahweh as the divine warrior. So this militaristic imagery should not be surprising. Placing the origins of the conquering arm motif in the Exodus makes especially good sense once the Egyptian concepts surrounding Pharaoh as a warrior are examined. Pharaoh was Horus incarnate. Horus, of course, fought against Seth in the pyramid texts. Let me just break in here. In Egyptian mythology about how Egypt came to be, Horus and Seth battled. This is the sort of religious framework. So there were two lands in Egypt. There's an Upper Egypt and a Lower Egypt, and they, in the beginning of Egyptian dynastic history, they were separate, and then they get unified militarily. And part of the framework for that is this Horus and Seth fight. And then the pharaoh, it becomes the incarnate Horus, and he's the great warrior. Is the point. Now back to Hofmeyr, starting with the scenes of the monarchs of dynasties 5 and 6, such as Sahura, Niusera, Jed-Kara, and Pepi. Inscriptions are included which say, quote, "The great god who strikes Asiatics." Asiatics are Semitic people in Egyptian thought. "We see the king defeating his foes with his conquering arm, even though no direct reference is made to the arm." But later, Hofmeyr, we're skipping around at Hofmeyr here. Later, he says, "It is not until the Middle Kingdom, which is 1970 to 1800 BC, that we begin to see expressions related to the conquering arm of Pharaoh appearing. Of particular interest is the term Kepesh, which means arm or power, and it's found beginning in the 12th dynasty and continues with even greater frequency into the New Kingdom. Kepesh begins to appear in royal titles and names in the Hyksos period. The Hyksos king Apophis bears the prenomen Neb Kepesh Ra, which translates Ra is lord or possessor of a strong arm. This is one of the names of that particular pharaoh. Remember, we mentioned this earlier when we were talking about chronology. The pharaohs had 5 names. There was a 5-fold titulary. And so Hofmeyr is pointing out that you're going to get certain pharaohs that one of their names has this Kepesh in it, this reference to a strong arm. And it's metaphorical again for a militaristic leader. Back to Hofmeyr. As might be expected, the use of Kepesh on royal titles reaches its zenith during the days of the military-minded Thutmosid and Ramesside kings of the 18th and 19th dynasties. Hofmeyr then goes on in his article. He goes through a series of examples. He goes through Egyptian texts where you have an outstretched arm, strong arm and hand, all this kind of stuff in Egyptian texts associated with the portrait of Pharaoh. Again, the incarnate Horus as a great warrior. Back to him more specifically. Later in his article, he says, "Our second and third observations have to do with why the biblical writers chose to use the expressions strong hand and outstretched arm. The foregoing references, again, that he lists out in his article, illustrate that the pharaohs, especially those of the New Kingdom," you can interjecting, which is when all the Exodus stuff's happening by either the early or late date, especially those of the New Kingdom, those pharaohs recognized that their power to conquer, subdue, hunt, etc., was linked to their mighty arms. One cannot help but wonder if the biblical writers were not consciously using expressions like strong hand and outstretched arm polemically against the Egyptian concepts that were embodied in Pharaoh. The Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 has been called Israel's victory or triumph hymn. That's the one who is like you among the gods. Again, and there are things in there, again, that are going to strike at Pharaoh's status, because who is like you among the gods? Well, Pharaoh's included in that. And Pharaoh just got his butt kicked, at the crossing of the Red Sea. The Lord, Yahweh delivered his people with a strong hand or a strong arm or an outstretched arm. So Hofmeyr is wondering, on paper, hey, I wonder, if the biblical writers were doing this on purpose. Is it a poke in the eye to Pharaoh? Again, Hofmeyr is going to say, yeah, it was, and I would agree with him. Back to Hofmeyr again, he says, Yahweh demonstrated his legitimacy as the greatest God by his arm defeating that of Pharaoh. And this language, again, would have been a direct confrontation to Pharaoh's status as the deity incarnate who is the greatest military power. Hofmeyr writes, the Hebrew prophets recognized that the consequences of the clash between God and Pharaoh meant that Yahweh was superior to all gods. What better way for the Exodus traditions to describe God's victory over Pharaoh, and as a result of his superiority, than to use the Hebrew derivations or Hebrew counterparts to Egyptian expressions that symbolized Egyptian royal power. And that's the end of what I want to give you from Hofmeyr. But I think he's spot on here. For a biblical writer to use these phrases, again, they're found elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, but specifically here in Exodus, you get several of them, and then you get the same language again in other passages that harken back to the Exodus event in some way. That's not a coincidence. That is the biblical writer digging, poking not only Pharaoh in the eye, but the Egyptians in the eye, and then as other Semitic people, because Egyptians a powerful civilization for a long time, and lots of people in Canaan, with the Elamarna text are evidence of this. The Egyptians are running things in Canaan for a long time. They're going to be familiar. Semitic people are going to be familiar with these expressions, and so when they hear the Hebrews talking in these terms, or when they read Hebrew texts talking in these terms, they know exactly what's going on. This is a dig. This is a diss. This is a swipe at Pharaoh specifically. So it's just not coincidental. It's a good literary intersection between Egypt and the Hebrew Bible. Now, if you keep reading verses 14 through 26 in Exodus 6, you have this intrusive genealogy, which we mentioned when we talked about the Aaronic concession, the priesthood of Aaron. So this is when you get, at this point in the story, you get this weird genealogy just sort of dropped in here. Like, well, that's in the way. What's that doing there? And we talked about that before, so I'm not going to rehearse kind of all of its purposes. But again, it's to remind readers that Aaron's in the picture now, both Moses and Aaron's the same Moses and Aaron that did this, that, and the other thing. Again, to sort of make it clear that our only leader is not Moses, it's Moses and Aaron. We've got two now instead of one. It contributes to the elevation of the Aaronic priesthood, obviously, which wasn't the original plan. Again, had Moses never complained at the burning bush, there would have been no need to bring Aaron into the picture, is the point. But since that did happen, here's another reminder of who's who. Now, Sarna comments, this is Sarna in his Exodus commentary, about the genealogy. He says this, A detailed analysis of the content of the genealogy discloses careful design and purpose. The line of the Levites is framed by a separate introduction and conclusion. That's verses 16 and 26. The lifespans of individuals are registered only in the list of Levites, verses 16, 18, and 20. And the descendants of Levi are traced to 5 generations in contrast to the single generation given for the Reubenites and the Simeonites. Still more peculiarities appear in the Levitical listing. Aaron's name precedes that of Moses, verse 20. Moses' wife is not mentioned, but Aaron's is, verse 23. Only the fathers-in-law of Aaron and his son Eleazar are named, verses 23 through 25. Only Aaron's brother-in-law is recorded. Only Aaron's descendants, and not those of Moses, are listed, and to 3 generations. To put it all another way, the Levites are here singled out from among the other tribes of Israel. The Aaronites are distinguished from among the other Levitical families, and there is a further differentiation within the Aaronite families themselves. These special features undoubtedly anticipate later developments: the special status to be granted to the tribe of Levi, the appointment of the Aaronites to serve as priests, the investment of Aaron as high priest, with one specific line of his descendants exclusively designated to succeed him. The exaltation of Aaron is enhanced even further by the note about his marriage in verse 23. His brother-in-law, Nahshon, and also presumably his father-in-law, Aminadab, was a chieftain of the tribe of Judah and an ancestor of King David. That's the end of the Sarna quote. So there's, again, genealogies on the surface are pretty boring, but there's a lot of stuff that they're kind of like congressional bills. There's a lot of stuff that's just snuck into them. And if anybody reads them closely, you'll find that stuff out. This is very clearly designed to bring Aaron and his line, the Levites, on par with Moses. And again, that's why it harkens back to the whole concession narrative. Now, just a few isolated observations within the genealogy. When you go down to verse 20, we have this mention. We have the mention of Amram and Jochebed, Moses' parents. So it says Amram took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, or Yocheved, would be the better Hebraic pronunciation. Amram took his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. The years of the life of Amram being 137 years. Now, a couple of notes here. The line about his father's sister, marriage to a paternal aunt, is prohibited in Leviticus 18:12 and 20:19. Therefore, the present notice, Sarna says, must preserve a very ancient tradition. Now, again, we're not going to get into all the authorship issues, but if you're thinking that Moses, after the fact, is writing all of the Torah, why would he put that line in there? Why would he have or why would he have their parents, both the parents of him and Aaron, why would he have his mother and father's marriage be delegitimized by Mosaic law if Moses is the author? There's just things like this that come up, as opposed to somebody, and it could have been Moses, it could have been a more ancient tradition. I mean, Sarna, sure, there could have been something around, oral tradition or whatever, that predates, the codification, the literary product, of Leviticus and the Torah and whatnot. But again, it's still a question. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? This is the kind of thing that scholars fixate on when it comes to authorship issues, because they read the text really closely. And they'll ask questions like this. Well, does this make sense, for Moses to have done or somebody else? It's just that kind of thing. Again, I'm not going to drill down into the nuts and bolts of all these things because it gets almost as bad as chronology. It gets really granular. It gets you into theories about sources and all this kind of stuff, and that just doesn't translate well to audio. And honestly, it gets mind-numbing after a while. But I mention things like this, again, just to reinforce the reality to you that a lot of what scholars say, even critical scholars, again, who don't have any theological investment in the Bible, like they don't believe in concepts like inspiration or inerrancy, but a lot of the stuff they talk about and the questions they raise derive from the text. They're not just sitting in their rooms, in their little faculty offices or something. What can I do today to hate on evangelicals? No, they don't have to invent things. Okay, these are things that you just bump into in the text, and they create questions. And then scholars have to try to figure these things out. And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just come up with a working theory, and that's as far as you can go. That's what scholars do. So it's not all like just made up stuff. There's real stuff like this. Now, Jochebed is interesting. Moses' mother's name. She is the anonymous Levite woman of Exodus 2:1. Way back in the Moses story. A man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman, and they have this baby called Moses, okay, who gets named Moses. This is the anonymous woman. She's the first biblical person to bear a name composed of Yo, which is the shortened form, one of the shortened forms of the divine name, YHWH. Her name means, or seems to mean, Yahweh is glory. Okay, Yo is the divine element, and then Kavod is a noun. It can be a noun that means glory. Now, here's another author question. The writer or editor creates the impression that the divine name, short form Yo here, YW, and without getting into historical Semitic linguistics as to why that was pronounced Yo, just again, I'll say take my word for it, or I can give you references for it. The writer-editor creates the impression that the divine name, the short form Yo, was known in Egypt before Moses' flight to Midian. Remember the Kenite issue? Did they know? Did Moses know the name of Yahweh? Did the Israelites, had they ever heard of Yahweh? And we said, yeah. It's entirely possible that they would have heard this name. Moses, it's a little more sketchy because he leaves the house when he's weaned, 2-3 years old. He gets raised, the son of Pharaoh's daughter and all that. But the notion that Israelites had never, here we are back to Exodus 6:3, revealing himself to the patriarchs. Again, that verse does not have to be translated the way it usually is. But here we get, some either effort on the part of the writer or the editor to at least create the impression that Yahweh was known. So you can't just whip out all these Kenite verses, these verses that talk about the Kenites, and marry them to the archaeological stuff and just say, talk about how late a development this was or how foreign a development this was. Again, that's a little sketchy because you really have to know when was this composed in the first draft and when was it edited, because the end product is certainly making a connection, certainly operating on that assumption. It's interesting in verse 20, Aaron and Moses. Let me read you the verse again. Amram took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. The Septuagint, Syriac versions, the Peshitta, and the Samaritan Pentateuch all add, quote, and their sister Miriam, unquote, so that it matches Numbers 26:59, which reads, the name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt, and she bore to Amram Aaron and Moses and Miriam, their sister. So it's just kind of interesting. Was Miriam deliberately not mentioned here, or did it get lost in transmission, or whatever? Is the Septuagint and the Peshitta and the Samaritan Pentateuch, are they adding it in just for consistency? Again, who knows? And these are the kinds of things you run into. Verse 24 mentions the Korahites, the sons of Korah. And again, this is from Sarna as well. The Korahites, observes Ibn Ezra, who's a rabbinic commentator, are mentioned on account of the statement in Numbers 26:11 that, quote, the sons of Korah did not die, unquote, in their father's rebellion against Moses and Aaron, back in Numbers 26. The Korahite clan later became a guild of temple singers, to whom several psalms are attributed. They are also listed as having been guards of the threshold of the tabernacle, and as performing other tasks such as baking and gatekeeping. A bowl inscribed with the sons of Korah has been uncovered in an Israelite shrine at Arad, deriving from the 8th century BC. That's the 700s BC. So again, it's just an interesting note that the sons of Korah are mentioned here. And again, the idea is, you can say, let me just read you what Sarna says again. He says, they're mentioned on account of the statement in Numbers 26:11. Now that assumes that the Exodus material is later than Numbers 26:11 in source critical terms. It could also, you don't have to make that assumption. You could just say an editor did that after the fact, again, to align the verses. Include information. But when I say align, I'm not talking about cheating, like fixing errors in the text. What I'm talking about, even though a good editor, a good scribe, if he saw a problem, could in theory do that. But a good editor is going to be looking at the mass of the Torah, and for the sake of readers, that's the key thought, for the sake of readers, this is the guy or the guys who are responsible for producing the final form of the Torah. And we've talked about how editors will update place names and personal names and things like that. A good editor, for the sake of the reader, will do things like this. They'll connect dots for the readers editorially and add words or move things around or something like that for the sake of the story. So again, none of this argues really for the JEDP idea as it's presented, but this is the kind of thing that for certain you've got editorial activity going on in the Torah. How that translates to who wrote what, when, and how much, I don't know. And frankly, neither does anybody else. Go down to verse 25. Our last note for the episode here, we should mention Phineas. Okay, that's the way most of us would pronounce this. Phineas, or Pinchas in Hebrew. This name is also Egyptian, and it means the Nubian, the dark-skinned one. It was fairly common in Egypt in the 13th century BCE. So let me just read where he shows up here. I'll read you the whole verse. Let's go back to verse 24. The sons of Korah, Asir, Elkanah, Aviasaph, these are the clans of the Korahites. Eleazar, Aaron's son, took as his wife one of the daughters of Putiel, and she bore him Pinchas, Phineas. These are the heads of the father's houses, the Levites, by their clans. So this is an Egyptian name. This could be, again, it's interesting. This guy winds up as one of the heads of the father's houses of the Levites. So this is a Levite, but it could be argued that he's a black guy. Is he a native Egyptian? Like, you say, well, how does that happen? Well, it happens with genetics. I mean, they could be intermarrying. This is pre-Mosaic legislation, all that kind of stuff. I mean, you're going to have people, and when we get to the Exodus, we'll run across these phrases about how a mixed multitude came out of Egypt in the Exodus. You have people from other nations joining by marriage or in theory some other means. Just the males are going to have to be circumcised and all that. But you have people entering into Israel, entering into the people of God from the outside. Now, I don't know if this is the case. You could have just a reference to dark skin without having the Negroid versus the Caucasian issue, the Jew versus the Gentile issue. Who knows? It could be just a name, just a characteristic or something like that. But it could be the result of a mixed marriage. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. This is the tribe of Levi. Aren't they supposed to be like super, super duper clean and pure? Well, that becomes an issue after Levitical legislation. You don't have the Levitical Torah laws about marriage and intermarriage and all that stuff before there's a Torah. I'm mentioning this again to say you have a mixed multitude coming out of Egypt. So this is a bit of a swipe, on my part at people I think who are unreasonably obsessed, tracing their lineages back to the Levites and DNA and what am I a secret Jew or this kind of Jew or that kind of Jew? Do I have Jewish blood? You have to realize before there was Levitical legislation, God didn't care. He didn't care. What he cares about is that if you want to join the people of God, then you worship Yahweh and no other. You enter into the nation, you take the sign of the covenant, which for men is circumcision. Women are to marry only circumcised males because that's the way you tell if they belong, if this marriage is legit. I mean, we talked about this in Exodus 4 with the bridegroom of blood, sort of thing. I mean, they had at least that much of a sense of community wholeness and needing, again, to be loyal to the covenantal terms that God made with their forefather, Abraham. But you don't have a lot of this legislation and concern stuff. Now, once you bring Aaron, this is the chapter, with the big genealogy, we just read some of its features. Once you have Aaron brought into the picture, and that becomes the family and the line of the priesthood, and priestly duties. They're not all priests. Some of the Levites do other things, associated with the religious objects and whatnot. But once you have that tribe demarcated in this way, then this stuff becomes more sort of tighter. There are more rules to follow. It's a bigger deal. But there's indication again in the Torah that prior to that time, that's just not an issue. The issue is, do you worship Yahweh, the God of our fathers, or not? You're going to enter in the people of God or not? This is your identity now. So they're going to, the mixed multitude is not only going to be, quote unquote, pure Jews plus other, riffraff. You're going to have that. There's going to be people who glom onto it. We know that from the Exodus narrative as well. But, the whole mixed multitude thing could have something like this going on. Now, we don't know why Pinchas was given this name. Is it, I hate to even use the word race because race is an artificial construct. Everybody's a human. But could this be a quote unquote, racial, issue, the result of a mixed marriage? It could, but it's fine. It's legit that this guy's a Levite and the other Levites aren't dark skinned. But this one, it's not an issue because we don't have the same sort of parameters, the same sort of concerns and whatnot. And again, even afterward, if you really want to be honest with it, that's kind of a misnomer anyway in the modern world because nobody can really trace their lineage, back to the tribes. Now, the priests have tried this, the Kohen lineage. I mean, I get that. They've taken a whack at this, and there's a better case there, but that's one tribe. That's just one tribe. And if you've read the DNA stuff on, related to Judaism and the Levites and all this kind of stuff, it's far from a perfect picture. Let's just put it that way. It's a good shot, good look, but it's far from a perfect picture. So I mention this again, that I just don't think that in real life, especially since we're not a theocracy and we are not under theocratic law and laws that concern themselves with tribes and lineages and so on and so forth. And we are never encouraged to try to find, our tribal lineages and whatnot, and as if we could do that, or to get some sort of honorary membership in one of the Israelite tribes. Okay, if that makes you feel good, fine, but realize that's all it does. It has nothing to do with standing before God. Zero. And again, this is just something I've run into in Middle Earth, so I thought I would mention it. And Pinchas, again, makes for an interesting discussion point in that sort of larger, area. But it's just not something that ought to be in the forefront of anybody's mind when it comes to, walking with the Lord. What's my lineage? Am I really a Jew or something like that? It just doesn't matter. It didn't matter before the law, and it doesn't matter after the law. And after the theocratic system has been done away with, it was initiated with the plan for it to be obsolescent at some point. The point being, when the nations are brought back into the family under the Messiah, okay, this is planned obsolescence, this whole system. So I think we again need to just think better about that and not let it be a distraction. All right, Exodus 7, again, first 13 verses. What we're really going to camp on today is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which in this chapter, it's not the first time we run into that phrase, that language. It has occurred up to this point, but this is sort of where it kicks in. So I'm going to read the first 13 verses, and there's going to be one thing I want to comment on before we get to the hardening, but that's basically where we're going to be camping out today. So this is Moses and Aaron meeting with Pharaoh. So they're before Pharaoh. First verse says, "And the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent." So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So that's the first 13 verses. We've commented on a few things in there already about this confrontation. The one new thing before we get to the hardening topic is in verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet." Now, some people, I think, I'll use the word foolishly, presume this wording means that Elohim are men. In other words, they'll use this verse as a justification for the notion that, well, see, Elohim can be people, and then we take that back to Psalm 82, blah, 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 blah. Of course, we never turn to Psalm 89 where the divine council was in the skies. You don't have a bunch of men ruling the nations in the skies. Again, we forget about Psalm 89 and other passages, but again, we know the drill here on the podcast. Again, if divine council stuff is new to you, watch the videos on the podcast website where it says if you're new, start here. Go to my website, thedivinecouncil.com, and you can get up to speed there. This verse doesn't support that notion at all. That's not the point at all. Moses is not really an Elohim. The point is one of analogy. Okay, God here is making an analogy for and about Moses in relation to Pharaoh. So, let's go back to Exodus 4. To sort of get the point of the analogy. In Exodus 4, 14 through 16, we read this. "Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses." Moses says he doesn't want to go, to Egypt. And he said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth, or with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him." So that's the other part of this analogy. Think of it this way. There's God, and when God calls a prophet, when God picks a spokesperson, God speaks to that person, and then that person speaks to other people. So God has called Moses. Moses is the mouthpiece of God to other people. He is to speak God's words. But what we have going on here is that Moses, again, is speaking to who? Well, it depends on the passage. When Exodus 7:1 says, God says to Moses, see, I've made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. It's as though Moses is sort of in the God slot. And then Moses gives his word to Aaron, and Aaron speaks to Pharaoh. So in Pharaoh's perception, Moses is sort of playing the role that the deity would normally play. That the deity would normally tell what the spokesman to say, and then he would say it to somebody else. Well, here what you have going on is Moses is telling Aaron what to say, and of course Moses is getting it from God. But now we've got this one step removed because Moses doesn't want to talk to people, or he can't talk, or he stutters, or whatever it is. So Aaron's brought into the picture, and the whole point is one of analogy. It's not that God says, "Hey Moses, you're an Elohim now." No, he says you're going to play this role. You're going to be like, in Pharaoh's eyes, you're going to be like a deity because you're the one dispensing the revelation, as it were, to your brother Aaron. Aaron will be your prophet, and then Aaron will do things, and say things to Pharaoh. So that's all that's going on here. It's just a point of analogy. And it was something that God telegraphed back in Exodus 4 when Moses just didn't want to go to Egypt. So God has to bring Aaron into the picture, again, as this intermediary figure, this spokesperson sort of figure. That's all that's going on here. So we don't need to complicate it and say silly stuff. It is really what I'm trying to say here. Now let's go down to verse 3. And verse 3, again, is where we get this line about God saying, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. That's verses 3 and 4. Now, we've already hinted at this because the phrase about hardening shows up in other places, and I had said we'll get to it. And this is the point that we want to camp on the whole issue. And I'm going to be referencing an article here. I will put it in the protected folder in case some of you want to read the whole thing. Although I think with this one you can find it just freely accessible online on the internet anyway. But I'll stick it in the protected folder for newsletter subscribers. So the article is by Robert Chisholm. That's Chisholm, and it's entitled "Divine Hardening in the Old Testament." And it's Dallas Seminary's journal, Bibliotheca Sacra, 153, that's 1996, pages 410 through 434. And the whole article is not just on the Exodus passage. It's on some other Old Testament instances where we get the same language, but we're basically going to just focus on Pharaoh here because we're doing this through Exodus. So Chisholm writes at the beginning of his article, he sort of sets the whole subject up this way. So Chisholm writes in his introduction, the Old Testament sometimes pictures God as hardening the human heart or spirit. The plague narratives recorded in the book of Exodus attribute Pharaoh's obstinance, at least in part, to divine hardening. Deuteronomy 2:30 and Joshua 11:20 speak of divine hardening in the context of Israel's conquest of the Promised Land. And Isaiah 6:9 through 10 and 63:17 seem to indicate that God hardened his own covenant people. Just to stop here for a second, you can see there Chisholm loops in some other examples of hardening. But for our use of his article, we're going to focus obviously on the Exodus material. But we may return to Isaiah 6:9 and 10 before we're all done, though, because I think that there's something in that passage worth mentioning again if I remember it. Back to Chisholm. These passages disturb many people, for they raise questions about God's fairness and goodness. Why would God cause someone to resist his will and then hold that person accountable for the sin he prompted? In an effort to preserve human moral responsibility and to avoid the conclusion that God would override the human will or manipulate free moral agents like puppets, some argue that the objects of divine hardening first hardened themselves. Others say the biblical statements, because they reflect ancient Hebrew idiom, cannot be taken at face value. According to this latter explanation, the biblical text replaces the immediate agent, the individual, with the ultimate agent, God. God simply allowed individuals to resist his will, but the Old Testament idiom bypasses the human subject and describes what God allowed as if he actually initiated and directly caused the action. A close reading of the text, a reading that includes being sensitive to literary features and genre considerations, allows one, however, to give the biblical references to divine hardening their full force, while preserving human moral responsibility. Divine hardening took either a direct form in which God supernaturally overrode the human will, and I'll just break in here again. To me, overrode is a bit too strong, but again, we'll just go with what Chisholm says for this point. So divine hardening took either a direct form in which God supernaturally overrode the human will, or an indirect form in which he used intermediate causes to harden the object. Whether accomplished directly or indirectly, this hardening was an element of divine judgment whereby God exhibited his justice and sovereignty. The objects of such judgment were never morally righteous or neutral, but were rebels against God's authority. Divine hardening was never arbitrarily implemented, but was in response to rejection of God's authoritative word or standards. So that's the end of Chisholm's introduction. And again, for our purposes, we're going to be sticking with what he, where he focuses on Exodus, which is most of the article. Again, if you want the article, you could either find it online, or again, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll find it in the protected folder. So the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, sort of runs the gamut. It actually runs the spectrum of causalities, direct and indirect, to use Chisholm's terminology. And he, in his article, breaks down the data of the book of Exodus into three categories. So I'll give you these three categories. His category A is a group of texts in which Yahweh is the subject of the verb, or some verb of hardening. Okay, and there's 10 of these. So this is 10 times you have texts in which Yahweh is the subject of some verb of hardening. So in other words, God is the agent. He is the one performing the action. So there's 10 of those. And then his category B are texts in which Pharaoh is the, or at least a subject of a verb of hardening. So that's 3 times. So there's 3 instances where Pharaoh is the one doing the hardening. At least one of the subjects. There's one in Exodus 9:34 that says he and his officials hardened their hearts. So that's why we're wording it the way we are. So there's 3 of those, 3 instances. And then lastly, Chisholm has a category C in which no source or agent is specifically mentioned, and there's 6 of these. So this would be verses like Pharaoh's heart was hard, Well, that doesn't really tell you who's doing the hardening. Is it Pharaoh or is it God or something? It just doesn't say. So there's 6 of those that are just sort of neutral. Now, Chisholm notes that Driver, in his sort of old classic commentary on the book of Exodus, suggested that in Hebrew idiom, God hardened Pharaoh. So Driver's one of these writers that sort of angles for some idiomatic language here. And what he writes here, quoting Driver, I'm actually going to quote Driver here. Driver believes that God hardened Pharaoh insofar as he, Pharaoh, hardened himself. But even supposing that the passages mean more than this, we must remember that, especially in his dealings with moral agents, God cannot be properly thought of as acting arbitrarily. He only hardens those who begin by hardening themselves. Pharaoh was a self-willed, obstinate man who persistently hardens himself against God and resists all warnings. God thus hardens him only because he first hardened himself. Now, that's the end of the Driver quote. There's a couple important things in there. There's this notion that God doesn't act arbitrarily, which of course Chisholm said as well. And then, that this, again, with Driver's following the trajectory where God hardens people who had already begun to harden themselves. Now, I think this is really important and really worth consideration, but you will not find this point if you only look at verbs of hardening in the book of Exodus. That's an important distinction. I think Chisholm, I'll be honest with you, there are places in his article where he seems to latch on to that, and there are other places where he seems, I think, a bit too fixated on the hardening vocabulary. And maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say that he misses it. He doesn't miss it, but I think the way he sort of crafts his article doesn't allow people to see this as clearly as I think they ought to. So this trajectory is one we're going to follow here ultimately about Pharaoh being, like Driver says, a self-willed, obstinate man who persistently hardens himself against God. Chisholm has a footnote at this Driver quote where he says this: Driver correctly affirms that God would not arbitrarily cause someone to disobey him. And he rightly observes that Pharaoh was obstinate from the outset. It is also true that Pharaoh's obstinance prompted divine hardening. However, Chisholm writes, Driver downplays Yahweh's sovereign involvement in the drama and fails to note that hardening terminology is used primarily of Yahweh's acts, not Pharaoh's, and that the divine hardening both precedes and follows that of Pharaoh. So let me try to look at this in a bit of a different way. Again, we've seen what Driver says, and I think Driver is onto something. Chisholm, again, responded to that. I think he's trying to be fair, but again, I think that Chisholm is a little too fixated on the hardening vocabulary. So let's try to sort of capture a little bit about the chronology of the hardening, because this is going to be sort of where Chisholm tracks on, how he essentially thinks that Driver is downplaying things, downplaying God's role. So if you actually look at Chisholm's list, and again, you can look at the article. He has, again, these 3 categories we just talked about, and you could use those 3 categories to sort of reconstruct a chronology. As far as a chronology goes, you have the first occurrence of a verb of hardening in the book of Exodus, back in Exodus 4:21. So let me read that to you. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. So this is part of the burning bush episode. God tells Moses what's going to happen. God, of course, can see into the future. When Moses and Aaron are going to go, talk to Pharaoh, God is, just telling them, here's the outcome. Okay, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, we get, in the chapter we're in today, Exodus 7, verse 3, we get hardening language. We get hardening language in verse 13 and verse 14, verse 22, because this, it starts to kick up here. But Moses and Aaron have actually talked to Pharaoh already, and their conversation with Pharaoh was subsequent to, obviously, the conversation Moses has with God in Exodus 4:21. And I want to try to help you understand sort of how I come down closer to Driver than I do to Chisholm, even though they're very close, actually. But I think that kind of the way that Chisholm wants to emphasize God's role, and then he looks at Driver as de-emphasizing God's role, to me, there's a fundamental question here. When God tells Moses in the burning bush episode, he says, now, look, I'm going to send you to Egypt. You're going to have a conversation with Pharaoh, and I will harden his heart. Does that mean that in that scene, when Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh, that when Pharaoh rejects their request, it's at that moment that Pharaoh's heart becomes hard? And it's sort of a fulfillment of what God said to Moses at the burning bush episode. Is that how we're supposed to read it? Now, if you read it that way, then it's like, there's Pharaoh just, kind of doing what Pharaohs do, and Moses and Aaron shows up. He says, hey, what do you guys want? And they say, well, we've met with Yahweh, and Yahweh wants you to let the Israelites go. And then boom, God steps in, touches Pharaoh's heart, and makes it a heart of stone. And Pharaoh says, forget it. Okay, I think that's really dubious. I think that Pharaoh is that guy from not from the beginning of this, but for a long, long, long time preceding. I think Pharaoh already has a hardened heart, is already predisposed to listen to God. I think he was predisposed against listening to God before God ever even had a conversation with Moses at Sinai. I do not think we can take Exodus 4:21 as sort of a prophecy and then view its fulfillment in their first conversation, which is actually Exodus 5. Let me just read it to you here, Exodus 5:2. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord? Who's Yahweh, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh. Moreover, I will not let Israel go. I don't think that verse, Exodus 5:2, is a fulfillment or the outworking of Exodus 4:21. I think the Pharaoh we see in chapter 5 was that guy years before. So I think Pharaoh, why do I even mention this? I think to me it's plain that Pharaoh's heart is what it is long before God ever says to Moses, you're going to go to Egypt and I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So regardless of the chronology of the verbs, okay, the verbs of hardening. Okay, this is where Chisholm is at. He's doing this chronology thing. I think that sort of skips or doesn't pay enough attention to the kind of person that Pharaoh already was. As Pharaoh, he thinks he is the Horus incarnate. Of course, he's not going to listen to Yahweh. He's been taught this since he was a kid. Okay, when you get on the throne, you're a deity. You're it. You're the one that regulates the Nile. You're the one that does this and that and the other thing. He doesn't have to wait for this conversation for God to sort of zap him with hardness. So I actually think that the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, that's where it begins. It begins with Pharaoh. I think Driver's correct here. Even though if you want to do a strict chronology of the verbs of hardening in Exodus, the first one comes from God's mouth in Exodus 4:21. Okay, but Pharaoh is already in that condition. Again, I think that is a much more coherent way to look at things as opposed to up until the time Moses and Aaron got into the throne room and asked Pharaoh to let Israel go. At that moment, God, fulfilled his words of Exodus 4:21, and so it starts with God. I think that is a very poor reading of what's going on here. And I'm not saying Chisholm does that. I'm saying that the way Chisholm sort of articulates what he's doing with the verbs, again, and then the verbal chronology and the categories, I think that Pharaoh's condition, who he was, it's harder to see it because Chisholm doesn't really ask you to think those thoughts. He doesn't really sort of bring it to the fore as forcefully as he could. Again, that's just my opinion, even though I think the article is really quite good. I just think that we need to be reminded of who this guy was and not just get fixated on verbs and where they fall, if I could say it that way. So Chisholm actually says elsewhere, in the article, where I do think he is mentally tracking on this. But again, I don't think the article just brings it, to the fore, to the forefront like it really ought to. But elsewhere in his article, he makes comments that indicate that what was in play was a lot wider, than again the chronology of the verbs. There's just other things going on. So I don't think he's lost this. I just wish the article would bring it out a little bit more. So he writes this in regard to in his section about literary analysis. He says the narrative does not resolve the tension at this point. Again, when we're having the conversations between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh. But one suspects that the Lord's agenda included more than just saving his people from slavery. So what Chisholm is going to do here is he's going to go into a literary analysis that I recommend you get the article and look at this because it really is worth looking at, where he shows how these narratives, the sections of the book of Exodus with leading up to the plagues and then with the plagues, how there's just a little bit more going on than Yahweh versus Pharaoh in this whole matter of hardening. There's a little bit more going on than just saving Israel from Egypt, just getting them out of there. It's just bigger than that. So back to Chisholm, he says, it's revealed later that when God wanted to display his power to the watching world so that all observers, including the Israelites and the Egyptians, might recognize that he is indeed Yahweh. It's Exodus 6:7, 7:5, 9:16, 10 verses 1 and 2, chapter 11 verse 9, 14:4. You get this notion that God is doing what he's doing, not just to extract Israel, not just to win a debate or battle with Pharaoh. He's doing what he's doing, and part of that is the hardening, stringing out Pharaoh's obstinacy. God is doing that not because he wants to play Pharaoh puppet, okay? God is doing that so that the episode cumulatively becomes more dramatic, so that the news, all of the events therein spread far and wide. And so his reputation, God's own reputation, will expand well beyond Egypt and well beyond the Hebrews. He's doing this for the whole world to see, in effect. That's why the Exodus narrative, as it's laid out, this becomes apparent, as Chisholm's article shows you, that Pharaoh's getting hardened and strung along just to make it bigger, just to make it more spectacular, just to, again, so that God can not only prove his case that he's bigger and badder than Pharaoh, but to do it on such a scale that people for miles and miles hear about it. It's to overly dramatize the whole thing. And we know that this actually happened because when Joshua gets into Jericho, Rahab tells him, we heard what went on in Egypt. I mean, good grief, we know that we're not going to be able to stand up to you and so on and so forth. So what happens in Egypt does get spread abroad. Again, that wouldn't have happened if Pharaoh would have yielded at the first plague. When he sees the Nile turn to blood, he's like, oh, okay, we're done here. You can go. No, it has to get to the level of the death of the firstborn and the parting of the Red Sea and all that stuff, so that people outside of Egypt hear what happened. And again, God is magnified through this. So again, if you want to look at Chisholm's article, if you're interested in how the narrative itself sort of builds this idea, sort of reaches this crescendo. And I read you the string of verses there that Chisholm has in that little paragraph about God wanting to display his power. That line, or some line thereof, about God wanting to be magnified, and so he strings Pharaoh out again. God basically says, well, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart again so that we do something else here. That whole stringing along process gets sort of, those statements get seeded throughout the narrative, and it actually builds to a climax. It's very intelligently done, sort of to capture this building drama, and it's all for the sake of God's wanting to be known as Yahweh, the God of all the earth, outside Egypt. So a quick capitulation does not accomplish that. A lengthy, drawn-out drama with a final cataclysmic capitulation and then a final deliverance at the Red Sea, that'll do the trick. News of that will travel. And so that's, again, part of this whole picture. So it's a lot wider than just trying to get Israel out of Egypt and get the people relief and then show Pharaoh and put him in his place and all that sort of stuff. It's a little bit bigger stage than that. Now, having said all that, I would say as we think about this, I've already telegraphed where I'm at on this. I think Pharaoh was just as Driver described. He's that guy. He is the rebellious, he is the hard-hearted, he is the disobedient, he is the obstinate person. He is long before God ever has a conversation with Moses at the burning bush. The hardness is already resident in Pharaoh before God ever says to Moses, I'm going to send you to Egypt, and this is what's going to happen. You're going to do miracles there. I'm going to wield my power through you, but I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And again, he doesn't just spill the beans as to why he's doing this to Moses. Again, this whole notion of stringing Pharaoh out so that his reputation can expand beyond the borders of Egypt. He doesn't, tell Moses that in one fell swoop. But the point is that God doesn't pick an innocent guy. He doesn't pick a neutral guy. He doesn't pick a guy that, I'll listen to reason. Give me a few days and I'll think about letting Israel. But no, God does not pick someone that would have made a different decision. God already knows what Pharaoh's decision is going to be because he already knows who Pharaoh is long before he ever converses with Moses at the burning bush. So I think it's really wrong-headed and frankly incoherent to say that God just sort of changed this person's heart to make it hard. He didn't. His heart was already there. And God is doing what he's doing to magnify himself beyond the borders of Egypt. So I would say we have the real questions that we need to sort of be thinking about when we read, through the hardening passages all the way back to Exodus 5. We're here in Exodus 7, and as we proceed forward. I think the real things to think about are these. So I'll just number them. Number one, is Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5:2 the outworking of God's statement in Exodus 4:21? And I've already said I don't think it is. But again, just to talk about this a little bit more. Is the response in 5, I don't know who Yahweh is. Who's that? Okay. Is Pharaoh's response the outworking of God's statement in Exodus 4:21? Is it God hardening Pharaoh in Exodus 5:21, like right on the spot? Or is that defiance something that has already taken root in Pharaoh's heart? Again, to me, this is obvious. To me, Pharaoh's already that guy. Now, here's what Chisholm says. Again, just to give Chisholm some credit here. When Moses confronted the Egyptian ruler and demanded that he allow Israel to celebrate a festival to Yahweh, Pharaoh answered, "Who is Yahweh, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go." Does this response mean the divine hardening had already begun? Now, see, it's a little hard to know what Chisholm means by that, already begun. Now, does he mean to ask, does this response mean that the divine hardening was beginning now? Is that what he means? Or when he says already begun, does it mean like Pharaoh's already that guy? It's actually not clear to me in Chisholm's article which one of those he means. I'm just going to read it for you and let you sort of chew on it. Again, if you want to get the article, you can. So he says, does this response mean the divine hardening had already begun? Whatever that means. Probably not, Chisholm says. 6 times after this, 9:12, Exodus 10:1, 10:20, 10:27, 11, 10, 14:8, the narrative notes that Yahweh had hardened Pharaoh's heart. In 9:12, allusion is made to Exodus 4:21. 4 other times, Exodus 7:13 and 22, 8:19 and 9:35. The observation is made that Pharaoh's heart was hard, and this condition is attributed to Yahweh by alluding back to 4:21 and 7:3, and also 8:15. However, 5:2 makes no mention of God's involvement, and that's true. So it is better, Chisholm says, to view Pharaoh's action as autonomous. Again, I still don't like the wording of that. Again, what does that mean, autonomous? Okay, it means that God isn't causing it there. I get that. But I'd still like it to be clear that Pharaoh's deciding what he decides because he's just that guy. And he's been that way. His heart has been hardened, or his own opinion of himself has been so bloated for years. Again, I just wish it was stated a little bit differently. Chisholm says, furthermore, Exodus 4:21 clearly relates divine hardening to the signs Moses would perform before Pharaoh. That's true. It relates them, whatever that means. Again, all that's happening here is it sets the scene. It doesn't track on the reality that Pharaoh has been who Pharaoh is for a very long time. And that's, I hope you're just getting, I keep repeating it, but I want to repeat it for emphasis. I just don't think we can lose sight of that Pharaoh wasn't neutral. Okay. His heart is hard before Moses and Aaron ever show up, before God has ever had a conversation with Moses. This is who he is. Now, again, I think Chisholm is sort of tracking on this, but again, I wish the wording was a bit, different, but there you go. I mean, you can get the article and read through it yourself. It's just, if I were the journal editor, I would have said, well, can you throw something in here, change the wording here, if this is what you mean as opposed to that. I just wish it was a little bit different, so it was a little bit clearer, at least to me anyway. Number 2, again, things that we need to think about, is the allegedly deterministic language. This is the language where Yahweh is the one doing the hardening, okay? Is the allegedly deterministic language direct or indirect? That is Yahweh creating an emotional, psychological, and spiritual condition in Pharaoh, or is he steering the circumstances for Pharaoh, knowing that defiance has already taken root in Pharaoh's heart? So you can have Yahweh be the agent of the verb. Either way, it just depends, what do you mean? And I think people, when they see God as the subject of hardening verbs, they assume the former, that God is creating an emotional, psychological, spiritual condition in Pharaoh or in a person. When we don't have to read it that way at all. God is the agent, sure, but maybe what's meant is that God is steering the circumstances so that this individual that God knows really well is going to choose to do X and not Y, because God knows what the response is going to be in this set of circumstances that God is creating. Those are two different things. The former is quite deterministic. The latter is not. The latter is God acting on his wisdom to put a free will agent in a situation where God knows what the outcome here is going to be, because he knows that person. He already knows the condition of their heart. He isn't giving them the condition of the heart, the hardening. He already knows who they are. Those are quite different things. And again, I just think we need to stop a moment and think about how God can be the agent of the hardening, but it can actually go in two different directions. It doesn't have to go in one direction. Now, this is beyond the scope of Chisholm's article, to be honest. I just think this is something we, as students, need to think about. After all, the first two chapters of Exodus make it clear that the Egyptians are hostile toward the Israelites. But there's a wild card here. I don't want to miss this verse. In Psalm 105:25, let me just read you that. It says that God, he turned their hearts, the Egyptians, to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. It was God who instigated the hostility of the Egyptians against the Israelites, his own people. You say, well, isn't that deterministic? Well, you could read it that way. You could also read it this way. Just for example, God sees what's going on in Egypt. He sees his people multiply. He knows that the Egyptians feel very threatened by this. Okay, but God continues to bless his people, knowing that as they grow, as they multiply, as they become a people in Egypt, that is going to instigate the Egyptians to be hostile toward them. But nevertheless, God is doing that. Why? Because God is creating a set of circumstances where the behavior of the Pharaoh, the guy sitting on the throne in Egypt, is going to be quite predictable. It's not that the guy sitting on the throne is like, man, I love these Israelites, and boy, I love their babies. They're just wonderful people. And all of a sudden, he just turns on a dime, like God again has to touch him and turn his like of the Israelites into fear. It doesn't just happen on a dime. It doesn't just turn that way. But this is the impression I think that deterministic thinking often sort of puts in our heads when we read certain passages. We sort of assume that circumstances just change, click, like that. And when they change like that, it was because God pushed a button in heaven that says, okay, now I want all the Egyptians to hate the Israelites. There's the button, right there. I can get them all with one button. Like it's not a natural thing that develops over time, just as a result of very human propensities. I mean, this behavior is very human. We don't need God to push a button, okay, and make human behavior sort of turn contrary or turn in a totally different direction than what it would naturally go to anyway, given the set of circumstances. But God, nevertheless, again, is behind the scene. Again, he's the unseen hand in all this. This is providence. God is blessing his people in Egypt. They're multiplying. And God knows the Egyptians well enough. He knows human behavior well enough to know that this is going to be at some point perceived as a threat. God doesn't have to sit up in heaven and say, hey, hand me the perceived threat button. I'm going to push it now, and I'm going to change the hearts of all the Egyptians because they're really my puppets anyway. Again, this is how deterministic thinking really is cartoonish. I'm just going to be blunt here. I think when deterministic thinking takes over passages like this, we don't realize this is actually what we're doing. That everything would just go on fine until God asked some member of the heavenly host for the panic button. And now I'm going to change all the hearts of the Egyptians. Give me the button. Click. There we go. No. What you see happening in the book of Exodus is very human. Okay, you're the people in control. It's your country. Okay, you're an Egyptian. It's your country. And these people in the Delta are just starting to get really large numerically. And you start to wonder where their loyalty might be. Okay, because you have an empire. And when you have an empire, you know that people are out to undo it. People are going to act in self-interest. Well, I mean, we've got masses of people up here in the Delta. What happens if one day they just decide, we don't want to do these jobs anymore? Again, these are very human impulses in very human circumstances with very predictable human propensities and behaviors and thought patterns. You don't need to make God look like a puppet master to understand Exodus 1 and Exodus 2. But again, this is what we get. We get hardening language and we strip the humanity right out of it. These people are humans. We almost have to make them less than human and again have God pushing buttons to sort of parse the passages. What I'm suggesting to you is you don't need to do any of that. You don't need to turn God into a puppet master to understand what's going on in Exodus 1 and 2. And God is still in it. Psalm 105:25 says God is still in it. Okay, God knows that by continuing to multiply his people in Egypt, he knows at some point, because he knows humanity very well, at some point, they're going to turn. He doesn't need to turn them. They're just going to do it because it's a human thing to do. And at that point, God is going to see that and he's going to raise up someone called Moses and he's going to act because God has deemed it is now time. It wasn't before. It is now time to judge the gods of Egypt and to judge Pharaoh. He thinks he's one of these gods, okay? It's now time to judge. See, God gets to decide when he will intervene and judge evil. God gets to do that because he's God. And that brings us to the third thought, again, to think, is God allowed to directly harden someone for the purpose of judgment? I mean, let's say that I'm not suggesting that the hardening starts with God. I've already told you I don't think it does. I think Pharaoh's just that guy. But if God wants to string Pharaoh out, okay, is God allowed to do that? Again, it's kind of a dumb question. Of course, God's allowed to do that because he's God. But just think with me here. Is God allowed to harden someone for the purpose of judgment? Why would we conclude that the person being hardened and becoming sort of the focus of God's judgment activity, why would we conclude that the person, in that scenario wasn't already there, wasn't already hard? Why would we conclude that? Well, because again, we're taught to think deterministically in some context. That's why. Why not say that God knows this person, Pharaoh, and the person deserves the hardening? He deserves to get strung along. Perhaps he would relent after one plague or two plagues. Okay, God decides, no, I'm now going to step in and I'm going to harden him. He's already been hard. He's been this guy for decades. We all know who this dude is. But now I'm going to string him along because I not only want to judge evil, I have not only decided now is the time to judge this guy, and his wickedness, and the gods of Egypt along with him, because the plagues are going to be aimed at the gods. Okay, I'm not only going to do that, but I want to do it in such a way that people from miles around hear about it. We're not going to let this just settle in the borders of Egypt. We're going to take this fight and magnify it. And to do that, I'm going to harden this guy. I'm going to make him resist now. Is God allowed to do that? We can also even ask, can we presume, or might we presume, that God knows when a person has crossed a line? In other words, God knows Pharaoh. It would actually take a divine intervention. It would actually take God changing Pharaoh from a free will agent to like shutting off his freedom, turning him into a robot for a few seconds to get him to move the other way and repent. Again, God is not going to do that. We've already had a lot of these conversations like in Unseen Realm and some of these other things. God is not going to step in and trample on a person's free will, because if he did, that person would no longer be an imager of God. The image of God, being an imager of God, is a complete package. We do not get to say, well, yeah, imaging is a status, and to accomplish the status, God shares his attributes with us. And he shares all of his attributes with us except freedom. Because if we let people have human free will, then that ruins our theological system. So we're gonna like pull that one out. You can't do that, because you can't parcel out God's own attributes. God is the complete package. When he shares his attributes with his intelligent creatures, whether it's supernatural beings or us, and again, we have them to a lesser degree. We have life, we have ability, we have power, we have the ability to think, we have self-awareness, all these things. Okay, these are part and parcel attributes of God. When God shares his abilities with his intelligent beings who are like him, so that we can function as him, as it were, in his place. We can image him, we imitate him. That requires thinking. It requires free will decision making. It requires certain abilities, creative abilities, to do things. Okay, we can't just say we're pulling the free will out of that, because then God wouldn't. It's actually an indispensable attribute, because otherwise we would not truly be like God. God is not a robot. Neither are we. Neither are the members of God's spiritual world who are also like him. And I realize it's convenient to withdraw free will for the sake of a theological system. I'm not interested in theological systems. This is one of the reasons why. I think it's cheating. So, God is not going to go to Pharaoh and dispense with his free will or shut it off for a few seconds. Either way, to get him to do something. God is going to be setting circumstances, knowing if a person has crossed the line. I mean, there is a sin unto death, folks. Okay, the New Testament actually does talk about this. There is a point when God will act, and there's no longer the ability to turn around and go the other way. Okay, if God knows that in the New Testament, in 1 John, it has nothing to do with salvation. It just means that you can't turn from your course. This is a sin now. There's going to be, you're either going to do something self-destructive and you're going to die, or God's going to step in and judge you, or whatever. There is a point when God knows there is a point of no return for that person. God knows these things. Okay, so we have to give this latitude that God possesses. We have to let him have it. we have to let him be who he is. And what he's not going to do is turn people into puppets, now and then, just to cheat, just to game the system. What he is going to do is he's going to engineer and steer circumstances. And people are going to react the way people do predictably. And some people have just already sailed. I mean, that ship has already sailed for them. That is who they are now. And I think Pharaoh, again, with his hardness, his bloated sense of his own divinity, and his hardness against other gods, and basically anything that would lessen his own glory. This is who he is. This is who he is. So I don't think we can really coherently say God is doing something against Pharaoh's will. It's quite in concert with Pharaoh's will, what's going on here. And again, God is creating the set of circumstances with his own people, knowing that his own people are going to suffer, as things start to turn. But this is God's mechanism to, again, call Moses, to send Moses back to Egypt, and to judge the wickedness of the Egyptians. Could God step in and make sure that none of the righteous ever suffer? That's like asking, could God do something where no one ever suffers today, and there is no evil? Yeah, he could. He could just wipe everybody out, or turn them all into robots, and then turn off the electricity, and there we go. God doesn't do that. Again, he has made us who we are. We are like him, and God essentially plays within the sandbox that God has created for himself. Because to change the rules would be to sort of admit a boo-boo, or I must have lacked wisdom here. I would have made the sandbox differently. No, God is going to operate within the parameters that God himself has set up in creating us as we are, creating humanity as humanity is. And God is big enough, again, to get the job done. And we need to trust him in knowing that he's not just going to shut off people's free will. People will suffer. The innocent will suffer. The righteous will suffer. But again, if we're believers, this world is not our home. We have to trust the sovereignty of God, that God knows what he's doing. He is steering all things to the end to which he wants everything to go. And in the end, we, the redeemed, will be blessed. Maybe not in this life, but in the life to come. I mean, this is just all big theological stuff. And it's actually all consistent. It does work coherently together, even though it's not always comfortable. What we want is we want biblical theology to work out where we're always comfortable, where we never suffer, we never have pain and things like this. Okay, we live in a fallen world. That's not going to be the way it works. And the only way it can work a different way is for God to undo the image, make us into something we're not, to reverse what he's already done. And then God admits, I made a huge mistake. I mean, again, we have to be theologically consistent. We have to, again, trust God that things are going to operate the way he has intended them to operate. Ultimately, he's going to get the outcome he wants, but he has to play within the parameters that he himself has created. And I've lectured about this a lot of times, that God deemed this preferable than to creating robots, because robots can't, there is no free will there. That's not the only thing you lose. You lose love. Okay. It can't be genuine if you're a robot. You lose an awful lot the other way. But what comes with it is, again, the propensity for evil, because all of God's free will beings all of his imagers. We may be like him, but we are not him. We lack his perfect nature. We are lesser. And it's just not going to work out perfectly because we are not perfect. And again, God knows this, but he deems that preferable than to not having us at all. So again, this is big picture theological stuff. Again, I've lectured a lot, on this kind of thing out on YouTube, so I'm sort of sorry for the rabbit trail here, but I think it's essential that when we look at hardening, it's still the same picture. We do not have to look at the text and be driven to God being a puppet master now. It doesn't have to work that way. And in fact, I think in Pharaoh's particular instance, that's really incoherent because God isn't changing him. He is who he is. And God is steering circumstances to exploit Pharaoh's own hardness, his own condition. And yes, God does harden him to string him out for God's own purposes. And so one of the questions is God allowed to do that? He's God. He can judge evil in any way he wants to judge it. And this is how it worked out with Pharaoh. Another thought. Must we take a direct view of God's hardening as indicative of how God works in every instance, in every person who does not believe or who does not obey? Again, that is deterministic thinking, and it's silly. Think about it. Again, I don't want to, I do want to pick on systems, but I'm not going to call any particular systems out here. But there is a propensity to take what God does in one case, Pharaoh, and say, well, this is what God does everywhere. This is what God does in the heart of every person who doesn't believe. God makes them not believe. He makes them so they can't believe. In other words, we take this one instance, again, I think, ignoring the earlier context of who Pharaoh is, but for the sake of the discussion, we look at God doing something with one guy, and then we assume that it works this way. God does it this way with every last person who's ever lived. Why? Why do we make that jump? Okay, do you realize if you're in this group, if you have this theological bent, that yes, I'm going to use this verse and I'm going to extrapolate it to all humanity. Anybody who doesn't believe couldn't ever believe. Because God had already, decided that, and God turns every heart one way or the other way, and that person can't resist. They don't have real free. Okay, if that's what you're going to do, then realize what you've done. Good luck with people who are really thinking about this under your care or in your church, because then you can have someone say, "Well, I wouldn't have cheated on my wife if God had intervened in my heart and taken my lust away, but God didn't intervene in my heart and take my lust away, so I had to cheat on my wife, didn't I? Really?" See, then you're going to have people who want to say, "Yep, that's true," but we're still going to. Then they're going to make some stand on the head argument about you're still morally responsible. Look, if the person can't do anything else. I know you can construct an argument that somehow, in some convoluted way, makes the person morally responsible. But that is sophistry. That's what that is. It's sophistry. And that might sound harsh, but I really believe that's what that is. Because you don't want people to apply your own system in other ways. And so you have to find escape valves. You have to build escape valves into your system. And that's the problem. Okay, we need to get away from systems that need escape valves and so on and so forth. And try to look at how God can be the ultimate agent behind things without the deterministic thinking. This is just the way a lot of people within the evangelical world think. And they really don't want people to apply their own thinking, their own system in all sorts of ways. But they could. They could, and they would be consistent in their application. It's just a shame. Let me look at two other passages real quickly before we wrap up here. I think passages like Judges 14:4, and of course the old familiar one in 1 Kings 22 kind of help here. Let's take the 1 Kings 22 instance because that's the most familiar if you're divine counsel stuff. This is Micaiah's vision, with Ahab, where God has decided it's time for Ahab to die, and the prophet has this vision of what's going on in heaven. God is having a divine council meeting, and the spirits there, the heavenly host, who are called spirits in the passage, are debating. One says one thing, another says another. Because God has let them participate in the decision of how Ahab is going to die. We already know Ahab's going to get judged, but God says, okay, how do we want to do this? He lets them participate. So one spirit steps forward and says, I got it. I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. That'll get Ahab to go up to remote Gilead, and he'll bite the dust there, right? So God says, you're going to succeed. Go out and do that. So God allows, again, in this case, free will beings of his heavenly host to participate in a decision. God knows that the right set of circumstances are created, and Ahab will behave predictably. And God will use that set of circumstances and Ahab's predictable behavior to judge Ahab. Okay? Judges 14:4. This is Samson. It's a little less familiar. I'll just start the first verse. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Basically, that's who I want. She's pretty hot. Okay. And then verse 4, we have this. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he, the Lord, was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Now, it was from the Lord. If you're the deterministic, God made Samson choose a wife outside of the Israelites. So God made Samson sin, and he did that so that God could justify beating up on the Philistines. And Samson couldn't do any other choice because there's no such thing as real free will. So God made Samson sin, and we know that for sure because Samson could not sin. Okay, it was from the Lord. Why can't we say, God knows Samson really well? He knows how Samson's mind works, okay? Why can't we have God behind the circumstances of Samson's little trip to Timnah and behind the circumstances of Samson laying eyes on this babe, okay, knowing what Samson's going to do, and how that is going to, again, be another little wheel behind a whole set of other circumstances. And the wheels are going to start turning, and God is going to use Samson's own decision in a specific set of circumstances to judge not only the Philistines, but to judge Samson too, because Samson suffers, for his own decisions. He reaps what he sows, but ultimately to judge the Philistines and deliver his people from the Philistines. Why can't we have God, again, behind the scenes, steering circumstances in accord with the propensities of human behavior, which God knows really, really well? And again, God knows Samson is not innocent, okay, here. Samson has chosen a path. Samson has made a series of bad, flawed decisions. Samson's character has been formed by Samson, okay? And God knows all this very well. And God can still be in charge of what's going on without going down an absurd and, I think, frankly, self-contradictory, theologically contradictory, deterministic trajectory. See, again, this is part of the problem. If for those committed to a deterministic view, they seem to assume that God can't be in charge of things without one-to-one direct causation. And I would submit to you that God can be in charge. God will have his way. He doesn't need to shut off, flip switches. Today you have free will except for a few seconds because I need you to do that. God doesn't need to do that. He will get his way in the end, one way or the other. But again, we sort of assume certain things about how this would work. And I'm just trying to get you to think about, well, do we really need to go down this road when there's this other road over here that might work just fine? Okay. So by way of summary, this is sort of the way I just approach the whole subject. When God does things, he doesn't do things to make things, to shut people's free will off. In the case of the Israelites in Egypt, he doesn't do things just to make things worse for the righteous. I mean, there's a whole set of things going on. And God is putting things into motion. God creates circumstances. He puts circumstances in motion to vindicate or deliver the righteous through the judgment of his and their enemies. And since we live in a fallen world, the righteous will suffer along the way. That will happen because, again, we're living in a fallen world with the free will imaging box that we talked about earlier. Again, we could ask, why doesn't God just strike the wicked dead? Why doesn't he just clean house? Well, again, to get rid of all evil, we know what he'd have to do. The consistent pattern of Scripture isn't that sort of behavior. Rather, God works through boots on the ground circumstances. He works through people whom he knows will act and behave in certain ways on both sides. This is the interplay of a sovereign mind and free will beings. God steers people via events and relationships, circumstances, and those sorts of things. He does things that prompt the need for the person under judgment to make a decision, and then their decision is predictable. One could ask, why doesn't God try to influence people to make a right decision contrary to their ingrained free will propensity? Answer, because God has decided to judge them. God is allowed to judge evil. Okay, he's allowed to judge evil. If we don't honor if we don't let God be allowed to judge evil, if we don't honor that, if we don't just live with the fact that God has a right to judge evil, if we expect God to steer everyone toward righteousness and repentance instead of judging evil, then we're saying that we are more moral than God. We're saying God is morally wrong to judge sin. Well, if I was God, I'd give them a chance. How do we know how many chances God already has given a person? God is allowed to judge sin. He is not morally suspect if he decides to judge sin. We just don't know what God has been doing in a person's life, and that person has just shut off God, that they've chosen their own path. God knows the direction of a person's heart. And if he decides to judge them, he will steer the circumstances toward that end, knowing that a person will follow course. Sometimes, God does do something dramatic to invade a person's life. That does happen too. And that's up to God, to decide. Like Paul. He directly encounters Paul on the Damascus Road. But here's a question. On what basis is God obligated to do that for everybody? What's the basis for that? And if you say, well, he is required to do that for everybody, then you've just said God has no right and no authority to judge evil. That's what you've said. The result of all that is a theology that says God isn't allowed to judge wickedness. He is. God has chosen to create free will beings. Again, the whole imaging idea. He's not going to reverse that decision. It's his own decision. He did things that way, else he'd be, incapable of creating an intelligent creature, humanity, that's truly like him. God will therefore use human will to set people up for judgment. That's what we learn in Exodus here with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. He may intervene dramatically, which would be a special act of grace for his own reasons, but he's not obligated to do that for everybody because that would mean that God is, again, not allowed to judge evil. Could Paul have refused to obey the call? That's a debate. How about Moses, though? How can we say that Moses could not have disobeyed God's call? Moses tried to disobey God's call. And even after the burning bush, remember, Moses returns to Jethro's house and God meets him again. Remember that? Moses could have said no, but God, again, stays with him. Does God have to do that? No, God doesn't have to do anything, but he chooses to do that. He even, again, graciously gives Moses a backup visitation after Moses goes back and returns to Jethro's place. God isn't required to do that kind of stuff for everybody. And not everybody will need it. At any point, we all, let me think of it this way. We all deserve alienation from God because of our sin. None of us deserve salvation. God is never in our debt. He may choose to judge. He may not. He knows the circumstances. He knows what is the best thing to do for his own purposes. He is allowed, again, to make either decision. For us to judge God is frankly arrogant. It's hubris in every way. God seeks to persuade people to do this or that. He uses other people, again, As his agents of persuasion, he uses a bunch of other things to create circumstances, but God is allowed to intervene or not at his own discretion. And in Pharaoh's case, Pharaoh already was who he was. God steps in to string him out, again, for God's own purposes. Frankly, we should be grateful that God persisted with each of us in the ways that he did, because he didn't have to. Again, God could have just said, all right, it's time to judge. And a lot of us, God did judge us. He did judge sin, but he didn't do it in sort of a final way. There was no finality toward it. But with some people, that happens. Again, God knows the whole set of circumstances of everyone's life. And again, I think the big lesson here is not to presume, and I'm using that word very deliberately because I think it is quite presumptive. We ought not presume that we need or must go down the path of this total determinism to understand what's going on between God and Pharaoh in these passages. We don't. So again, just a caution there. And I hope you will take a look at Chisholm's article. I think it's really worth a look. And my only gripe with it is I think we need to just more intentionally think about where Pharaoh was already at. God is not flipping switches in the sky. He is already who he is. And so we do not need to have a switch flipping deity. We can have a deity, we can have a God who decides to judge and sets up circumstances whereby judgment will happen. And also, in Israel's case, deliverance. God is ultimately in control, but that does not have to mean direct deterministic thinking. Yeah, we're going to hit the first plague because that's in the rest of Exodus 7. But what I wanted to do today was sort of provide an introduction to the plagues, kind of like how do scholars think about these things, and then take some of that in terms of the approaches and then talk about the first plague.
Well, I'm hoping that you're going to give us a clue as to what the blood type was that God turned the water to. I'm curious if it's O negative, because we've covered O negative.
I was going to say, you want me to say it's O negative with RH?
Some ancient document somewhere, they knew about blood types, and it's O negative.
For those of you who aren't privy to the joke, go over to peeranormal.com and look for the episode on RH negative blood. Then you'll get it. You'll get the funny. You may even chuckle at that point. But no. Boy, you're in rare form today, Trey.
Hey, that's well, yeah.
All right. Well, like I said, we are going to have an introduction to the plagues here, and that's how I'll start. And then we'll get into the first plague and how, again, some of the perspectives on the plagues, how that sort of helps us think about the first one that's in Exodus 7. And we'll do the same thing as we go through the rest of the plagues too. But since we're at Exodus 7, 14 through 25, let me just read that, and then we'll jump into how scholars approach the whole subject of the plagues. So beginning in verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, their canals, and their ponds, and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. So the chapter ends with the plague on the Nile, and then we get a 7-day interval until we get to the next plague, and we'll hit that next time. But this is one of the plagues, and the majority are focused specifically on the Egyptians and not on the Hebrews. You'll notice as we read that there's no reference that the Hebrews had this problem as well. That's not going to be true with every plague, but again, for the majority it is. But rather than sort of focus on the minutiae, and we'll come back again to some of the details here in the first plague, I want to start here by talking about how scholars approach the whole topic. And I'm going to be referencing, for the most part, John Currid's book, and I alluded to this in our very first episode, and I think a couple of times in other episodes. But he has written a book called Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. It's Baker Books. It's not an expensive book. Currid is trained in Egyptology and in Old Testament. So this is a good source for thinking about things in Exodus and also about Egyptian material that occurs in other books. So Currid has a whole section on approaches to the plagues. It's over 15 pages long, so he devotes a good bit of attention to it. And he says, the way he breaks things down, and we'll just go with it because he's talking about who thinks about the plagues in what way the most. Okay, so he breaks there are 4 views down. He breaks the 4 views down into 2 and 2. So there are 4 basic approaches to how we might understand the plagues, and the 2 most held, what Currid would call the major positions, we'll start with. So the first one is that the plagues are natural disasters. This is probably among just scholars in general, whether they're evangelical or not, this is probably the majority view. So Currid writes in regard to this, in general, this interpretation, again, that the plagues are natural disasters, attempts to explain the plagues of Egypt as typical natural phenomena of antiquity. Various scholars have tried to prove through textual evidence that similar plagues occurred frequently in the ancient Near East. Currid has a footnote there that I'm going to get to in a moment, but I'll just continue with his quote. He writes that such events occur even today in Egypt has been used to argue for the historicity of the plagues. In addition, this position holds that the order of the plagues was naturally progressive. That is, each plague was a cause or a catalyst of the subsequent plague. They built upon one another. So that's the end of that quotation. And in a footnote, if you're interested in sort of other material as far as the plagues being natural phenomenon, he provides a couple of sources, and I'll just give them to you here. Steiglitz's article, this is an older article, but it's kind of a standard reference point in Biblical Archaeology Review, volume 13. This was 1987. He wrote an article called Ancient Records and the Exodus Plagues. For a good summary of this view, you could consult Hoffmeier's article in Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, just as his entry on plagues in Egypt, and I will be referencing that a bit in this episode. Nahum Sarna, in his book Exploring Exodus, The Heritage of Biblical Israel, has, again, good summaries of this. And David Livingstone, The Plagues and the Exodus. That's in a journal that's fairly obscure to find, Archaeology and Biblical Research, volume 4, 1991. Now, that one you can find online if you just Google that. So Google Livingstone and then Plagues and Exodus, and you will find a link to that particular article, which is good because that journal's, I don't even think it's published anymore, but again, there you have a good summary. Now, this view, not surprisingly, has a long history. It goes well back into the 19th century, and it kind of gained traction due to the influence of Flinders Petrie, who was a very famous Syro-Palestinian archaeologist, also a very famous Egyptologist. And Currid has a nice summary of sort of Petrie's influence here, and I'll read that. Flinders Petrie popularized the position, and with the publication of his Egypt and Israel, and that was a book, it became the dominant understanding of the plagues. Petrie took the issue a step further by claiming that the plagues were not only a natural sequence, but also the consequences of seasonal changes. In particular, they followed the cycle of the inundation of the Nile River. And at this point, Currid is going to quote from Petrie, and I'll read you Petrie here. The river turned to blood with the fish dying was the unwholesome stagnant Nile just at the lowest before the inundation, when it is red and swarming with organisms. The Egyptians have to resort to wells and cisterns at this time in the early part of June. Okay, now let me just stop there. This is Petrie writing, and you'll notice at the end of Exodus 7, there was this reference that the Egyptians had to dig along the Nile for water to drink. And you would think, well, wouldn't that be blood too? Because it was blood even in the jugs and the jars and stuff like that. Again, the narrative, the Exodus narrative actually doesn't say whether their digging for water along the Nile was successful or not. But it's interesting that Petrie picks up on this, and he observed the same thing happening in Egypt while he was there on one of his many campaigns during the low point of the Nile, when it turns red because of the soil, and it's you can't drink it. So back to Petrie's quote, the Egyptians have to resort to wells and cisterns at this time in the early part of June. The frogs abound after the inundation has come in July. The plagues of insects, murrain, and boils belong to the hot summer and damp, unwholesome autumn. The hail and rain came in January. This is closely fixed by the effect on the crops. The barley must have been up early for the wheat to be yet hidden or hardly sprouting. This would show that it was planted early in November, in ear by the middle of January, and ripe early in March. The flax has similar seasons, and the wheat is a month later. The locusts come in the spring over the green crops about February. The sandstorms bring a thick darkness that may be felt in March at the break of the hot winds. And the last plague, the death of the firstborn, was at the Exodus in April. The intervals are about a month apart. From the middle of January to mid-April, the time agrees to the month. So that's from Flinders, Egypt and Israel, which was published in 1911. You notice how he didn't really explain the last plague, and that's going to become an issue. But Currid adds at the end of that quotation, according to Petrie's calculations, then, the plagues upon Egypt were natural events occurring in less than a 12-month period. So again, that view, published in 1911, sort of became the dominant view in scholarship. And you can see where it appears to have some coherence to it, some alignment at least. Again, it has weaknesses, but that quotation from Petrie doesn't really betray them. We'll get to that in a moment. But you can see how this would sound sort of reasonable, okay? Now, the most recent scholarly defense of this view, though, is that of Greta Hort. And this comes from an article that she published in 1957 called The Plagues of Egypt. It's in the journal abbreviated ZAW, the Zeitschrift für Alttestamentliche Wissenschaft. Just put ZAW and you'll probably find it. I don't know if this is going to be available online, probably isn't. But a summary of her work you would actually find in Hoffmeier's Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary essay. So if that's a tool, a resource that any reasonable library, any good reference library that includes religion, is going to have that reference source. So you can read it there too, or at least a summary of it. Now, Currid summarizes Greta Hort's work as well. So let me read you his couple paragraphs there. He writes, according to her study, the first 6 plagues clearly reflected the ecosystem of ancient Egypt. Okay, let me just stop there. So she's already sounding like Petrie, but notice that she groups things in the first 6 plagues. Her comments here are the first 6. Okay, just hold that thought. So back to Currid, his summary. The first plague was the result of a high inundation that made the river red with sediment, causing it to look like blood. Concurrent excessive precipitation brought flagellates and their bacteria from mountain lakes and streams, resulting in animal death in the river. The death of the fish polluted the water habitat, a disaster which forced the frogs from the river onto dry land. The frogs then died, and soon thereafter mosquitoes, or lice, and flies multiplied off the dead amphibians. The insects in turn carried disease, probably anthrax, to the land animals and eventually to humans. Plagues 7 through 9 were not related sequentially, but they had in common their origination in the atmosphere, and whatever that means. This is Currid's wording. Hort emphasized the naturalistic character of these plagues, detailing frequent similar occurrences in Egypt. The final plague may have been merely a reflection of the high infant mortality rate of ancient Egypt. That's the end of Currid's summary of Hort's view. Again, you can see she's right in the tradition of Petrie, maybe a bit more nuanced in the discussion. Again, this is the dominant view in scholarship, just general scholarship. And not surprisingly, this is the view that is held. This view is mostly held by those who would deny any supernatural causation to the plagues. Though that isn't a truism. I mean, you will find evangelicals who find coherence in this to some extent, but they won't go the full 9 yards and just rule out the supernatural for maybe a couple of them, or they'll weave the supernatural somewhere into the narrative and then use sort of the natural phenomenon that has been witnessed in Egypt as an explanation. So they'll get God in there somewhere, but they don't view the plagues as having sort of a direct divine causation. Maybe death of the firstborn or something like that. There'll be some allowance somewhere. Now, Currid notes again about this whole sort of who's in what camp. He writes this. He says, those scholars who hold that the plagues were natural disasters are generally of two camps. Some believe that the fact that the plagues can be explained as natural phenomena actually serves as confirmation of the supernatural. There are some of those. In other words, if the biblical material detailing the natural phenomena is true, then it follows the entire narrative, including the supernatural elements, is accurate. Let me just stop there. So Currid is saying, some would say, well, look, if the writer got this right, observing natural phenomena, then we have to take him at his word as well when it comes to the supernatural causation. So some are going to try to put God in the narrative that way. Back to Currid, he writes, most interpreters, however, argue that the commonplace occurrence of phenomena akin to the plagues of Egypt actually explains away the miraculous. The divine or theological elements in the text are merely the author's attempt to dress up a simple naturalistic account. Present-day scholars overwhelmingly adhere to the latter position, which I just had noted. Now, on the surface, again, you can look at this, and what Petrie says and what Hort says kind of works, at least for the first six, kind of works reasonably well. But the need for a sequential break for plagues 7 through 9 is in my view, kind of telling. I mean, that exposes a real weakness here. And the death of the firstborn hardly seems explainable by natural disaster or just the general infant mortality rate. The language is just far more specific than that. And I guess to Currid's credit, he's less generous than the way I just summarized that. So I'll just so that you can get a feel for how Currid thinks about this. He writes, the interpretation of the plagues as natural disasters has obvious weaknesses and breaks down under careful scrutiny. First of all, nowhere in the 6 chapters detailing the plagues is there any hint of one plague having been the source of another plague. Okay, that's important. Only by mere speculation can one argue from the text that the frogs were infected with anthrax. Okay, that's a little shot at Hort. And Currid adds, and only by mere speculation can you argue that the disease was passed on to land animals by lice. And the text doesn't say that. Second, Currid observes, the ecological sequence crumbles after the 6th plague because the hailstones of the 7th plague had no relation to the anthrax of plague 6. In addition, plagues 7 through 9 had no chronological connection with one another, even though there was a conceptual relationship. And the 10th plague had absolutely no link with the previous plagues. Finally, the argument that plagues 1 and 10 were simply natural phenomena is difficult to defend. The theory that the first plague was symbolic, the water did not turn into blood but merely looked like it, cannot be supported by the text. In no way does the book of Exodus present that plague as having been metaphorical in nature. Rather, it relates the disaster as direct historical narrative. So that's a summary, and I would agree with Currid, his criticisms there. So the natural disaster view, which again is the dominant view, that has the veneer of coherence. It has the veneer of reasonableness that it covers the necessary ground, but it actually doesn't when you sort of probe it a little bit. Now, the second major view, or the major approach to the plagues, is what Currid and others would call the literary creations view. And again, just to summarize it, this is a little, in terms of its history, it's a little more recent than the natural phenomenon view. You can trace this to the early 20th century. Currid, he does note that this one seems to be getting more and more support as time goes on. The basic idea is that behind each plague is a kernel of history that was dressed up in the telling of the story. In other words, we have mythic history here, but mythic history not being real history. Again, if you're confused by that terminology, you need to go back to the very first episode that we did introducing the book of Exodus. I talked about mythic history. I think mythic history is history. And there are a number of reasons why I think it's methodologically flawed to impose our modern sense of history and what we think history requires on ancient texts, and then turn out we hit the end of that road and say, well, the ancient stuff isn't real history. Well, we can't apply the tools of modern historical validation to our own lives. I couldn't write my own biography and meet the criteria of modern history. And that, again, just a simple observation like that, tells me that maybe we're just not approaching this the right way. Because I do know my story. I was there. I'm an eyewitness. But nevertheless, I can't meet the criteria, and neither can any of you, to tell my story or your own story. So I think we need to rethink what we're asking for there. But anyway, back to the literary creations view. Basically, the literary creations view is saying, well, there's something that happened here, and then the writer of Exodus is sort of putting a theological spin on it. So scholars who hold this view believe the text, they're on a spectrum here. They're going to believe something is historical in there. They're going to believe something is ahistorical or fabricated in there. It's going to be a mixed bag. So they're going to deny the historicity in some respects, and they're going to try to affirm it in others. Their approach is a literary approach. They're looking at what the author is doing with sort of boots on the ground events, and then trying to sort of judge the result of that literary production as, well, there's something that went on here, but it's theological spin, and chances are good that some of it's basically on target, that it hasn't been spun up too much. But then there's going to be other things that are just, he just sort of went off the deep end on his description of this or that. So it's going to be a mixed bag here. Now, there are two other views, and I'll telegraph where I'm at. I like both of these views. I think they work well in tandem together. But we'll take them one at a time. The two other views are, if you're numbering this, number 3, the polemic view, Polemic, the polemic view. And this is the idea that the 10 plagues were directed against specific Egyptian deities. If you want a little bit more source material here, you could get Charles Ailing's book, Egypt and Bible History. It's 1981. It's an older book, but again, Chuck has a lot of Egyptological training, so it's worthwhile. J.J. Davis, Moses and the Gods of Egypt. That's also old, 1986, but again, still worthwhile. And G.A.F. Knight, Theology as Narration. I'm not familiar with that book. I'm familiar with the other two, but That's an Erdman's title. It's even older, 1976. So those would be three sort of starting points if you're interested in pursuing this perspective. But Currid comments on this view. Again, this is the polemic view. And he writes this. He says, there should be no question that the biblical authors understood the plagues in that manner, in other words, as a polemic. The book of Numbers, for example, reports, quote, the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn whom the Lord had struck down among them. The Lord had also executed judgments on their gods, unquote. That's Numbers 33, verse 4. In fact, the plague account itself contains similar wording. Quote, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord, unquote. That's Exodus 12:12. So Currid says the idea that the disasters that Egypt experienced were a mockery of that land and its customs is unmistakable. The scriptures even use the term mockery. That's the Hebrew term alal for God's judgment upon Egypt. That's in Exodus 10, verse 2. So that's, again, in the narrative portion about the plagues. So again, the polemic view is that plagues are what they are, specifically because they have something to do with judging the gods of Egypt. Now, I'm not going to go into the details at this point. When I'm done summarizing the approaches to the plagues, we're going to hit the first plague, and then I'll apply some of this. And I'll just telegraph where I'm headed here. There are polemic elements in the first plague, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But there are also elements, or at least I think the fourth approach, helps us to get a good flavor for what's going on in Exodus as well. And the fourth view is that the plagues are examples of decreation. Now, this is also a literary argument, and this one might be unfamiliar to a lot of you in the audience, but I'll use Currid's explanation for this. He has a nice summary of it. He writes, many scholars have pointed out that Exodus 1 through 15, so the first 15 chapters, owes much of its structure, language, and theology to the Genesis creation account. As Warren Gage states, quote, the Exodus history of the Hexateuch, that's the Pentateuch 5 books plus the book following, is so structured as to be a redemptive reenactment of creation, unquote. So let me just stop there. So this view is saying that if you look at Exodus 1 through 15 carefully, there are going to be parts of that chunk of Exodus that directly hook back into the creation account in Genesis, and the plagues are part of this. But of course, the plagues would not be about creation. It would be about the reversal of creation, and hence it's called decreation. So Currid writes, in other words, the account of the deliverance of Israel out of the oppression of Egypt through the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea reflects the narrative of the original creation. Although the creation theme is reflected in many passages of Exodus, we will take time to consider only three of them. And then he goes into his book and he talks about how this works in three places. So I would say, again, go back to the original episode that began our series on Exodus, and we talk about the relationship of Exodus to Genesis, and that'll give you a little bit of flavor for what we're talking about here. But specifically, again, we'll focus in on the plagues. There are things about the plagues that the way they're described, and even the order and the structure, and so on and so forth, that sort of mimes creation material in Genesis. And so scholars have observed this and thought, why would the author be writing it that way? And so this idea that the plagues are an intentional, not retelling, but detelling of creation, there must be something to that. That must be done for some theological messaging. And again, I think that's a good trajectory. Now, Currid adds a little bit more information by way of examples here. We'll just pick a couple. He writes, the first 5 verses, for instance, show awareness. And this is the first 5 verses of Exodus, the whole book. Show awareness of the Genesis tradition of the 70 persons descended from the patriarch Jacob. And that happens in Genesis 46, 26 to 27. Most importantly, the biblical writer describes the Zitzim Laban, that's the life setting of Israel, in terms of the cultural mandate of Genesis 1:28. Quote, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty so that the land was filled with them, unquote. That's Exodus 1:7. And the point is the language there sounds a lot like Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. So scholars look at that and say, okay, the writer obviously knows the wording of Genesis and he's using the wording here to describe something else, so he must be trying to strike a connection. Second example from Currid, the water ordeal Moses underwent is reminiscent of the redemption of Noah in Genesis 6 through 8. After the birth of Moses, his mother Jochebed could not hide him for more than 3 months. So she placed him in a gomeh teva, that's a wicker basket, Exodus 2:3. The first term, gomeh, is an Egyptian word that means papyrus. Teva, an Egyptian word which means chest or coffin, is also used in reference to Noah's Ark, believe it or not. Noah's Ark is called a teva, okay, back in the flood account. One should observe, Currid writes as well, that in Exodus 2:3, Jochebed covers the wicker basket with tar and pitch, just as Noah did the ark, Genesis 6:14. The deliverance of Noah can be viewed as a recreation because God directs the cultural mandate of Genesis 1:28 to Noah and his offspring. Quote, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's Genesis 9:1. That command is the same decree that the Hebrews were fulfilling in Exodus 1 as they multiplied and increased in Egypt. So the deliverance of Israel out of Egypt is being cast by the biblical writer as a recreation. And again, when it comes to the plagues, scholars are going to argue that since that sort of takes the land apart or reverses order, that's like a decreation. Again, we'll get to the point of how that might work theologically when we hit the first plague here in a moment. Finally, Currid writes that the Exodus is a second act of creation is evident in Exodus 13 through 15. The Genesis creation account served as the paradigm for Israel's deliverance at the sea. That is to say, the redemptive creation of Israel at the sea is cast in the same narrative style of original creation, as the pillar of divine presence brings light into darkness, Exodus 13:21. Of course, that corresponds to the first creation day. And as the waters are divided, in Exodus 14:1, think of Genesis 1:6 there, the second day, and language on the second day. The dry land emerges, Exodus 14:29. That's what happens on the third creation day. In Deuteronomy 32:11, God's tender care of Israel after she had passed through the sea is likened to an eagle's hovering over and protecting its newborn. The Hebrew term rachaf, hovers, used here in Deuteronomy 32:11, also occurs in Genesis 1:2, where the Spirit of God hovered. It's the same Hebrew verb. And Curd notes those are the only two occurrences of Rachaf in the Pentateuch. He, of course, is correct there. That the biblical author is drawing a parallel between the original creation account and the Exodus narrative is further confirmed by his use of the Hebrew term tohu. Okay, remember in Genesis 1:2, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then, now the earth was tohu vabohu, formless and empty, or however that gets translated. That's Genesis 1:2. Well, that term is used in Deuteronomy 32:10 to describe the wilderness that they're wandering through, in the Exodus narrative. Curd says the author also used the word to characterize the conditions of the original creation. As with Rachaf, tohu also appears nowhere else in the Pentateuch. So that's the end of Curd's treatment there. Now, if you want to get a fuller glimpse of these correspondences, I'm going to send Trey a PDF file, a chart that is drawn from Curd's book, where he puts a lot of this stuff in chart form. And you can see the parallels, and they're actually pretty interesting. So you can take a look at that. So this view, again, the decreation view, has God in effect demolishing creation order in the same manner that he erected creation order back in Genesis. Why would God do this? Well, to the Hebrew reader, again, the Israelite, reading his Bible or her Bible, the point would be telegraphed that I guess we know now who has sovereign control of the order of creation. It's the God of Israel. And they would be able to see the correspondences in their text. So there's a theological point being made. This is also a big deal with Egypt because of the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. That's M-A-A-T. Now, I've mentioned this before, but the Egyptian of Ma'at is sort of the way things are supposed to be because this is the way that the gods created them to be or intended all things to be. It's a cosmic and an earthly and a social order. It's the order of everything. Everything is the way the gods intend. And it was Pharaoh's job, as the incarnation of Horus, it was his job to maintain that order. That was a specific task in Egyptian religion. So Pharaoh is supposed to maintain Ma'at as it was bestowed on earth by Ra, and of course, the whole pantheon and all this kind of stuff. So Curd describes Ma'at this way. Let me just read his little summary. Ma'at was a result of the first creation, and this is Egyptian theology, and part of the inherent structure of creation. Ma'at held order together. Ma'at, therefore, was the antithesis of chaos. It was a dynamic force not limited to the initial structure of creation, but always necessary because the veracity of the forces of chaos continued to menace the very existence of the created world. Consequently, the Egyptians strove to maintain Ma'at in their earthly existence. Ma'at was not merely an ideal concept removed from daily living, but the model for human behavior. Humans had to struggle to preserve Ma'at and to keep cosmic balance upon the earth. In ancient Egypt, the king had the duty to maintain Ma'at. He was considered the personification of universal order. Thus, in the instruction for King Meri Ka-Ra, that's an Egyptian text Curd is referencing here, the pharaoh is advised by his father to, quote, do Ma'at whilst thou endurest upon earth, unquote. Every pharaoh had the obligation to reestablish and reaffirm Ma'at upon accession to the throne. The forces of chaos could upset Ma'at, so at the advent of a new king, order had to be restored. Now, Hoffmeyer, in his Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary article, he notes that this was the point of the plagues, just generally. So again, this will telegraph a little bit where Hoffmeyer's at. Again, I've already told you, I like both the third and fourth view, the polemic view and the decreation view, because the decreation view is a direct attack on Ma'at, the whole Egyptian concept. And it shows that not only Ra and any other Egyptian deity and the pharaoh, they are not in charge of the order of earth. They're not in charge of the order of the cosmos. They're not in charge of anything, okay? The one who maintains this order, and he is going to demonstrate that he is the one who maintains this order by destroying it, okay, by undermining it, by reversing it, to demonstrate that he alone, the God of Israel, namely Yahweh, the one that Pharaoh said, who's this guy, okay? That is the one deity who is in control and who is master of all these things. So that decreation emphasis, that attack on Ma'at, just generally, we're going to see it, work out in the first plague and other places as well, but just generally, it is decreation, and it's also a pretty effective polemic, against the gods of Egypt. But anyway, Hoffmeyer sort of, summarizes this, his view that this is basically the general point. I want to read you what he says in his Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary essay. He writes, the cumulative effect of the plagues on the Egyptian view of cosmic order and the king's role in maintaining it is a major issue in the plagues. From Dynasty 4 onward, okay, that's the Old Kingdom era, the Pyramid Age, all right? From Dynasty 4 onward, the pharaoh bore the title Son of Ra. As such, he was the god of the Egyptian state and was responsible to maintain the cosmic order, Ma'at, on earth that had been established by Ra at creation. Because of the bond that existed between the created order and the king as the incarnate son of Ra, of course he's also the incarnate Horus, he was responsible for the fertility of the land as well as for the proper function of the Nile. And because of the strong bond between the sun god Ra and the king, he was the one who illuminated the two lands. In other words, the Upper and Lower Egypt, all of Egypt. The vitality of the land was ensured by a number of annual festivals and related rituals over which the king presided. The 9 plagues certainly showed that a cosmic struggle was in progress, and they challenged the king's ability to maintain that cosmic order. If the king failed to execute his duties properly, the land would suffer. In other words, it would be in a state of chaos. The Egyptian term for that is yisfet, which is how Egyptian literature describes the first and second intermediate periods. When a strong king appeared and regained the control of the land, Ma'at was reestablished. Now, it's the end of the first part of the quotation. Hoffmeyer is going to go on, and he quotes from the prophecy of Nefertiti to illustrate Egyptian theology on this point. So I want to read you that excerpt. He's quoting from ancient Egyptian literature, which is an anthology of Egyptian texts here. And this portion of the prophecy of Nefertiti reads as follows. Dry is the river of Egypt. One crosses the water on foot. One seeks water for ships to sail on, its course having turned into shoreland. The land is bowed down in distress, owing to these feeders, the Asiatics, who roam the land. Foes have risen in the east. Asiatics have come down to Egypt. Ra will withdraw from mankind, though he will rise at his hour. One will not know when noon has come. No one will discern his shadow. No face will be dazzled by seeing him. Then a king will come from the south, Ameni, the justified, his name. Then order, Ma'at, will return to its seat, while chaos, Isfet, is driven away. That's Ancient Egyptian Literature, Volume 1. And Volume 1 of that series, by the way, is Old Kingdom. And so right away you're going to read that, Asiatics. Well, didn't Mike say the Asiatic? That was the Egyptian term, for Semitic people. Yeah, it was. So we have a reference to the sun darkening. We have a reference to the Nile drying up. We've got the land in general distress. Those are two elements that again sound like the plagues, but this takes us back to a little bit. I mean, this is Old Kingdom stuff, so it's pretty old in Volume 1. It takes us back to that chronological disconnect too. There are things in Egyptian literature that sound like the Exodus plagues. But if you want to know why there's a chronological disconnect, I'm not going to go back into that quagmire. You can listen to the earlier episodes on Exodus as we just were starting the series to know what the issues there are. Hoffmeyer concludes his selection after quoting the prophecy of Nefertiti with this. He says, the plagues of Exodus 7 through 10 would have been understood by Pharaoh and the Egyptians as a direct assault on the king, who was responsible for the proper function of the Nile, the crops, and the sun. This could be why the unnamed Pharaoh of the Exodus is so angered by the signs and wonders. They were beyond the limits of his control. Perhaps his continued obstinacy was due to his hoping he could somehow reestablish himself as the Lord of Ma'at. That's end of Hoffmeyer, but obviously that ain't going to happen. So again, the decreation view I think has real value. I think it serves as a polemic just generally, but I still like the third view, the polemic as well, because there are some clear shots aimed directly at specific Egyptian deities. So we're going to transition now into the first plague. I like both views, 3 and 4. To me, they work nicely together. So let's make a few observations about the first plague in Exodus 7, 14 through 25. That's the Nile turned to blood. So let me just read the 5 of those verses 20 through 25 again. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. So that's the last 5 verses of the chapter. Now the setting, let's just talk about that a little bit. The setting of this confrontation is pretty ironic. It's ironic that Moses meets Pharaoh along the bank of the Nile. It harkens back to Pharaoh's decree after the midwives episode that, quote, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile. That was Exodus 2:22. The Nile was, of course, the place where Moses had been placed in the basket as a baby, Exodus 2:3. So just by virtue of the setting, things have come full circle. Again, there's a lot of irony here. We could also note how the Egyptian magicians, they do the same thing. They turn the water to blood. But you realize, again, in light of what we talked about as far as especially the decreation view, they show by doing that they don't have the power to restore Ma'at either. Pharaoh's the one who's expected to be able to do this, certainly not his magicians, his handymen, his priestly henchmen, or whatever you want to call these guys. So they make the problem worse. They actually, undermine, in a peripheral way, Pharaoh's own status. I mean, he's the one who's supposed to be able to reverse this. Oh, yeah, we'll help you out here. We'll make it worse. He can't do anything. So again, there's a lot of irony in that as well. And there's a lot of theological polemic there too. So let's talk about the decreation assault, the assault on Ma'at thing, and the polemic with the first plague more specifically. Now, the Nile's annual flooding, again, was referred to as the inundation in academic literature. That was actually deified. That was the inundation itself was like a deity concept or a deity sort of thing or figure. Currid notes, quote, the Nile's inundation was deified and personified as the Egyptian god Hapi. That's Hapi. In fact, as early as the pyramid texts, the Egyptians called the Nile River by the divine name Hapi. They often portrayed the god as a bearded man with female breasts and a hanging stomach, probably to show pregnancy, all of which reflect the concept of fertility. Okay? And indeed, Egyptian writings spoke of Hapi as the one who kept Egypt alive. The hymn to the Nile, for example, taught that life in Egypt came from the Nile. Quote, O all men who uphold the Aeneid. That's a group of deities. Fear ye the majesty which his son, the all-Lord, has made by making verdant the 2 banks. So it is, verdant art thou. So it is, verdant art thou. So it is, O Nile, verdant art thou, who makest man and cattle to live. Verdant is just another term for life-giving. Okay, so this is a hymn to the Nile. Again, that in Egyptian theology, all life comes from the Nile. So it's bad news if the Nile is polluted. And Hapi, again, the personified deity figure, the deification of the inundation of the Nile. And when the Nile floods, the inundation, you realize what happens. The Nile floods, it overflows its banks, and that deposits rich soil on either side of the Nile. That's why things can grow. And this isn't like just a few yards. This is miles of soil. This is how Egyptian people eat. They can't grow their crops in sand and in the desert. They depend on the annual regular inundation of the Nile to survive. And again, they refer to the inundation as the deity Hapi. Well, Hapi is either not doing the job, or Hapi is weak. Okay, he or she, again, it's sort of a hybrid figure, is weak, when compared next to the God of Israel. The God of Israel has mastered Hapi. It's the God of Israel, the God of the Hebrews that Pharaoh will not recognize, who actually controls the Nile. Again, it's a theological lesson and a pretty frightening one, and one that would make the Egyptians angry, and especially Pharaoh. I mean, probably frighten most of the populace, but Pharaoh, again, he knows what everyone else in the room is thinking. Everyone else in the country is thinking. You're the son of Ra. You are the maintainer of Ma'at. Do something about it. And he can't. He just can't. I mean, it's a public humiliation. It's a public display, not only of Pharaoh, again, perceived as a deity incarnate, not only of Pharaoh's fecklessness, but also Hapi's. And this is how the plagues are going to work. You're going to have decreation elements and that are going to serve as a general attack on Ma'at, which is by definition an attack on Pharaoh and his status and his power, his divinity. Okay, but you're also going to have individual plagues belittle, make small and show to be weak specific Egyptian deities. So I think both of these things are in play. And to end our episode here, Currid summarizes it this way: this disaster, again, it's just starting with the first plague. This disaster was a demonstration that the true sustenance came only from the hand of Yahweh and not from a false pagan deity of the Egyptians. It's a threat to Egyptian religion generally, because if this condition persists, and the other plagues are going to sort of back up the same point. Might the Egyptians be thinking, well, maybe we should worship Yahweh because he's the one that keeps us alive anyway? I mean, this is what's at stake. So you have all this going on again in the backdrop of the Egyptian mind, and the Hebrews. The Hebrews are well aware of this stuff. They've been in Egypt a long time. They sort of know the drill. I'm not going to say they're experts in Egyptian theology, but they kind of know the drill. They kind of know what Egyptians think and how they think about Pharaoh and all that sort of stuff. What I want to do in this episode, the last episode, we sort of introduced the plagues and we talked about the different views, how scholars look at the plagues. And there were 4 approaches. We talked about there's the approach that says the plagues are natural disasters. Then there was the approach that said, they're just literary creations. And for most people who sort of camp out there, that means they're pseudo-history. Not everybody, but most. And then the third view was that the plagues are really polemics against, specific Egyptian deities, against Egyptian religion. Okay, and then the fourth was the plagues should be understood as decreation, which is also a literary argument, and specifically how the plagues sort of hook back into God's own creative activity, and the plagues decreate. They disorder what God has ordered. They take apart what God has brought together. They take a habitable world and make it uninhabitable. It's this idea of how the plagues sort of harken back to Genesis creation themes, but in a negative reversal way. And we said at the end of the last episode that I prefer both of the views 3 and 4, the polemic view and the decreation view, because if we viewed decreation in the context of an attack theologically on the Egyptian religious concept of Ma'at, the way things ought to be, the way that the gods have arranged things to be, just the whole concept of order, both cosmic and earthly, and how that sort of gets funneled through the Pharaoh and is represented in a range of specific Egyptian deities. If we look at the plagues, again, as describing decreation and specifically targeting the concept of Ma'at, that really is a polemic against Egyptian religion and the Pharaoh. I mean, it just gets everything in one fell swoop. And we looked at how the first plague, at the end of the last episode, we looked at how the first plague, sort of accomplishes this, does this. So what we're going to do in this episode is I'm going to go through plagues number 2 through 9. Again, we'll stop when we hit the death of the firstborn. But how do these concepts of decreation and religious polemic, theological polemic, how are they reflected in these other plagues, numbers 2 through 9? So that's how we're going to approach this episode, which, again, to do that and not break it up, we had to go through chapters 8 through 10. I'm not going to read every word of chapters 8 through 10. But what I'll do is I'll go plague by plague, tell you where textually it breaks down, and I'll read an excerpt from that section and just get into some commentary. So the second plague after the Nile is turned to blood, which was plague number 1, is the plague of frogs. And this is Exodus 8, 1 through 15. Let me just read the first 4 verses here. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go in to Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will plague all your country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come up into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the houses of your servants and your people and into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come upon you and on your people and on all your servants.'" Of course, a little later on, the magicians, the Khartoumim, we'll come back to that term a little bit later, are able to duplicate this again. In other words, they don't show mastery over Ma'at, to restore order. They just make it worse. Again, so that is self-defeating because Pharaoh is the one charged in Egyptian theology with maintaining Ma'at. So here are his special priests, his magicians is the word that ESV uses. And they're supposed to be his assistants in maintaining Ma'at, and they just screw it up even more. Again, if we look at the plagues this way, it's an assault on Ma'at and on Egyptian religion generally, specific deities, and then Pharaoh gets looped into that. Again, the plagues makes for some interesting sense, out of the plague. So in regard to the second one, again, I've referenced Currid's book before, Ancient Egypt in the Old Testament. Again, I highly recommend that. It's a very useful book for lots of different topics. It's broader than the Exodus story, but since we're here, it's especially useful. So Currid has a comment here on the second plague. He says, "The second plague also appears to be a contest between deities. The Egyptians regarded the frog as a symbol of divine power and a representation of fertility. One of the main goddesses of Egypt was Heket, who was depicted as a human female with a frog's head. She was the spouse, and this is important, she was the spouse of the creator god Khnum. He fashioned human bodies on his potter's wheel, and then Heket blew the breath of life into them and assisted as midwife at their births." Now, let me stop there. We've brought up Khnum before when we talked about the Egyptian midwives with the birth stool, so on and so, that expression, and how it was really drawing on Khnum theology about the potter's wheel and the creation of human life. And then, of course, in Exodus 2, when you have the midwife scene, it's they're preserving human life from Pharaoh's destruction and throwing the kids into the Nile and all that sort of stuff. So we've brought up Khnum before, and here again he plays a role here, but specifically his wife, who is again depicted as a human female with a frog's head. So the plague of frogs very naturally is going to harken back to that imagery. Again, she is the one who again breathes the breath of life into the new humans that Khnum creates on his potter's wheel. So Currid adds here, Hechet also had the responsibility to control the multiplication of frogs in ancient Egypt by protecting the frog, from frog-eating crocodiles. But Yahweh, very obviously, Hechet is not in control here. It's Yahweh who's multiplying the frogs. Okay, so it's a pretty direct attack on Hechet and against Ma'at generally. So Yahweh overwhelmed Hechet, these are Currid's words, and caused her to be impotent in her task. She could not repel or resist Yahweh's overpowering regeneration of frogs. It was the Hebrew God who really bestowed fertility. He rapidly produced frogs so that they would be a curse upon Egypt. And the theme is the sovereignty of God over fertility, over Egypt, over her deities, and over all things. That's the end of the excerpt from Currid. So again, if you're an Egyptian and you see this happen, you're going to be thinking theological thoughts, and they're not going to be comforting. Hechet is essentially getting taken out to the woodshed. She is not in control. Yahweh is overtly cast as superior, because he's dominating her in her realm. And this is how a lot of these plagues are going to work. If we move to plagues 3 and 4, these are flying insects, gnats, and flies. This is the rest of Exodus 8. The rest of Exodus 8 will cover both of these. So Exodus 8, 16 through 32. Let's just go to verse 16 and pick up a little bit. We'll read not quite to the end, but right around to verse 24. So after the frogs, we get this. The Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians, there they are again, the Khartoumim, tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So their ability ends here. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the Khartoumim, the magician, said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. The word there is Elohim. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh as he goes out to the water, and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me. Or else, if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants and your people, and into your houses. And the houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they stand. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen. One more verse. And the Lord did so. There came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses. Throughout all the land of Egypt, the land was ruined by the swarms of the flies. This kind of language and this distinguishing between the Egyptians and the people of Goshen, the Hebrews, as we've said in the previous episode, this is one of the major reasons why the naturalistic explanations just don't work. Even though on the surface they're kind of coherent in this idea of a chain reaction between the blood and the frogs and the flies and that, all this kind of stuff, how one sort of led to the other. And we pointed out that the text never says that they were actually connected in a cause and effect relationship. You have to assume that. And then when you get to a situation like this, there's no natural explanation for this kind of distinguishing in the text. So you might like the naturalistic explanation for some of the plagues, but you're not getting that from the details of the text. In fact, you have to ignore or subvert certain details of the text to make that work. Now, Currid writes here, the third and fourth plagues, Exodus 8, 16 through 24, both involved flying insects as divine judgments against Egypt. The third plague was kinim, a Hebrew term that is not clear in meaning, although it likely refers to gnats. Other suggestions are that the kinim were vermin, lice, or maggots. The fourth plague came in the form of arob, which is commonly understood to be a stinging fly, possibly even a mosquito. These plagues may have been directed against the Egyptian self-generated god of resurrection, Khepre, who was symbolized by the flying beetle. Again, that's a speculation because of if you've ever seen the beetle image in Egypt, it's also the dung beetle, but you also see the beetle with wings, and that's what Currid is alluding to here. And since these are both flying insects, some scholars have speculated that what we have here is again an unleashing of those kinds of critters in a demonstration of who's in control of them. Now, there's another way to look at this as well. There are other indirect references to these plagues in other sources that I think make a better connection to Egyptian religion. And one example is Herodotus. In Book 2, in section 37, when Herodotus is commenting on Egypt's plagues, Egypt's priests, let's just leave it there, not specifically on the plagues, but Herodotus is going to get into that. But he makes an observation about the priests that sort of take us into this territory of the third and fourth plagues. And he writes, their priests, Egypt's priests, shave the whole body every other day, so that no lice or anything else that is foul may infest them in their service of their gods, unquote. Now, the point here that Herodotus is alluding to is that these priests would shave their bodies to avoid their bodies being home to lice or gnats or anything else that would render them unclean and disqualify them from temple service of their gods. Now, obviously, that is impossible during these two plagues. The plagues robbed, therefore, if you're a priest and your home is infested with gnats and flies, whatever these flying insects were, you're not going to be able to be completely rid of them, which means you are ceremonially, ritually unclean which means you cannot serve your God. You cannot bring offerings. You cannot perform certain rituals on sacred space in Egyptian religion. And that means that the gods are neglected. And they're not going to be able to do, either because they don't want to be neglected or they're rebellious, or there's a certain sense where the priesthood, all this ritualistic mishmash, is an essential part of working with the gods to maintain Ma'at. Okay, you're not going to be able to do that. That is not going to be an operation because your priests would defile the sacred space. So the flies in the nets are, again, another assault, peripherally, but certainly effectively. They're another assault on Egyptian religion. And it's just impossible to be rid of these things. And so it's going to disrupt the offerings and other ritual acts with Egypt's gods. Now, the word for priest in the biblical accounts, as I mentioned already, is kartumim. It's translated magicians, which is a bit unfortunate because that makes it sound like they're doing card tricks or pulling rabbits out of something. It's kind of misleading to the modern ear, but it's not actually that bad. And the reason is Sarna, for instance, notes that kartumim derives from an Egyptian title meaning chief lector. That's Lector, lector priest. You say, well, what's a lector priest? Well, Redford in the Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt writes this about lector priests. Again, Redford's an Egyptologist, and this is a major reference work for ancient Egyptian life and culture and religion and history. He writes, the priest who actually recited the spells and rites, R-I-T-E-S, both in temple ceremonies and funerals, was a lector priest. Egyptian literature often portrays lector priests as wise men and sages who can foresee coming events. In the tale of Khufu and the magicians, for example, lector priests perform miraculous feats and are privy to secret knowledge, unknown even to the king. They also took part in funerals, reading the necessary spells and assisting in the opening of the mouth ceremony. That's the end of the Redford quote. Now, again, the lector priest is the kartumim of this Old Testament account in Exodus. And Sarna, I gave you Sarna's assessment of that. His sources, again, you might be interested in some of these if you can obtain them anyway. His sources for that are Lambden, an article, Egyptian Loanwords in the Old Testament. It's from the Journal of the American Oriental Society in 1953. Lambden, again, was proficient in Middle Egyptian and Hebrew. And this name's a struggle, J. Quaggebor, that's Quaegebur, in his essay on the Egyptian equivalent of biblical kartumim. And that's in the book Pharaonic Egypt, the Bible and Christianity, edited by Grohl, 1985. That is a very hard book to find. But anyway, those are the sources. So the connection here is certain. It's sure. It's based on good textual evidence. And so if you have gnats and flies infesting the land, they are preventing the priests from being ritually able to perform the service of their gods. Now, I alluded to the fact earlier that the kartumim were able to mimic what's going on. In the earlier plagues, they make things worse. They contribute to Pharaoh's inability to maintain Ma'at. And as we read through this passage, again, you would have noticed that in this case, they can't do it. And that's important here because let me go back to the Redford quote. When Redford alludes to the tale of Khufu and the magicians, he says that these particular priests perform miraculous feats, are privy to secret knowledge, unknown even to the king. So the pharaohs look into these guys for a special ability to help. And earlier they make it worse, and here they can't do anything. And they actually say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. So it's worse than just being rendered ritually impure so that you can't maintain the Egyptian cult, the worship of the gods, and all the stuff that Egyptians thought they had to do to maintain Ma'at on earth and keep the gods happy and all that stuff. It's not just that bad. It's that they, again, are supposed to have power to perform miracles, granted to them by the gods, of course. And in this demonstration, they fail. I mean, they are beaten. They can't do it. And so, again, Yahweh is just demonstrated point blank as being superior. So the God of the Hebrews is defeating Pharaoh. He is decreating and reversing Ma'at. He's showing who is really in control of order on earth and really in heaven as well, because that's the realm of the gods. And these priests, at every point, and specific Egyptian deities too, the plagues are an assault on the whole Egyptian theology, the religious worldview, the religious system. Let's move on to number 5. We've got the pestilence on the cattle. Okay, this is Exodus 9. So let's go to Exodus 9 here. Exodus 9, 1 through 7. Let me just read a little bit of that. I'll read that whole section. Then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, behold, the hand of the Lord will fall with a very severe plague upon your livestock that are in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that belongs to the people of Israel shall die. And the Lord set a time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. And the next day the Lord did this thing. All the livestock of the Egyptians died. Not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. And Pharaoh sent to behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead. But the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Again, this is another indication. If Moses is predicting the time, this is not a naturalistic sort of thing. Again, I understand if people like that idea. It has a surface coherence to it, but it doesn't derive from the details of the text. So, here we have another case, with a distinction being made. Again, that just doesn't work naturalistically. And we've got the cattle, under assault now, or the flocks and the herds, and so on and so forth. And Currid notes this 5th plague was the pestilence on the domesticated animals, just generally. And he's going to loop in something really important here. So he writes, bull cults, of course, are known to have flourished throughout the land in antiquity, throughout the land of Egypt. Ancient Egyptians viewed the bull as a fertility figure, the great inseminator imbued with the potency and vitality of life. Apis was the most important of the Egyptian sacred bulls. Other bull cults included Buchis, the sacred bull of Hermonthis, and Menuhis. That was a cult that was centered in Heliopolis. In addition, bulls were understood as embodiments of the great Egyptian gods, Ta and Ra. Numerous important female deities were pictured as livestock animals. Isis, queen of the gods, bore cow's horns on her head. Hathor was given a bovine head for her task of protecting the king. The livestock animals provided necessities to the people in the form of food, milk, clothing, transportation, and they were destroyed in the fifth plague. So the biblical author is again demonstrating that Yahweh was sovereign over and in control of all things. The Egyptian gods were imposters. That's the end of the Currid quote. And again, this is, if you've done any reading in Egyptian religion, the Apis bull is the one that stands out here. That was a major Egyptian cult aspect of their theology and their worship. Again, because of the fertility thing, and also again this notion that other bulls, other bovine, other domesticated animals, okay, their imagery, their identities were used again to as part of the identity of Egyptian deities. I mean, the Egyptians again seeing all this happen, it's unmistakable to them. It might be a little stretch for us because we look at Egyptian religion, man, that stuff's weird. You look at the weird pictures, look at how they draw their gods. They're half human, they're half animal. Again, they're doing this to connect deities with specific roles and specific ideas through the natural world. The things that the Egyptians can see and experience and understand. So, but to us that looks a little weird. But to the Egyptian, when you see again going back to the frogs, that's unmistakable. You know who's in the crosshairs there. Here with the livestock. Again, there's going to be an assortment of Egyptian deities that are going to be one-upped, that are going to be defeated, that are going to be under the thumb, that are going to be diminished and belittled by the Hebrew God. Again, it's just an unmistakable thing to an Egyptian witness to these sorts of events. And again, it's not news to the Israelites either, because they've been here for quite a long time, 400 years. And so they've gotten used to the trappings of the Israelite state and the Israelite religious ideas and the portrayal of the gods and the iconography. I mean, they're going to know when they see things in the natural world being overturned and upset and die, be afflicted, and wind up dying. They're going to know that this is going to be perceived by the Egyptians, rightly so, as an assault on their religion, assault on their gods, assault on what they believe about their deities. And, again, it's a polemic for the superiority of Yahweh. Plague number 6. This is the plague of boils. This is Exodus 8, 9 through 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from the kiln and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. And it shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt. So they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh. And Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils breaking out in sores on man and beast. And the magicians, the Khartoumim, could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So again, here we have the lector priests involved in this scene again, the Khartoumim. They were not able to stand before Moses because of the boils. Now that could either be figurative, metaphorical, or they were so afflicted, they literally physically couldn't stand. Again, they're diminished, they're belittled, they're harmed, they're afflicted. There's no question as to who can do miracles and who cannot. This is the priestly class. This is the caste of priests that were supposed to be able to do spectacular things. I want to read a little bit from Currid and then another excerpt from something Gary Rensburg has written, but we'll take Currid first here. He writes, the subsequent plague of boils, or it was possibly smallpox, has been identified as a polemic against Imhotep, the vizier of Dynasty III, who was later deified as a god of medicine and healing. His chapel at Saqqara was used as a sanatorium where cripples flocked from all over Egypt during the Egyptian late period, which would have been circa 712 to 343 BC, so quite late. The problem with this identification, Currid notes, is that Imhotep was deified and revered at a much later time than the Exodus, the occurrence of the Exodus. Therefore, the sixth plague is incorrectly connected with him. Instead, the malady may have been directed against the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed deity of plagues. She was responsible for epidemics in ancient Egypt, but ironically, she also had the power to heal those who were visited by pestilence. The priests of Sekhmet, one of the oldest medical fraternities in antiquity, included both doctors and veterinary surgeons. Other gods regarded as divine physicians and healers included the Theban god Amun-Ra, whom from a text in Dynasty 19 describes as, quote, he who dissolves evils and dispels ailments, a physician who heals the eye without having remedies, opening the eyes and driving away the squint. Amun, rescuing whom he desires. He makes a lifetime long or shortens it, unquote. So Currid, again, brings up the Imhotep angle, which I wanted to mention, and it doesn't prefer it, I think, for kind of obvious reasons, because it's chronologically anomalous. Rensburg, again, follows sort of the same trajectory. And this is from his essay, Moses the Magician. And it's found in a book that I want to make you all aware of. Again, this is a pricey book, but it is the best book on the Exodus and the plagues and all that sort of stuff to date in scholarly literature. And again, that doesn't mean that its contributors believe in the events of the Exodus or the reality of Moses or whatever. I mean, some might, some I guess it's fair to say would, some wouldn't. But this is an excellent volume. It's called Israel's Exodus in Transdisciplinary Perspective. Subtitle is Text, Archaeology, Culture, and Geoscience. And it's from the Quantitative Methods in the Humanities and Social Sciences, published by Springer. Springer is a major academic publisher in all sorts of disciplines. And it's 2015. So 2015, this is very recent work. So if you're interested in stuff about the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and all of the approaches, naturalistic or not, or religious, this is a terrific work. And Rensburg's article here, Moses the Magician, gets into the plague material. And he writes this: while not lice, the boils, again, he's talking about the plague of boils now, the boils constitute a different skin affliction, which also would have rendered the Egyptian priests unable to serve the gods. To my mind, it is not a coincidence that the contest between the Khartoumim, again, the magicians, on one hand, and Moses and Aaron on the other, ends with the third plague of lice, and that the Khartoumim appear only once in a cameo appearance, as it were, during the telling of the sixth plague of boils. The attack on the lector priests, by extension, represents an assault on the heart of Egyptian religion, for without priestly service in the temples, the cults are inoperative, the deities are ineffective, and all of Egypt descends into turmoil. Okay, end of quote. So he picks up on this phrase about not being able to stand, the Khartoumim not being able to stand because of the boils before Moses and Aaron. And he takes that quite literally, that they are incapacitated. So it's not just that they're, before with the gnats and the flies, that they're rendered unclean, they can't go into, Egyptian religious sacred space, and, we have the neglect of the cult and the rituals and all that stuff. This ups the ante. They can't even make it to work, right? They are physically incapacitated. And thereby, again, like he says, there's no priestly service in the temples, the cults are inoperative, the deities are ineffective, and it just creates turmoil in the whole land of Egypt. So again, this is a scattershot, assault on Egyptian religion. Number 7, the hail. This is Exodus 9, 13 through 35. And I'm going to read a portion of this. I'll read through verse 26. We read this. Then the Lord said to Moses, again, 7th plague, hail, rise up early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, which would have been really insulting at this point. Thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose, I have raised you up. In other words, God said, I'm just breaking in here. God says, I could have just killed you all off by this point, but I didn't. I kept you alive for a specific purpose. For this purpose, I have raised you up, verse 16, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go. Behold, about this time tomorrow, I will cause very heavy hail to fall, such as never has been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Now therefore send, get your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter, for every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. Then whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh, isn't that an ironic line, hurried his slaves and his livestock into the houses. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven so that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt on man and beast and every plant of the field in the land of Egypt. Then Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire ran down to the earth. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. There was hail and fire flashing continually in the midst of the hail, very heavy hail, such as had never been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. The hail struck down everything that was in the field, all the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And the hail struck down every plant of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were, was there no hail. Again, the naturalistic explanation is going to fail at not only that point, but at a couple points. If you want your view of the plagues to derive from the text, then you can't really default to the naturalistic perspective, which we've mentioned before. So what you have here, I want to go back here to. Let's take up a little bit here. You have in 9:27, right after where I stopped here, in chapter 9, you have Pharaoh sending and calling Moses and Aaron. So this time I have sinned, and the Lord is in the right. I and my people are in the wrong. So you have this sort of apparent recognition of sin, but it's disingenuous repentance. Because Pharaoh does the very same thing 7 verses later, in verse 34. And this time, it is Pharaoh who hardens his own heart. And so his repentance here, if we kept reading, Pharaoh got the message. Well, actually he didn't, because again, he's going to be turned against the Lord anyway, despite all this stuff up to this point. Currid writes, the catastrophe of the hail was a mockery of the Egyptian heavenly deities. Don't they have power to stop the hail? If they were really gods, if they were really powerful, okay? If they were really powerful, when I say if they're really gods, yes, they're spirit beings that exist, and we have spiritual warfare and in this and all that sort of stuff. What I mean is if they were really powerful, if they really had authority to overrule what the God of the Hebrews is doing, wouldn't they do it? Of course, the point is they don't have that ability. So Egyptian heavenly deities like Nut, N-U-T, who is the female representative of the sky. She is in other texts and pictures the personification of the vault, the dome over the earth, vault of heaven. Shu is the deity that supports the heavens, holds up the sky. Tefnut, the goddess of the moisture in the atmosphere. These are all heavenly deities. They are deities that are supposed to reign in the regions from which the hail comes. And they're not doing anything. I mean, they can't touch this, is the point. So again, if you're an Egyptian, you're wondering, hey, why doesn't one of these gods that we worship do something? And the only conclusion you can draw, because the Egyptians aren't all of a sudden going to turn into atheists, or modern rationalists here. They're not going to do that. They're going to think, well, the only conclusion we can draw is that the God of the Hebrews is superior. And that means we're in big trouble. So again, some of them didn't even have to see the hail. As soon as it's out of the mouth of Moses and Aaron, they're listening. They're obeying. Get their cattle and their slaves inside. I mean, God even gives them an out. He gives them a heads up, a warning. And a lot of Pharaoh's own people don't trust their own gods at this point, and they obey. They take the advice that God, Yahweh gives them through Moses and Aaron. The 8th plague, the locusts. This is Exodus 10. Takes us into the 10th chapter. Exodus 10, 1 through 20. I'll read the first 6 verses. We have locusts in this plague. Then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants. Of course, Pharaoh had just hardened his own heart before, so it's this back and forth thing we talked about earlier. He says, I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants that I may show these signs among them. In other words, God is stringing them out to enhance his own reputation outside of Egypt. Again, if they would have settled the matter quietly after the first plague, God's reputation, is not going to ripple, outside of Egypt. So this is again part of the rationale for the hardening. So verse 2, I will show my signs among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. So Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh and said to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your country, and they shall cover the face of the land so that no one can see the land. And they shall eat what is left to you after the hail. And they shall eat every tree of yours that grows in the field. And they shall fill your houses and the houses of all your servants and of all the Egyptians, as neither your fathers nor your grandfathers have seen from the day they came on earth to this day. Then he, Moses, turned out and went out from Pharaoh. It's the first 6 verses. We skip down to, in verses 7 through 11, you have another faux repentance, faux relenting from Pharaoh. He offers to let the Israelite men go, keeping back the women and the children. Again, this is disingenuous. I mean, Pharaoh's no idiot. He knows that the men, if he lets the men go, they'll go out and do their thing in the desert. But they're going to come back for their wives and their children. And he can enslave them again. He can say, look, I obeyed the Lord. I let you do this. So now, we're good. And you're my slaves again. You're my property again. Again, it's disingenuous. Then you get to verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt for the locust. God isn't buying Pharaoh's offer. So that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat every plant in the land, all that the hail has left. So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. When it was morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. The locusts came up over all the land of Egypt and settled on the whole country of Egypt, such a dense swarm of locusts as had never been seen before, nor ever will be again. They covered the face of the whole land so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. So God is good on his word. And Currid writes here in regard to this, locusts were a particularly nasty problem in ancient Egypt. On account of the danger, the ancient Egyptians worshipped the god Sennacherib, who was the divine protector against ravages from pests. An identification problem exists because Sennacherib appears to have been a minor deity in dynastic Egypt. Why Yahweh would have concerned himself to mock a subordinate deity is a problem. Perhaps protecting against grasshopper attack was a function of not merely one god, but of the gods in general. A hint of that possibility appears in the Tanis stela from the reign of Taharka, dynasty 25, which speaks of a fine field which the gods, plural, protected against grasshoppers, end of quote. So he's saying, we can identify a deity here, this Sennacherib. He was a minor deity in dynastic Egypt, but again, there appears to have been this concept that other gods more generally protected Egypt's food supply, from grasshoppers. Again, at least that was their belief. There's something else going on here, though, that associates this plague with the next one. And that's the next plague going to be the plague of darkness. Exodus 10:15 gets obscured by the ESV, so I don't want to leave this plague without mentioning this, because I do think there's a connection between this plague and the next. And the darkness plague, definitely, no holds barred, is a direct attack on major deities in Egyptian thought. And so since there's the connection between this one and the locusts, I don't think what Currid brings up as a problem, a minor deity, I think it's less of a problem because it actually is going to marry the locust to a major deity in the next plague. But anyway, let me look at Exodus 10:15. It says, they covered the face of the whole land. This is the locust. They covered the face of the whole land so that the land was darkened. Now think about that. Does that make any sense? They covered the face of the whole land so that the land was darkened. Now, it would make sense if locusts were black, and you could, the whole land turned black. That's what it means, the whole land was darkened. But locusts aren't black, all right? This is, in English here, and the ESV is not alone here, they've obscured something that helps make sense of the whole thing. If you actually look in the Hebrew text, the word panim, the word for face, is not what we get in this verse. They covered the face of the whole land. It's not they covered the panim of the whole land. Instead, the Hebrew text has literally, they covered the eye of the whole land so that the land was darkened. Now, to an Egyptian, the eye of the land was the sun. So what it really means is that locusts, there were so many locusts, it obscured the sun. In Egyptian writing and thought, the eye of the sun was also a metaphor for Ra, again, who was a major deity. And so that creates a link to the next plague, plague number 9, in Exodus 10:21 through 29. I'll read a few verses of that. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven. There was pitch darkness in the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived. Again, here you have the distinguishing. And at this point, Pharaoh's going to break and say, Pharaoh called Moses and said, go serve the Lord, so on and so forth. But again, the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart because he has one more thing in mind, again, to multiply the judgment. And that's going to be the final plague, which we'll get to in the next episode. But here in the plague of darkness, verse 23, this is clearly miraculous. All the people of Israel had light where they lived. And it harkens back to the distinguishing of Exodus 8:22. On that day I will set apart the land of Goshen where the people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there. And then Exodus 9, verse 4. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that belongs to the people of Israel shall die. It's very specific as far as the distinguishing. And again, God is not only showing himself as the master of Ma'at, the master of creation order, through the decreation of Egypt, the disassembling of its order, and really the natural world, the natural order. But he's also, again, even moving a little bit beyond that by distinguishing his own people from the Egyptians, which, again, you can't really get there in a naturalistic, sort of approach. Currid writes about darkness, and again, I've suggested that the darkness is in part. I mean, yes, God asks Moses, commands Moses to stretch out his hand toward heaven, but the place has already been darkening because the eye, again, of the land has been covered with locusts, so it's sort of preparatory. Currid writes, the ancient Egyptians regarded Amun-Ra, the personification of the sun, as their chief deity. They believed that Amun-Ra, in his rising in the east, symbolized new life and resurrection. Now, just hold that point in your head. Every day when the sun rose to an Egyptian, it's Amun-Ra rising, from the realm of the dead. It's a resurrective image. So you have Amun-Ra rising, and he gives new life to the land. The sun's going to be out, which means the plants are going to grow. Animals are going to eat. We're going to eat. I mean, you got to have the sun, okay? Very obviously. So they believe that Amun-Ra, in his rising in the east, symbolized new life and resurrection. In fact, they considered him to be the creator god. But when Amun-Ra sank in the west, when the sun set, he represented something different and antithetical. He symbolized death in the underworld. When Yahweh so willed, in Exodus 10:21 through 29, the sun was darkened, and Amun-Ra was hidden and unable to shine upon his worshippers. He's unable to rise, in effect. Currid finishes, during the ninth plague, Amun-Ra did not rise again and did not give life. His realm was death, judgment, and hopelessness. Again, this is a big deal. I think of all the plagues. I mean, obviously the Egyptians were going to get freaked out by all this stuff, and they can tell that it's an assault against their religion, against their gods, against their pharaoh, who is supposed to be a god, Horus incarnate, Ra incarnate, all this stuff. But I think this one would have been the most frightening because it's like, well, did he just kill Amun-Ra? Because he doesn't, they can't see the sun. The sun is darkened, and so there's something wrong here. Amun-Ra, their creator god, the highest, the chief deity in Egypt, is now subject to Yahweh. Again, if you're an Egyptian, this is unmistakable imagery. You can't fail but to notice, obviously, what's going on around you, but you can't fail to comprehend what it means. It means that the God of the Hebrews is in complete, absolute, dominant control over the gods you worship. And you're just hoping that Pharaoh will let these people go so that Ma'at can be restored. Because if it ain't restored, you're going to die. The whole land is going to die. It's the end of Egypt. So again, as an Egyptian, this is what's going through your head. And again, a lot of this stuff is sort of distant from us because we don't know much about Egyptian religion, or it's just weird, and we don't really understand the imagery. We think it's cartoonish. Again, all these images of Egyptian deities and these concepts of associating them with animals and other things in the natural world are designed, again, to help them communicate the relationship of power that they don't understand, powers of the natural world, but also creation and how all this stuff is maintained. And they, like everybody else, attribute it to divine origin. So it's a way to talk theology. It's a way to talk reality, talk worldview, talk your place in the natural world for the Egyptians, to communicate these ideas and again link them into the religious system. This is what the plagues are. Okay, they are decreation. They are an assault on Ma'at, the cosmic order that Pharaoh is supposed to be in control of, and his elector priests, the ones that do all the rituals, the ones that are in charge of doing earthly acts that maintain Ma'at on earth on behalf of or with Pharaoh. They're in the crosshairs too. Again, this is unmistakable as far as the decreation, the assault on Ma'at. And again, in turn, when all that stuff happens, when Ma'at is overturned, it's a very obvious assault, a polemic, on the gods and religious system of Egypt. It is shown to be inferior. And so this is why, again, we have, why the plagues were what they were. And why, when we read, through Exodus 8 through 10, I think it helps us to sort of get in the heads of the Egyptians and get in the heads of the Hebrews. And of course, Moses was raised in Egypt. He knows what all this stuff, means. He knows what's going on here. I mean, he's picking up what the Lord is laying down. He can't miss it. And again, to an original reader, a biblical reader, somebody in this part of this worldview, when this stuff gets written down, even after the events themselves, this is very obvious theological messaging. Again, that is not to say it's unhistorical or pseudo-historical or whatever. Again, you're only going to be drawing that conclusion if you are a practical atheist. Scholars may not like to use the term atheist, but they might say they believe in a God or something like that, but they don't want him to act in history when it comes to the Exodus plagues. Well, that's a little inconsistent, don't you think? I think it's really inconsistent, but that's where some scholars are. A lot of scholars are, and it's sort of understandable, but it's inconsistent at the end of the day. But if you're not one of those, again, it's very obvious what's going on here with the plagues and sort of how to read them, both in terms of real-time events, again, extensions of the power of God, and also their meaning theologically. And again, we can get, it's still a good message for us, about the powers in heaven, supernatural powers, who's in control and who's not, who's really calling the shots here. So I think it's a good way to understand the big picture and go through the plagues like this, both in terms of what they strike at directly and the, again, very suggestive polemic against the gods of Egypt. So this is actually spiritual warfare. The plagues are spiritual warfare in the Old Testament. And anything like this sort of gets put into that bucket. So hopefully when you read the plague accounts again, you'll remember some of these things and appreciate what's going on.